The weather was hot in Miami. It was just past noon and the sun was burning with all its might. Even the birds were too lazy to sing and hid in the greenery of the trees. The phone rang deafeningly in the bedroom. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. Finally, the ringing woke the young man. He got up with difficulty and picked up the phone without holding back a yawn. His head rumbled with the sound of Rod's scream. Thank God he had gotten off the line. Stunning news awaited him. How could he sleep on a day like this, since the cyber representative was already here? However, this statement had no effect on the young man. Who the hell is cyber? The family's out of control. Hadn't he himself promised them to find time to meet with them today? And he himself told him not to be late today. How could it be? There was a slight rustle behind him. 2 girls hugged him affectionately by the shoulders. They were unhappy to be awakened and grinned, calling him back to his warm bed. The young man was having trouble remembering. Yesterday at the casino, he had gambled too much and seemed to have had too much to drink. Of course he was wrong, but there was an excuse. His opponent provoked him in every way possible. He raised the stakes and taunted him. Could it be that Xiang Sang himself was afraid of his hand? And the young man was getting angrier and angrier. Rod showed up in the middle of it. Cyber Corporation wanted to discuss something with him, but Sang didn't even look at him. He was only interested in the poker game, so without taking his eyes off the table, he explained that it was Rod's job to handle such matters on his own. And then the game came back to his attention. He remembered everything clearly and clutched his head guiltily. He shouldn't have taken his job so lightly. Cyber was a famous medical consortium. Well, he's coming over right now. Where's the corporate rep? And Rod lowered his voice and whispered, squinting at the guest in his office. He had been waiting for Xiang Sang for half an hour. It was time to get to work. And the boy jumped up briskly and began to dress as if he had not had a sleepless night. He no longer felt sleepy. The guards were waiting outside his door as usual, and he ordered Paul in a sonorous voice to get ready. He immediately ordered all units to stand by. When Sang left the house, his helicopter was already waiting for him on the lawn. The machine's blades made him duck, but the young man easily walked over to it and jumped into the cockpit. Already in the sky, the pilot turned to him. Where were they headed today? Hawaii or Las Vegas? But the guy just grinned. We had to get back to New York. The Corfan's office was already waiting for him. Rod handed him the documents. It contained all the information about the Cyber Corporation, but Sang tossed them aside nonchalantly. It was no use, especially since the man was already waiting for him in the reception area, so Xiang would find out everything about him on the spot. With these words, he took firm steps towards the waiting room. At the threshold, he stood for a second, scrutinizing the back of the uninvited guest, and then his eyes and voice became carefree. He apologized for the wait. Representative Cyber smiled politely, but his gaze glittered with steel. He was already thinking that he would have to stay here until night before he could see Mr. Sang. However, the man only shrugged his shoulders. It could not be helped that in their line of work they had to process a huge amount of information every day. The kin handed him the letters of intent, and Sang scrutinized them. So the Cyborg Corporation was going to give them 20 trillion to take over. His guest nodded indulgently. That was right. He didn't understand why he was spending so much time on such a deal. Of course, this one wouldn't miss such an opportunity. However, his eyes widened in surprise. Sang discarded the document as if it were a menu at a cheap restaurant, not an offer to get a fortune. His look was cocky. The guy apologized, but their direct investment window was already closed. He thought the cyborg could only wait for further opportunity. The corporate representative couldn't help himself and his voice almost broke into a shout. It was beneficial to cooperate with them. They could provide support in other ways. But the Sang only snorted. He immediately pulled himself together and apologized for his intemperance. His behavior had finally pissed off the cyber representative. He jumped up. In this world, power, wealth, and violence were intertwined. And as far as he knew, Corfans didn't have enough allies in other areas. But Sang didn't let him finish. This wasn't Brazil. In America, power and wealth were linked. But violence. After all, they weren't arms dealers. Sang was ready for a long bickering. However, the corporate representative suddenly fell silent as abruptly as he exploded. He turned around and walked out of the meeting room. He turned around once more on the threshold and gritted his teeth. He hoped that in a month's time the Corfans would think the same way he did now. His voice was threatening. However, this wasn't the first year Sang had been in his chair. It was hard to embarrass him. He smiled sweetly and asked me to close the door behind him. Oh, those Brazilian guys. Hearing this condescending tone, the corporate representative paused for a moment. The jowls on his jaw quivered, but he pulled himself together and walked out. As soon as the door slammed behind him, he immediately attacked Sang. Why would the boss deliberately insult a man like that? After all, they didn't want any unnecessary enemies. Guy's facial expression also changed now he was serious. Cyber carried a malicious monopoly of enterprises that deliberately inflated drug prices. He wasn't interested in that kind of cooperation. And seeing that Rod was trying to object, he interrupted him firmly. It was no good. He stood up and headed for the door. Their company wasn't short of funds. After all, a shady corporation like this didn't deserve to partner with them. He turned around and looked at the assistant carefully, whether he knew what he was talking about. Rod nodded confusedly, once again marveling at his boss's personality. A little later, when the workday was over and evening had fallen on New York, Rod headed tiredly to his favorite bar near the office. He needed to de-stress. Sitting at the bar all alone, he tinkled the ice on the rim of his glass, tired and a little doomed. Suddenly, a familiar voice came from nearby. The cyber corporation representative they had escorted out this afternoon sat down next to him and smiled at him. It was lucky to have a boss like Sang, wasn't it? Roth stared at him questioningly, not understanding what he meant. The man took his drink and smiled, but did not explain what he had said. His gaze became meaningful. He had something he wanted to discuss with the assistant of a man like Sang. Rod sighed doomfully. These situations had happened to him before. A group of people were rushing quickly but silently through the park near the large mansion. They were dressed in all black like ninjas and could not be seen. They were already at the front door when one of them hit the motion sensor and the house alarm went off. The group froze, trying to anticipate what would happen next. Sang, who had just gotten out of the shower and was already dreaming of a warm bed, didn't pay much attention. He sent Paul to check the yard. A fox had probably gotten in, but no matter how many times he called out to his bodyguard, he didn't respond. It was as if the house had died out. Sang didn't know that his guards in the courtyard were no longer showing signs of life. Sang, meanwhile, sensed something wrong. It was strange. He went to the window and opened it, listening. Where did everyone go? Before he could turn around, he was attacked from behind by a ninja. Sang could only smell the stifling odor of the rag near his nose, and everything went dark around him. A few months later, it was moved again to a new warehouse. This time it was Texas. But Sang seemed to have long since lost interest in what was happening. He had spent most of that time tied up with a sack over his head. Now daylight, though dim, stung his eyes. He cringed. It took him a few minutes to realize that he was not alone. This time, a familiar representative of the cyber corporation was sitting across from him. His eyes glittered with rage and cruelty. It was clear that there was no mercy from such a man. He smiled and greeted Mr. Sang. A thug from behind grabbed him by the back of the head and threw him to the ground. Sang hit him hard, unable to defend himself. His hands were tied tightly. He looked up at his tormentor with hatred. So that's who brought him here. But the man clucked his tongue. He hadn't been able to bring him here from Miami. Footsteps were heard, and another man in a suit approached Sang, lying on the floor. It was one of Kybera's partners. He introduced himself, Donnie Leva. Another pair of cold, half-closed eyes stared at the boy. His cigarette was smoking in his hands, and he took a slow drag, glancing at his victim. Finally, he spoke. The thing he used to cheer up was flowing into the United States straight from Mexico just through his hands. Sang grinned. So the medical corporation got involved with a drug cartel. Why would they pull such a heavy machination? Just to subdue him. Donnie came closer and leaned towards Sang and whispered. He was very much mistaken, for the Corfins had not belonged to him for a long time. He made a hand sign and stepped aside. Another man approached Sang. He had a laptop in his hands. He opened the lid and turned the monitor toward the boy. His eyes gleamed merrily. Sang took a closer look. On the screen was Rod, his assistant. He was answering reporters' questions. Was it true that the head had overdosed? It was a blow to the boy. He stared at the confused face of his former comrade and couldn't believe it. Rod had betrayed him to get power and money. The cyborg representative was triumphant. He was now immersed in the search for a new leader for the Corfand. Didn't that sound a little familiar to Sang himself? So they were in cahoots. But he shook his head. He was just in the right place at the right time and made the family an offer they couldn't refuse. Sang had only one question: why they were doing this? What did Corfund have that would require so much effort? The man smiled. These were trivial questions for them. Didn't Sang remember how their last conversation had ended? Violence was about wealth, and now in such a miserable situation, the famous Xiang Sang is ready to repeat his words, ready to say no again without the support of violence. But the boy, stunned by the betrayal in his company, remained stubbornly silent, and the man sighed, seemingly even with regret, that he had made up his mind, and turning around he squeamishly wiped the sole of his boot on Sang's head. Get this fool out of here. He was bothering him with his presence. Two guys grabbed Sang and put him on his feet and put the sack over his head again. The boy found himself in darkness again, but this time, it was salvation. Donnie looked at the departing men carefully and turned to his companion without taking his cigarette out of his mouth. He didn't understand his rage, what he was going to do with this guy. And the guy explained. He would use his material and give it to the lab. The lab was short on test subjects at the moment. It wasn't long before Sang was actually sent to a secret laboratory, and he found himself strapped to a hospital couch. When he woke up, he was in surgery. The masked doctor leaned over him and, without turning his head, ordered, "Scalpel." His experienced eyes picked out the best place for the incision on the back of the boy's head. Sang woke up but felt a noise in his head. He couldn't understand where he was or why he couldn't move, what was happening to him. But there was no more strength to fight. Suddenly, he felt a deafening pain. It was as if a red-hot iron had slashed across his neck. The lad twisted and his arms were bound. He screamed terribly. The doctor turned to the assistant. "The 82nd subject is awake. We need to increase the dose of anesthetic to keep him still." The patient was returned to a lethargic sleep. Sang no longer felt what was happening next, and that the doctors had performed surgery on his head, and that 3 dark figures were tirelessly watching the whole process. Finally, it was over. The boy was still unconscious. The doctors had dispersed. They had done their job, and they didn't care about this man. Sang remained on the couch. His head was wrapped in bandages. Here in this dreadful laboratory, test subjects had no names. His name was now the 82nd. On the 7th day after the operation, a meeting was held. The chief physician explained to those present. In their time, the gap between civilians and the elite was rapidly narrowing. It is predicted that the lower classes, thanks to the availability of knowledge, will achieve a class leap within the next 3 generations. And then the apocalypse will come. Millions of families will be able to have children who will compete with the upper classes. And the people here clearly wouldn't want that kind of development. But instead of selling weapons against undesirable dorks, they've created a real innovation. It will allow the elite not to fear being dethroned. Everyone stood up and followed the doctor down the hall. He continued. "A week ago, their partners had delivered the magnificent experimental. The man was born in an ordinary family, but relying on his outstanding mathematical talent and education, made a huge amount of money in a short period of time." Everyone stopped in front of an empty room in the middle of which a young man was sitting and painting on a canvas. He was not distracted and did not pay attention to those present. It was Sung, who was making new strokes with his eyes closed. It was hard to recognize him now. He was thin and haggard and had a collar around his neck. The doctor explained now his subject was painting an oil painting in the neoclassical style. There was whispering all around. Wow, he could paint too. But the doctor only grinned. Before the surgery, he couldn't. But thanks to their technology, he had gained the skills of a skilled artist, and more. There were many discoveries ahead of them. The people of the elite looked at the man with renewed interest. But how did the researchers achieve such a stunning result? The doctor tapped his finger on his temple. Just a minor operation based on transplantation. It was a way of giving a person a piece of knowledge. It took a while for Sung to feel so alert and confident. He woke up on the 2nd day and struggled to get up on the hospital bed. He could hardly remember what had happened. The doctor immediately appeared in front of him, asking about his well-being. But the young man couldn't answer anything. What they had done to him. He felt a pain in the back of his head. The doctor grinned. "It's not a big deal. It's just a small operation. He would recover quickly now." All his vitals were normal. Sung found it hard to believe. His anxiety increased even more when his fingers felt a strange object around his neck, as if it were sewn into his skin. Just a minor surgery then. He glanced suspiciously at the doctor, but he covered his eyes and sighed. It was the same thing every time. To put it plainly, they took away all his talents and knowledge of math and economics. Sang only chuckled. "That's a funny joke." But the doctor just waved his hands, which was not a joke at all, but a perfectly acceptable explanation of what happened to the guy, in layman's terms. But Sung rubbed his aching neck and grinned again. So be it. He thought to himself that he could name a few economic terms at random. The doctor, seeing that the guy inwardly resisted what had happened, gently repeated, "What was the point of him lying? He was telling the truth." And Sang exploded. Patience left him this time. His voice became boisterous and loud. What the hell is going on here? He couldn't remember anything. But the doctor remained calm and even bored. This part of his job was boring him. Why did each of them ask the same question in these experiments? He'll have to start with the part that Sang can understand. For the past few years, they've been studying the areas of the human brain responsible for knowledge management, and the operation they ran was based on their discovery. He should have been proud to be part of an experiment that could turn people's lives around. Left alone, Sang thought hard. It was night, and he had been through a lot of turmoil in the past few months. But there was no sleep in any of his eyes. At this time, the doctor was also awake. He went to report the latest news to his boss. He knocked on the door of his office and quietly called out to his boss. Everything went smoothly. Their test subject had accepted the current reality. So it was time to start testing the chip, especially since the previous sample had already been depleted. His body had reached a critical point and could no longer function. It was time to write off the 81, and Mr. Hemingway's assistant bowed. The next day, Sang was taken to a room for experiments. And while the doctors in robes were adjusting the equipment, the guy was thinking hard, looking at his palm. On it was a chip that he was told would be inserted into a hole in his neck. It was a carrier of knowledge, but Sang couldn't understand how it would work. A doctor he knew appeared in the office, and he held out his hand to him, and the man explained. The chip was a product of their company. Now they needed help testing it. It contained all the skills of violin mastery, and Sang froze. Did it mean that his knowledge would also be replaced? The doctor came closer to him. His hands rested soothingly on the boy's shoulders. Of course, he already knew one user of the invention himself. It was an old acquaintance of his, Rod. At the moment, he was acting as the interim head of Corfin, and thanks to the chip, he had no trouble with that position. It's all falling into place. No wonder the Brazilians were so confident they could control his company. Meanwhile, the doctor watched him. It was the first time he had seen such magnificent self-control, and the ability to regulate his emotions. This guy could be called a consummate elite. In the meantime, Sang turned to the doctor as if he had made a final decision. He marveled at his abilities once again. So the guy just needs to insert the chip into the slot on the back of his neck. And Sang, realizing the hopelessness of his situation, immediately followed his advice. There was a click, and his body jerked as if he'd been electrocuted, an ancient sensation. It was like energy flowing through his veins instead of blood. Seeing that the experiment had begun, the doctors scrambled to turn on the equipment. They had to record every moment and then report back. Sang sat motionless and seemed not to hear or react to anything. A bag was placed in front of him and opened and pushed it toward the boy. It turned out that inside was a violin of superb quality. It was the kind of violin one would see in the most talented musicians of the time. Sang heard a voice above him. Let him clear his mind and follow his instincts. Now he was not an economist, but a world-famous cellist. He followed this advice, picked up his instrument, and stood in front of the doctors. His posture and movements gave him the appearance of a high-level musician. He played, and magical sounds filled the room. The music was so beautifully and skillfully performed that even the calloused doctors froze for a moment with delight. Sang continued to play with his eyes closed. The bow slid smoothly over the strings. He was completely absorbed in the process and did not notice anything around him. The experimental team froze, not daring to believe that their case had finally come to life. It worked. Their test subject had gained knowledge through the chip. Mr. Hemingway appeared behind their backs and ordered them to send an invitation to the partners. Tell them there was something he wanted to show them in 4 days. The experiments continued, and on the day of the meeting with the partners, he had already acquired new knowledge and could paint. His paintings were masterpieces of modern times. He seemed to be completely absorbed in the process, but he was not. He looked at those who had come in and pondered. He could only come to two conclusions. Their research could be divided into two parts. They seemed to be looking for unique talents, and then already extracting knowledge and skills for their own purposes. In other words, it was knowledge transfer, the ability to inherit a certain amount of skill through uploading and transforming the chip by humans. Sang already knew he was the 82nd specimen. What had happened to the previous subjects? He remembered his conversation with his doctor yesterday. He said that tomorrow the big men would come to the lab to check the progress of their project. Sang had to prepare himself too. The guy was supposed to not say anything unnecessary and do anything that wasn't asked of him. And now Sang realized he was just an expendable commodity. Apparently, downloading chip had certain risks he didn't know about. Or there were already problems with the previous guys involved in the experience. Mr. Hemingway continued to answer his partner's questions. So he extracted knowledge from one man and kidnapped another to use in his project. It was a crime, but no one cared about the moral aspects. What mattered was the result. That's what they doubted. There was no one capable of such a thing. The doctor explained that the operation was not dangerous and was not a problem as long as the person's body had no serious defects. Fairly straightforward and simple. His smooth narrative was interrupted by one of the military commanders present. He had a hunch, if he was right. If Mr. Hemingway is to be believed after using their technology, they will be able to breed war veterans in batches. His voice even trembled with excitement, and the doctor, seeing his interest, snapped his fingers. He was right. Besides, just one chip would be enough to give hundreds of people new knowledge. But the military isn't used to taking our word for it. Let him prove it. And if it's true, they'll fully support their project. And Mr. Hemingway smiled triumphantly, as if expecting this offer. At his request, he would show them one of his newest developments. It's going to be quite a show. They came to another room as round as the arena. One of the walls opened and a Sang appeared on the threshold. Hemingway announced the contestant to the Pride of Wall Street. No real combat experience. They're going to test the fighter chip now. Have number 82 prepare for the performance. Sang shuddered. All this he heard through his earpiece. The guy realized that after being shown as an artist, he now had to impress as a fighter. He looked around and saw his opponent appear in the arena. The heavyweight from Swenwan prison, imprisoned there for 300 years. Butcher Reed with a chainsaw. Sang took a closer look at his enemy. An interesting prospect. He looked at his puny opponent and grinned like a fierce wild beast. But the voice from the speaker interrupted his musings again. Next up was the former head of the corporation's mercenaries, Darren. He was nicknamed the Lone Wolf of Ingram. The butcher showed his teeth again. This opponent seemed more serious to him, so he would have to destroy him first. Darren grinned when he heard that. Let him try. Finally, another contestant entered the arena, an elite intelligence agent. The girl looked so spectacular in her leather jumpsuit that the men froze with delight. Sang did not lose his cool. Interestingly, first the assassin, then the mercenary, and now the special agent was pitted against him. He furtively looked around and froze. He saw some people watching the performance, but there was no way to see them. The glass was purposely opaque on this side. Mr. Hemingway was explaining to his partners. This time, a fighter chip was loaded into the body of Experiment 82. Everyone watched with interest. There were no rules to this game. Anyone who could survive to the end got a 50-year vacation. Their freedom and a few $1,000s were at stake. The countdown has begun. 3, 2, 1. Let's go. And each contestant prepared for mortal combat, realizing there would be no mercy. The fight began, but everyone remained in place, looking closely at their opponents. Sang listed to himself a professional mercenary special agent and a serial killer. He should have been focused and calm. The organizers chose him to test the new chip. He wanted to show a third party the potential, all abilities and powers. As he realized, these people also desired to create a man whose strength would be based on indifferent violence. But if you look on the bright side, it's a chance to get rid of his predicament. He'll have to draw attention to the performance. He shifted his gaze to the creepy prisoner. The organizers had sent this guy to play with them, which was pretty reckless of them. While everyone was thinking about the strength of the enemy, Darrell didn't notice that the girl special agent was staring at him, assessing his equipment. He held a Colt in his hands. In that case, she should stick to a fighting distance of 8 meters. She can handle him first, and then the big guy, and then the regular person. The only one who could break her plan was Butcher Reed. If only that pig was willing to team up with her, she could focus her attention on an important target, the girl wondered. How to get him to agree to join her, as suddenly Reed himself called her and proposed to act together. The weak one from the organizers they could keep for now, but they'd have to team up to take out the strongest. The girl tried not to show her joy. Just in case, she decided to elaborate what he was going to do, and Reed explained he would unload the mercenary's gun on himself, and the girl would help him. She'll sneak up behind him and grab him. He'd take it from there. Her role was minimal. She wasn't risking anything. The key was to do it quickly and quietly. This plan suited her just fine. Darrell noticed their preparations and clutched his gun tighter, ready to defend himself. Butcher Reed's smirk. 3, 2, 2, 1. As fast as his size would allow, he threw himself at his enemy. Paul shuddered. In a moment, he was there, swinging the chainsaw over Darrell. The one who had already come to his senses pointed the muzzle of his weapon directly at the fat chest of the enemy and began to shoot. But the bullets, though they harmed him, did not stop him. Suddenly, a shadow flashed behind him. It was a special agent who crept up silently from behind and crouched down and deftly kicked him. The man turned around and bounced. Now his weapon was aimed at her. The girl was very close and it was not difficult to destroy her. He pulled the trigger. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. Bullets whistled through the air, but surprisingly none of them hit the girl. She moved swiftly and silently and easily evaded the shots. A few moments later, she leapt up to Darrell and knocked the gun out of his hands with a swift movement of her hand. The weapon clattered to the floor. Her hands turned into snakes in front of the astonished man's eyes, entangling him and preventing him from moving. His teeth clenched with tension and anger. The melee began, and the special agent was not inferior in strength and courage. Darrell pulled one arm free and reached for his belt. The next moment, a dagger flashed in his hand, and the girl knew how skillfully he could wield it. The sharply honed blade glinted in the light of the lamps. Time seemed to slow down, and she watched in horror as the dagger approached her throat. In a moment, she would be out of this dangerous game. But the special agent was a true warrior and never gave up. At the last second, she leaned back sharply, and the blade whistled through the air without touching her. Darrell shrieked in disappointment. Suddenly, she vanished into thin air and reappeared behind him. His eyes couldn't catch her movements. A moment more and she fixed his body. Moving closer to his ear, mockingly whispered, "Let her apologize, but this show will end." Darrell wanted to respond. Red the Butcher appeared behind them. With a swing, he announced that he was the only one left standing, and the man and the girl froze in horror at their impending doom. His eyes glowed with triumph. Next time, let the special agent think before accepting someone else's invitation. There was nothing good in this world. He was already lowering the saw when suddenly a shadow flashed behind him, and his weapon clattered to the ground. He flew the other way. It was Sang, who had destroyed one of the opponents in one move, and to his horror, felt satisfaction. Could it be that the chip had such an effect on his personality? Meanwhile, Darrell and the special agent, as if coming out of hypnosis, swung at their enemy. They appreciated his strength and the ease with which he had dealt with the big man, but Sang calmly watched their approach without making any attempt to run away or defend himself. He had already felt his power, and it was incommensurate with his enemy's strength. In front of his astonished partners, he easily disarmed 2 opponents at once with a light movement and caused a flurry of applause. It was unbelievable. Many of these people had heard of the lone wolf's battles and knew what he was capable of. But now he hadn't even had a chance to move before he went to the next world. Mr. Hemingway called everyone to silence and asked for permission to explain what had happened. His voice was smug. It was exactly the reaction he had expected. The test subject was trained as a first-class assassin, the infamous John Chris. But Hemingway was surprised the guy could do it so easily. The partner expressed doubts. Didn't it say that an ordinary person who has not been trained can't get the same potential as an expert? The discussion continued long enough even after the partners, along with Mr. Hemingway, moved back into the meeting room. However, one of them remained thoughtful and silent. The fool simply did not understand what the consequences of the rapid development of such a level of technology would be. At the same time, Sang was taken back to the lab and strapped into a chair. Then they took the chip out of him. The boy was free for the day. He'd done his part. Sang stood up quietly and began to dress. He was just buttoning his shirt when his doctor's hand rested on his shoulder. He shook his head approvingly. Well done. Now the investors were deciding on additional investments. The doctor was so happy that he decided to let the young man's every wish be fulfilled. Sang shook his head incredulously. Is it really any? But the man immediately corrected himself, anything that would not be too excessively possible to realize. The boy thought for a moment, then stretched his whole body and said, I want to eat in your canteen. He was tired of the hospital cooking. This statement made the doctor lose his look of calm for a second. His jaw dropped and his eyes almost rolled out of his orbits in surprise. Was this really it? But Sang shrugged nonchalantly. Yes, that's all he wanted right now. A normal and human meal. And he left the lab to the surprised stares. Dr. Hemingway kept his word, and starting the next morning, Sang was able to eat lunch with everyone in the dining room. He knew he was attracting interest and could hear them discussing him behind his back, but his appearance remained calm and unconcerned. He seemed completely absorbed in his choice of food. The scientists watched him with interest. Wasn't this the same test subject the cyborg had recently sent over? The billionaire from New York. They even felt sorry for him. But now he was just experimental material, and his stay here would last a long time, so they shouldn't feel sorry for him like everyone else. Sang glanced furtively at the chattering scientists, trying not to miss a single word. There was bound to come a moment when they would say something worthwhile. Those continued to chatter. The project of one of them was progressing quickly and the director promised a vacation. The other one kept the conversation going. It was said that someone in his group had fallen ill. That's what happened. A guy with a sea breeze allergy. Knowing his peculiarity, he still ignored it and went to the beach to sunbathe. But he hadn't had a vacation in 2 years. He stayed at the base to work on projects for days and nights. And often, he didn't even get a chance to go outside for a breath of fresh air. The subject was a common pain. Every day they had to do the dirty work in the lab, but instead of a vacation, they were even banned from the network. Suddenly, one of them turned around and looked at Sang's back as if sensing his gaze, but he continued to eat calmly, ignoring the people around him. Still, the scientists quickly gathered and decided to take their conversation elsewhere. Even though it was late, Sang had managed to find out 3 things in a few days. First, the laboratory was located on an isolated ocean island. It was closed off from the outside world, and the workers had only 2 vacations a year. Every couple of months, the lab requested a new test subject. The relationship between her and the cyber funding the project was more complicated than the guy had previously thought. Of course, his previous conclusion wasn't wrong either. For the researchers, they were just expendable. But what led to such frequent replacement? His situation was no longer optimistic. The sword of Damocles was hanging over him. His fears urged him to find a way out of this situation as soon as possible. Even though he'd been here for months, the investigation hadn't progressed at all. He remembered the fuzzy silhouettes of the people behind the glass. Could he really only count on the other side? After all, the fight show that day was obviously a temporary demonstration of the chip's potential. The sponsors may well have assessed the benefits and risks of the technology. If there was a wise man among them, he was obliged to find a way to prevent the spread of chips. But there was a hitch. Time was running out. And if such a daredevil and truth-teller had found himself among the investors, shouldn't he have done something about it by now? Thinking in this way, Sang did not even realize that a military helicopter was approaching the island where the laboratory was located. On board were armed men listening to the latest instructions. The customer ordered to take the researchers and completely destroy information about the project. They only had 2 hours for the whole operation. Then, they were to disappear as quickly as they had appeared, and the group responded with a long cry. The collar around Sang's neck vibrated. His lunch break was over. He had to go to Area D. The boy had no choice but to submit. But just as he pushed the tray away and got to his feet, the floor beneath him shook as if from an earthquake, and suddenly, a deafening explosion was heard in the distance. The building shook, and a hole was created in the wall. A group of armed men, in a chain, quickly and carefully entered the building. Their commander was transmitting information over the radio. C-Squad was inside. The lab's security level was lower than anticipated, and they were expected to complete a full sweep within 40 minutes. The loudspeaker in the building shuddered with alarming messages. There was an intruder in the area. All employees were asked to evacuate by emergency. Sang, who had been frozen for the first minute, came to his senses. A wicked smile played on his lips. Here was his chance to get out of here at last. Meanwhile, the armed men attacked the guards. and although they managed to hide around the corner and kept shooting back, they could not hold out for long. Mr. Hemingway stared at the monitors in confusion. He saw that the laboratory was rapidly falling into the hands of the occupiers. Already, Zone A had been taken over. His phone rang. Grabbing the receiver, he was relieved to hear James's voice as his assistant, but his voice trembled with fear. Would the guards be able to hold out? He stood in front of the electronic map of the lab and watched in horror as more and more areas lit up red. There was no stopping the raiding party. The enemy level was too high and their security forces couldn't cope. Now, every zone was either overrun or falling under the onslaught. Mr. Hemingway disconnected the call and sighed heavily. Now they would have to give up. There was no other way out. Otherwise, they would all be killed here. He turned to his assistant to see if everything was ready, and he asked, trembling with tension, for another 30 seconds. He was starting the destruction of the files on the server. Amidst all this commotion, Sang looked calm and even peaceful. It seemed God was still on his side, even though he sometimes seemed to have forgotten that he existed. Now that all the guards were focused on the intruders, no one could stop him. Wouldn't think to look amidst all this panic. Meanwhile, several researchers were frantically sorting through the chips in the vault. Time was running out. Their hands were shaking and unresponsive. One of them was putting the chips in a case. It was a task assigned to them by the chief doctor. He was to take all the Class A chips, and he had almost all of them. Suddenly, the door opened and a Sang appeared on the threshold. He was dragging the breathless body of one of the doctors. His eyes glittered with anger and made the lab technicians shudder. Meanwhile, a helicopter arrived on the roof of Area D, to which Hemingway hurried. He had to get out of here fast. He knew too much and would not be spared. Just getting into the cockpit, he ordered the pilot to take off. He sighed with relief as he took the seat. It looked like he had managed to elude his pursuers. He rejoiced early as a rustle was heard behind him and a sharp knife dug into his throat. The face of one of the bandits came close to his ear. "Nice try, Doctor." Meanwhile, the doctor who had been captured by the Sang began to regain consciousness. He opened his eyes, though the picture was still fuzzy. But the boy waited patiently. Finally, the doctor exhaled and remembered everything that had happened. Goosebumps ran through his body. He had fallen into the clutches of a subject who was clearly out for revenge. The doctor tried to move, but nothing came out. The more he tried to break free, the harder and more painful the ropes cut into his skin. Sang continued to wait. At last, the doctor remembered everything definitively and began to turn around fearfully. What had become of Jerry, his colleague? He was nowhere to be seen. Suddenly, he froze with his mouth open. His gaze stopped on the locker opposite the door, where a puddle of something red and sticky was dripping from underneath. A hunch immediately flashed through his mind and he roared with anger. How dare this guinea pig massacre his friend? But Sang shrugged his shoulders wearily. To reassure the doctor, he reminded him that he still had a daughter. Did he really want to take his colleague's place and let the girl spend her childhood without a father? The man was quiet for a moment and then looked up at his tormentor with a look of anger. What did Song want with him? Let him speak. He let him live for a reason. Meanwhile, in the helicopter, Hemingway froze with his hands up, but did not lose his cool. He half turned to his attacker and asked who had sent him here. But the man was not inclined to talk. Instead of answering, he jerked the doctor to his feet and began to rummage through his suit. He was obviously looking for something specific, and almost immediately he found it. There was a bug in his palm. He smirked. The client hadn't asked for the doctor's safe return, so he shouldn't have joked. With those words, he clenched his fist, and the small device shattered into tiny shards under the power of his hand. That was it. Now they could talk without witnesses. At Cyber Corporation, a security officer reported to Donnie. They had found the device, and now it was impossible to locate the doctor. Sang continued the questioning, whether the chip had negative effects on the test subject, and the doctor confirmed that it did. The chips caused convective personality disorder. The test subjects who had been in front of Song were now being incarcerated in the isolation ward because of serious personality disorders. He had no reason to lie. There was no way to eliminate the side effects. All they could do was delay the onset of the disease by strictly controlling the timing of the chip frequency. The boy thought about it, but only for a minute. He ordered the doctor to take him to the place where they kept the test subjects who had already been incapacitated. Tom could only obey. They carefully made their way through the corridors and stopped in front of the elevator. It was now being guarded by the mercenaries who had attacked the lab. Every way in and out was under their control. There was nothing to think of slipping past such chain dogs unnoticed. Sang thought again. What to do? The decision came quickly, and after hastily explaining the plan of action to the horrified doctor, he pushed him out into the corridor and went out himself. The guards immediately noticed them, but they were already in character and smiled calmly despite the muzzles of the guns pointed at them. They only wanted to surrender to the mercy of the victors. The mercenaries stared at them without lowering their weapons, not knowing what to do. Finally, one of them made a decision. Turning to the second one, he ordered him to examine them. Then he turned to the Sang and the doctor and ordered them to kneel down and not to move. The voice sounded so menacing that there was no doubt. If you disobeyed, he would shoot. The two obediently sat down. and waited for the guard to examine them. Song seemed amused by all this. His voice was cheerful and calm, and his movements did not show excitement. The mercenary approached him first and began rummaging through his clothes. The boy waited patiently for the end of the search. Finally, the guard told his comrade that everything was clean and went to the doctor. However, before he could take a couple of steps, Sang jumped up and grabbed his weapon from its holster. He didn't even realize what had happened at first. So light and swift were the young man's movements. He was too late to rush at him and was immediately struck in the solar plexus by Sang's knee. The mercenary was just pulling the trigger when the bullet pierced his forehead. The mercenary had just pulled the trigger when the bullet pierced his forehead. The doctor froze in horror. He also followed Sang into the elevator without saying a word. However, standing behind him, he kept his eyes on the boy and finally dared to ask. How he had just pulled all this off was clearly not using a fighter chip. Sang didn't understand the nature of his new skills, so he shrugged and smiled. Perhaps because he had a good memory, some things in his head were still not forgotten. But the doctor interrupted him in a way that was simply impossible. Sang snorted smugly. Then there was only one explanation: he had innate skills that set him apart from the others. They drove on in silence. Finally, the elevator arrived at Sector Bay 4. Both Sang and the doctor carefully peeked out from behind the door. They didn't want to run into the mercenaries again. But everything was clear, and they staggered through the isolation room. The boy looked around in amazement. It was a real prison with prisoners. There were a lot of cells and they were located on 2 floors. The prisoners were different from one another. Some sat quietly, absorbed in their thoughts. Others lay chained to their beds, their faces shrouded in masks. There were girls among them. The prisoners were united by a certain detached attitude to everything that was going on. No one was interested in the appearance of the newcomers. At last, Song stood in the middle of the corridor and made an announcement in a loud voice. Before introducing himself, he wanted to let them know that they were all free. The cells continued to be completely silent, and although the prisoners came closer to look at Sang, they showed no surprise or joy. The guy expecting to get a standing ovation froze and looked back at the doctor. Was he sure these guys were suffering from a personality disorder and not something else? And he confirmed it. No one's mental faculties were impaired. Sang was completely confused, but suddenly a voice from the next cell called out to him, and he looked around. It was as if the prisoner had read his mind and explained. Most of the people here had the opportunity to escape on their own, but they didn't, because they didn't want to. Sang froze, trying to comprehend what he had heard, but he continued mockingly. Didn't the scientist standing next to the young man tell him about the hidden threat? And if he knows everything, then he must understand why they kept the utmost restraint and willingly stayed here. Finally, the guy started to realize they were waiting for the scientist to find a cure for the side effects. So his attempts to free them were only met with ridicule. Sang shifted his eyebrows and clenched his teeth. He felt a surge of rage. After all, he wanted to save them. But one of the prisoners kept laughing and annoyed him more and more. Suddenly, a shot was heard, and the laughter was cut short. The prisoner now had a bullet in his forehead. The other prisoners shuddered and turned to Sang, not daring to make a sound. The doctor jumped up to him. What he was doing? He had no right to dispose of the lives of unhealthy people so easily. However, Sang felt no remorse. He realized that he had caused hatred in the other prisoners, but he didn't care. The guy would take down anyone who dared to humiliate or mock him, especially since he's finally gotten everyone's attention. It's time to explain to them what's going on. Their desire to get well and become normal people again is futile. Because a group of mercenaries recently infiltrated the lab, and most likely has already seized the entire territory and gathered the research group in one place. Soon, they'll be in the detention center. And then what will they do to them as prisoners? When they heard this, the people were stunned into silence. They realized that their fate was sealed. Sang continued he had no intention of becoming their leader, but he needed allies who shared the same goal as he did and were willing to take revenge. Suddenly, a woman's voice interrupted his speech. The girl flirted and asked who his enemy was. She was ready to go to the end of the world with such a handsome man. But the boy didn't appreciate the joke, and his voice and look remained serious. He knew who was to blame for his troubles. Cyber Corporation. That's where he was headed. The girl smiled, but her eyes flashed steel at the sound of that name. What a coincidence. Her enemy was also a cyber. The elevator in Sector F1 opened, and the mercenaries with weapons at the ready stepped out into the corridor. The sweep was almost complete. There were a few areas left to inspect. One of them handed over to the commander. The body of one of the explorers was found in the sector. Now the only thing left was the S area to suppress the enemies. Sang walked over to the girl. At the moment, they had no way to confront the powerful corporation. The case was not an easy one, but he had a plan. He was going to go to Hong Kong to start developing from there, and then think about revenge. Only after the conditions were right. The girl was quite satisfied with such terms. She shrieked happily and promised to go with him as an ally. A voice came from above. One prisoner was following their conversation closely. Even if they were lucky enough to take over Cyber, the company's shareholders had power. They wouldn't be left out. It was obvious that Sang had chosen enemies beyond his abilities, and that he was bound to fail and collapse. Hearing those words, the boy clenched his teeth, or maybe someone was just afraid. The prisoners shifted their eyebrows but immediately calmed down. The provocative tactic had been effective. Have him leave his contacts and he'll get back to him when he gets back to Canada. A short bell rang, and the elevator doors on the floor swung open. Armed mercenaries stood on the threshold. They had finally reached the isolation ward. The prisoners looked at them with interest, but they were silent. The prisoners looked at them with interest, but all were silent. This made them nervous and alarmed. One of the men reported to the commander. A large number of imprisoned test subjects were discovered. In response, they were allowed to remove them as necessary. Unsure of how to properly execute the command, the mercenaries spun in place to choose their first victim. They didn't notice that Sang was watching them closely. He took the place of the shot prisoner and put it forward like a shield. Now he could see everything, but he was not seen. Suddenly, the girl called out to the mercenaries. Taking a seductive pose, she asked for a favor, and those who looked on for a moment lowered their weapons. That was enough for Sang. Once behind them, he raised his gun and pointed it at their backs. The last thing they saw was the girl's mocking smile, and then the shots rang out. When the guy came closer, one of the mercenaries was badly wounded but alive. Sang's hand didn't waver this time. He pulled the trigger one more time and everything went silent. He looked around and spoke. Let them listen and memorize. Within a year, he would be in Hong Kong, open to anyone who wanted to join the revenge. At this time, one of the group was scrutinizing the surveillance video. It was important to find all the researchers and gather them in one place. His pupils dilated with surprise. A team came out of the elevator. A young man, a girl, and one of the doctors. How could they be there with the mercenaries prowling around? He pointed the camera and it flashed, bringing the picture closer. This signal did not escape Sang. He stared at the camera and his gaze gave the former mercenary goosebumps. As soon as Sang, the doctor, and the girl left, the isolation ward was completely silent again. However, one of the prisoners was thinking intensely about something. He took out a piece of thin wire from his sleeve and, after some more thought, made a hook out of it. Then he went to the door of his cell. Slowly and expertly, he picked the lock a few times and it clicked. The way was open. One of the prisoners was watching him. He saw his fellow misfit silently open the door and head down the hallway toward the entrance. His insides trembled and he smiled indulgently. He shouted after his comrade, "You're leaving." And without turning around, he confirmed it. He too had decided to go out for some fresh air. He'd been sitting here too long. He didn't stop wondering if he really believed what the boy had said. But the guy just shrugged. No. That's why he was going to watch him for a year. With these words, he walked over to the cell where the chained prisoner lay and looked into his eyes, whether he wanted to go with him. But he only blinked his eyes. Why the comrade decided to choose him? And the man explained. He wasn't sure how to deal with the organizer's harassment, but he knew for sure that he could help him. At this time, a small group of Sangha girl and the doctor were rummaging through the chip vault. They need to take the most valuable copies with them before they leave. The guy turned to the girl. He pointed to a cabinet with a lot of interesting chips in it. If she was going to take something with her, let her choose there. But she only smiled. No, she was quite happy with her current state and didn't want to increase the load. She was just curious to see. At the same time, an extraction team was approaching the elevator. They had received a command to destroy 2 prisoners who had escaped from the detention center and were ready to carry out the order. The elevator buzzed briefly, announcing that it had stopped at the floor, and the doors slowly opened. The silhouettes of 2 men appeared inside. They weren't hiding. Calmly stepping out into the corridor, the prisoners looked around as if assessing the load. There were at least 10 mercenaries. Then they would be able to handle it without a problem. At the same time, another door of one of the cells opened and a man stepped carefully so as not to get dirty, approached the dead bodies of the mercenaries and took their weapons. But as he was about to leave, he heard someone call out to him, "Scarface, take me with you. I have friends in Toronto who can help us." However, the man only grinned. These are the same people who sold him and exiled him here. But the prisoner replied with a smile. And yet they had their good points. He was sure that his comrade was as much interested in their wealth and power as he was, and his eyes glittered with evil fire. True, they had much in common. It took the escaped prisoners only a few minutes to destroy the attackers. At the same time, Sang's group was walking down another corridor. The doctor was outraged at the young man's thoughtlessness. Why didn't he take a few men with him? All these subjects were ready for battle and could definitely help them. He shrugged his shoulders. He didn't want to cooperate with those who were initially against him. And besides, these guys were a real powder keg. He wished to create everything he needed to catch the big fish, so that they themselves would help him to attract the attention of the organizers to collect and increase his fortune. The girl, who had been following the conversation, suddenly laughed happily and assured Sung that Harley thought his idea was very cool. And the guy, not yet accustomed to the peculiarities of the behavior of former test subjects, decided to clarify. Harley was her name, and she happily confirmed it. However, Sang remained serious. let her change her name to another name, Harley Quinn was a villain, and they were not villains. They went out into another hallway. At that time, another pair of prisoners came out of the elevator and looked around warily. There were signs of a brutal battle all around. It was unclear whether their predecessors had survived. As they looked at the defeated mercenaries with their bodies strewn all over the floor, they didn't realize they were in range of the surveillance camera. The alarm has been sounded. Everyone who heard the current message had to immediately postpone work and tasks. The emergency alert was repeated twice and was heard by every mercenary. Hemingway saw that the attacker was nervous and grinned even though the knife was still digging into his throat. It seemed they were having some difficulties. When the alarm sounded throughout the lab, the big prisoner began to stretch as if he were about to jump. His tremendous muscles rippled through his body. At last, he grasped the bars of his cell tighter and with one seemingly effortless movement tore them from the roots, freeing himself from the passage. Someone called out to him. The Undertaker had decided to join in the fun. Suddenly, there was an explosion behind him, and the bars flew out of the wall. There was a scream. His companion decided not to abandon his friend and hurriedly caught up with him, his shoes clattering on the floor. The Undertaker paused for a moment to let himself be overtaken, and they walked together. There were dinghies on the ocean shore and guards posted around them. But the men, though armed, lost all vigilance out of boredom. It cost them their lives. While yawning, one of the mercenaries heard a slight rustle and turned around leisurely. The next moment, a bullet blew off half his head. The shot was fired by Sang, to the delighted shouts of Harley, and the doctor, who was never used to bloodshed, shuddered once more. Throwing their things into the boat, they pushed off from the shore. The doctor warned them that it was only an assault boat and that they would not be able to swim even to the neighboring country. But the guy didn't need to. Pointing to the blurry silhouette of a ship on the horizon, he declared it their target. They only had to swim to it. The Undertaker and his companion, who wanted to be free at last, were met with a burst of gunfire. However, they were ready and covered themselves with the bodies of the mercenaries as if they were shields. The commander, now tirelessly watching the cameras, shuddered in horror. How many monsters were there? They had already killed half of his men. Their incredible strength truly terrified even his seasoned warrior. However, his musings were interrupted. The door to the study opened abruptly and he turned around. There were prisoners with guns in front of him. So he's been the man watching them through the cells all along. So now he's going to answer for espionage. The mercenary holding Mr. Hemingway lost all composure and yelled into his radio if he needed any more help. But there was only silence. No one answered him. He slammed his fist into the cockpit of the helicopter in a rage, realizing that something terrible had happened. And with an entire team of dedicated fighters, Mr. Hemingway chuckled. Apparently, they could come to an agreement. Before he could finish his sentence, however, a knife flashed in his face. He was annoying the already angry mercenary for nothing. Suddenly, armed men appeared on the platform, and he gritted his teeth in anger and went out to meet them. The man was battle-hardened and was not afraid of anyone. He did not recognize the prisoners because he had spent the whole time of the assault in the helicopter guarding the chief scientist. So he fearlessly approached them and asked where his men were. But they only grinned back. There was nothing more to say about them, for their bodies would forever remain here on a closed island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Hearing this, the mercenary roared. No one dared to treat his men like that. Perhaps these brave men wanted to stay here too. He would help them. A boat approached the huge ship with 3 unknown men on board. One of them was dressed in mercenary ammunition and had a helmet covering his face. As they swam closer, they were spotted, and the guards shouted. Had they already finished? What about the others? And Sang, and it was him, shouted back. They had captured an important person, and the boss had ordered them to go back first. He tried not to laugh as he said this. So amused was he by the situation. On the roof of the laboratory, everything froze. The prisoners clutched their guns tightly, and the mercenary drew his knife, which he wielded better than a gun. He was ready to attack at any second. He was alarmed by their behavior. They could have started shooting by now, but for some reason they didn't. Moreover, one of the attackers threw his automatic aside. He pulled out a knife instead, and the mercenary smiled indulgently. He wanted to play with it, but unfortunately, he was no match for him in knife fights. And they cautiously began to walk in circles. Neither of them dared to fight first. Instead, each wanted to watch the other. Sensing his strength, the mercenary glanced at the other prisoner, but he stood there, showing no interest in their fight, so he would not interfere. Finally, the subject waited for a moment and attacked. His sharply sharpened knife glinted in the sun. His movements were swift and gave him the appearance of an experienced fighter. The mercenary, not expecting such an onslaught, only at the last moment managed to bounce back and set his blade, thereby repelling the blow without getting hurt. He deftly dodged to the side and swung his knife. The point passed so close to the prisoner's face that it almost scratched his skin. He felt a chill. However, the fight continued and turned into a melee. Growling and wriggling, the 2 strong rivals tried to twist and turn to injure the other. And it almost worked, one or the other. But so far there had been no bloodshed and they had managed to avoid injury. The fighting continued and it was exhausting. The opponents were as good as each other. Their strength and agility were equal. At some point, they came close together and pressed their foreheads against each other. Smiles played on their lips. They seemed to be enjoying what was happening, but suddenly a short shot rang out and the mercenary fell. The scarred man decided to put an end to the endless fight. They'd have plenty of opportunities in the future, but there wasn't time now. And with a grin, he glanced toward the helicopter. "Isn't that right, Mr. Hemingway?" And indeed, in the cabin, the doctor was watching the fight with bated breath. He himself did not know who he was rooting for in this fight. Both opponents were dangerous for him. At this time, the prisoner and his comrade were searching through the chip vault. However, neither could find theirs. The artist and all the level A chips were gone. They were confused. Who took them? Maybe it was the mercenaries who raided the lab. They should have asked them directly. Two more prisoners came down to the lower level of the lab and stood frozen at what they saw. One of them pondered whether they could handle such a thing, and the other, smiling carelessly, assured him of this. In front of them was a real submarine on which they planned to escape from the island. The mercenary ship was captured by Sang. At gunpoint, he ordered the crew to sail immediately to Hong Kong. Otherwise, they would all be sent to be fed to the sharks. The captain shrank back in fear and assured him he understood. The muzzle of the guy's machine gun and his fierce eyes indicated that he was not to be trifled with. Donnie, having received the latest news, decided to call an emergency meeting immediately. And now, holograms of all the board members were sitting in front of him. He explained that he had received terrible news, and addressing the current head of the Medici family, Maria, first of all, began his story. With a reverence not peculiar to him, he spoke softly. An hour ago, their Pacific Research Laboratory was attacked, but that wasn't the worst of it. The test prisoners on the 4th floor of the base were no longer in custody. They were free and eager for revenge. And most importantly, they had to consider whether they would stand up to their anger. After all, they were considered enemies not just of humans, but of beings with unlimited powers. Now that they were all assembled, they had to think hard about what to do about their friends who were about to return to them. One of those present took the floor. He didn't think there was any reason to worry. It was just a bunch of losers. It was best to ignore it and find out who had leaked the information about the base. It was the head of the Jicheng Zarin family. He was sure it would be easier than dealing with the guys directly, and Donnie had no choice but to take that advice. Meanwhile, the mercenary ship had docked at the shore of Hong Kong, and Sang and his mini crew were pensively looking at the skyscrapers of the city. Harley was so excited that she seemed to forget everything. She threw herself around Sung's neck, calling him honey and asking him every minute what they were going to do next. After thinking for a moment, the guy explained that first, they needed to find people to borrow some money, and then find ways to increase it. His eyes sparkled. As evening fell on the city, a man was screaming and moaning in a dark alley. He begged his attackers to stop and swore that he would give them everything. The case was resolved quickly, and Sang was happy. The only thing spoiling his mood was the skeptical doctor, so now he was going to beat up regular people. But his complaints didn't spoil the boys' high spirits. At least they had money now, so they could buy something for themselves, at least at the flea market. When the group emerged from the dark alleyway, they entered a busy street. Crowds of people wandered here despite the late hour. Powerful Hong Kong never slept. San Harvey and the doctor looked around in surprise. All around them, the shop windows were glowing with different goods, as if calling to them. It was worth starting with clothes. However, they had different needs, and Sang suggested that Harley and Kai Wen go together and he would go alone. They were to meet in 2 hours. They quietly dispersed without noticing the dark silhouettes following them. Their eyes glowed with an evil light as they looked toward the new arrivals. The unsuspecting Sang stopped at one of the showcases. He was interested in a master woodworker who was skillfully honing boxes and varnishing them. The guy asked him how much the old man wanted for the Buddha icon in a mahogany box. He told him the price was 1,000 and immediately specified that he was not haggling. Sang, who had a limited supply of money, rubbed the back of his head confusedly. He really wanted to buy it, but could the seller at least give a small discount? But the man remained impassive. If the guy didn't have any money, let him pick any of the boxes next to it. And Sang thanked him cheerfully. After paying the money, the boy moved a safe distance away from the shop and furtively opened the box he had bought. Inside it was an icon of Buddha that he liked. Well, it was the old man's own fault for not wanting to be in his position. Cheapskate. And Sang stuffed the box into his backpack and continued his stroll through the city without a care in the world. He still had plenty of time to meet his companions. At that moment, the two big men rose from the table where they were drinking tea and followed him. Nothing attracted his attention until he heard the noise of the crowd. It was the big men trying to keep up with him, pushing people away and shouting indignantly after them. Sang didn't turn around and didn't show any surprise. He quickly realized what was going on, and although he didn't know the exact reasons for the pursuit, he knew that everything would be clear soon. Harvey and Kai Wen also went shopping. The trinkets made the girl really excited. The years in prison had made her unused to ordinary life. The bandit who was chasing them picked up the phone and told his boss that he had found them. However, he ordered them to prioritize and deal with the foreigner first. He was the boss of a major Hong Kong gang. He realized that only outsiders could raise a hand against his man. The others were afraid to even look his men in the eye. Suddenly, Sang seemed to vanish into thin air before the eyes of his pursuers. A second ago, he was walking leisurely down the street, but now he disappeared in the most natural way. The big men scrambled. They couldn't let him get away, so they rushed forward, not noticing that their prey was standing there in the store doorway, grinning. Sang realized that he could use a weapon. He sat down next to a street vendor and asked how much a handmade blade would cost him. The boy walked back to the store and waited for his companions. A moment later, he heard the enthusiastic shout of Harley urging him on. They had shopping bags in their hands. The girl smiled and chattered away. She immediately went into her bags to show her purchases, and the first thing she showed was a brightly colored matryoshka doll. Sang was interested in bigger questions, so he turned to the Kai Wen. How was his harvest? He shrugged his shoulders. They found nothing worthwhile. Then the boy smiled. Unlike them, he had something interesting, and opening his backpack, he pulled out a handmade jewelry box. The others looked at him puzzled. What is it? Later, they moved to a small restaurant to celebrate their first day out. The girl kept her hands on the box, looking at it from every angle. If he was sure of his decision, Sang explained once more, it was not the thing itself that was valuable, but the wood used and the process of making it. But seeing that the eyes of his companions were still puzzled, he began to tell more details. Did they know anything about Gavu's box? They shook their heads negatively. It was a Buddha box for storing small figurines of sacred scripture hair items and the remains of the living Buddha. A large number of people in Asia were convinced that it could be used to protect themselves and reduce bad karma. That is, many people were eager to buy it. The guy continued his story without noticing that the two at the next table were watching him closely. Quality Gavu boxes were more valuable and rare. The doctor took the box in his hands and spun it around. Just how much could this mahogany box be worth? Sang anticipated this question and raised his index finger upward. It depended on what was in it earlier. If the relic was of significant value, its value reached 12 million. Hearing this amount, Kai Wen couldn't contain his surprise and shrieked. The listeners at the neighboring table also froze in place. From the behavior, Sang's attention was caught. A few came to the table. The leader looked contemptuously at the boy. Let him give him the box and the girl, and then he'll guarantee he won't send him to the other side of the world. Sang smiled indulgently. There were only a few of them, and he wanted the guy to give him all his stuff. For his arrogance, he was about to get a great lesson. When he heard this response, the chief thug grabbed the bottle from the table and smashed it. His eyes glittered with rage. He would finish this foreigner with one blow. At this time, one of the customers flew out of the bar and shouted to the whole street between the Shanzhu boys and the stranger. A fight broke out. His voice trembled with excitement. In a minute, a gang of shaven-headed, tall, armed men came rushing to their aid. At the entrance, they were frozen in place by what they saw. Sang was still sitting at the table with a sharp knife in his hand. The bodies of the strongest guys in the neighborhood were lying around. How could he be the only one who could handle them? This event immediately went viral in the alley, and the boss picked up the phone and yelled in rage. They were mocking him. A dozen people couldn't even deal with a foreigner. The boss, unable to control his anger, crumpled the phone in his hand and tossed it aside. He'd deal with that brat on his own. Hearing a noise, an elegant young man entered the pool where Shan Gei was relaxing with the girls. He was dressed smartly and seemed out of place here. It was Actuary Adu, the financial manager and Shan Gei's right-hand man. Everyone in this city knew that despite his appearance, this kid was ruthlessly cruel. When he saw him, the boss grinned in anger. One foreigner who didn't see the real problems prying into his territory. 3 days, and this puppy must be destroyed. Adu smiled when he heard the order. Then he also silently walked out of the pool and quietly went to his office. He stopped at the door, however, and wrote a message. After that, he sent it. The text said, "There is a good job. Anyone who is interested, you know how to contact me." The actuary froze in thought. Many people received the text. They differed from each other in gender, age, and social status. One thing they all had in common was that they froze thoughtfully at what they read. Finally, the long day came to an end, and Sang moved with his companions to a cheap hotel on the outskirts of the city. They should have made a plan. He turned to his comrades. Tomorrow, Harley and Kai Wen will go to the black market to find an opportunity to sell the box to Gavu. The girl readily agreed. As usual, the doctor had a question about Sang himself, what he planned to do all day. The young man lay down on the bed and smiled enigmatically. He had some business to attend to, but he didn't plan to go into details yet, and Kai Wen had to be content with that for now. The hall, whose address was specified in the secret message, was gradually filling up with people. Already now, almost all the seats were occupied and people were still coming. The actuary came on stage and turned to his assistant. Let him distribute the photos to the audience. and he went through the rows handing out cards to everyone. Everyone took a good look at the faces in the photo. Even an ordinary person would have realized that they were doing it professionally. These are not high society people. Sang Harley and Dr. Kai Wen were there. Meanwhile, the actuary explained there was a reward of 500,000 for the guy. The others were going for 200 each. There was a whisper in the hall. The sum was unusually large. Who were these people? But no one dared to ask such questions aloud. Finally, one of those present stood up and asked about the time limit for eliminating the undesirables. Shangai's aide named it. 3 days exactly. After the hall had emptied, he turned to his assistant again. How many men had taken their order? There were 6, and each had a known name. That same evening, in an unremarkable diner, a guy of ordinary appearance was eating alone. All his attention was on the noodles. Suddenly, he was interrupted, and he glanced unhappily at the newcomer. Dinner time was sacrosanct to him, and his colleagues knew it well. So something out of the ordinary happened. The manager sat down at the table and ordered food, and then slid the photos over to him. The order was from Shangju Hall. Seeing that he was interested, he began to give details. These people had to be eliminated as soon as possible. The deadline was 3 days. And there was something else. Besides them, there were others who had also taken the job, so they had to be sensible and act as quickly as possible to avoid losing the goods. Several more meetings took place that evening. The man in the hat knocked on the door of a cheap motel. No one answered, and he turned to leave. Suddenly, the knob dropped almost inaudibly, and a sleepy fellow appeared on the doorstep. He knew his guest and expected an order from him. This time, the catch was a big one. In one of the most expensive hotels in Hong Kong, a young man was lying on a bed. Even from his posture, it was clear that he was not breathing. His mouth and eyes were wide open. In the same room, a beautiful young girl was quietly dressing. She didn't pay any attention to such a strange neighborhood. It was obvious that it was not her first time. Suddenly, her phone rang, and she looked at the number and immediately grabbed it. She had a new job to do. The stranger nodded briefly and hurried off. At this time, Sang was sleeping serenely in his bed. He didn't even realize that he had been hunted by the most professional mercenaries that night. The next day, they followed the plan and said goodbye at the motel entrance. As they went their separate ways, neither of them noticed that they had been photographed. The prey came out of the den. It was time to get started. This was the message all the bounty hunters received while Harley, Sang, and Dr. Kai Wen walked calmly through the city. The boy stopped in front of a tall skyscraper and looked through its windows with interest. Something was troubling him, but he couldn't explain why. His instincts spoke of danger, and for good reason. The killer on the roof of the neighboring building had his sights set on him and his finger on the trigger, waiting for the perfect moment. A pistol shot rang out in the crowd and people scattered with shouts. In 1 second, Sang and the unidentified man with the gun were left in the square. The guy immediately realized what was going on. He offered to go to another place because it was not suitable for the battle. Otherwise, his rival would simply be arrested. The attacker nodded briefly, and in a few minutes they were in a deserted alley. They were followed by an unseen gunman. He managed to tell his boss that his target had gone to someone else. He planned to pursue her while she was alive and investigate the situation. Harley and the doctor made their way to the antique store and gave the jewelry box to be appraised. After the appraisal, the salesman spoke. It was indeed an incredibly valuable piece. The girl was even stomping her feet with impatience. If they sold her, how much he was willing to pay? About $600,000. That was an incredibly large sum. Sang and his stalker stopped and looked at each other. The rumor was that the guy pissed off the boss of Shangju Hall. Now he's looking for people to take him down. The boy smiled as he listened to this threatening tirade. It wasn't normal for people in his circle to leak information about their employer. But his opponent didn't flinch. It was normal to talk to someone who was no longer alive. It wasn't against the rules to talk to a half-dead man. The sniper hid on the roof and watched the poison closely. Sang drew a blade bought on the streets of the city. His opponent clenched his pudgy fists. The fight had begun. The movements of both opponents were fast, strong, and precise. Therefore, each of them successfully attacked and defended against the opponent's blows. The sniper raised his eyebrows. That was surprising. As one would expect in a foreigner who dared to start a fight with a Shanju, he had a temper. But his physical fitness was clearly no match for the strength he possessed. Too skinny, too quickly exhausted in battle. Drenching himself in sweat, Sang-K regretfully realized that without taking other factors into account, he could only withstand about 30% of the chip's power. How complicated it was. The sniper kept his eyes on him. The boy interested him more and more. With his outstanding talent and predispositions for combat, his body was underdeveloped. You could tell that his physical fitness was only slightly better than the average person's, whether he hadn't trained enough or from something else. Meanwhile, Sang approached his opponent and proposed a truce. If they continued to fight, they would both be badly wounded. Their strength was equal, and his enemy, after a moment's thought, agreed. However, on one condition, Sang had to destroy his employer, and the guy even flinched in surprise. He explained that when he made a contract, everyone was obliged to fulfill it at any cost. Sang reasoned that it would be easier to ask for help from others like himself. It wasn't that simple. A mercenary who dared to attack his employer was wanted, and no one wanted to be on it. That left us looking for someone from the outside. Kaiwan and Harley went for a walk around the city. They chatted carefree, not noticing that they were being followed by a man. In his hand was a syringe of some kind of liquid. He was known in certain circles for the poison he used to kill his victims. The girl begged the doctor to visit the movie theater. It was a horror movie, and Kaiwan tried his best not to show his fear. Harley was clearly enjoying herself. She was so absorbed in the story and the popcorn that she didn't seem to notice anything around her. Suddenly, a gloved hand held a syringe over her, but Harley kept giggling. And when it seemed that her fate was sealed, the hand with the syringe was intercepted by a slender and graceful hand, which, however, was characterized by unprecedented strength. The girl turned to her attacker, and despite her pretty appearance, the killer shuddered. Her eyes were filled with a cruelty not even peculiar to him. The show was over and the audience was leaving the auditorium. The cleaners started their work, but suddenly one of them saw a man sleeping soundly. He's got a lot of nerve. How can you fall asleep with a story like that? She moved closer and shook him by the shoulder. Strangely, he didn't react. A frightening hunch flashed through her mind. The woman reached out and removed the mask from the visitor's face, and the whole hall was filled with her scream. The man was breathless and his body slowly slid off the seat. The actuary called his boss. The list was sent out and 6 volunteers were found ready to fulfill the order. One of his men asked who they were. The one listed: Warrior Liu Fakaya Black Widow of the Peak Queens, Xiao Zhuang, 23rd Korean from the old man. There was also a black clinic pharmacist and an arsonist. Comrade Ada even shivered. He had heard that Warrior Liu Fakaya was a real madman. He didn't want to meet him in person on a mission. The last time he broke into a police station with a bag of explosives, he caused a lot of trouble, both for himself and his client Dajina. However, the actuary assured that there would be no surprises this time. The police station was quite loyal to them and would not blame them for the guy's affairs. Sang stood across from his new comrade in misfortune and thought hard, but finally he loosened his lips and spoke. Okay, he agrees. When they start, and he sighed with relief. Tonight at 10 o'clock, he would be waiting for him on Shifang Street where they could discuss all the details. Sang nodded his head in agreement. Then there was nothing more to talk about. He picked up his coat from the floor and left the battleground at a rapid pace. The boy looked after him thoughtfully. After hearing everything he needed to hear, the sniper dialed his boss's number. He had something to tell him. He picked up the phone and lazily asked if he was done with the order. The man explained the situation. He found something interesting. The boss grinned. Did this madman really take the initiative after all? And he thought it would go so easy and decided to ask the other party to help him. But the sniper was much more serious. Their coalition was really good. Combining their forces, they were really capable of doing a lot. After this information, the boss went out and lit a cigarette. The decision was made and he took out the phone. A few short beeps and the phone was picked up. The pampered fat man, rude and boorish, brightened when he heard that the 23rd man himself was bothering him. What fates. They had not been heard from for what seemed like 100 years. But he wasn't in the mood for chit-chat and got straight to the point. He'd been commissioned by someone on the inside. A third person outside their circle would do the job. When the fat man heard that, he roared. He'll give 2 million just for information. Who dared to do that to him? But he did what he wanted to do and hung up the phone silently. The weather was marvelous. The sky was calm and clear, and 23 lingered blissfully. He knew he could feel it with every cell in his body. A time of change was coming. The fat man, not knowing the name of the traitor, finally lost his temper. He began to smash everything he could get his hands on. The servants ran out of the room screaming. He finally caught his breath and dialed the number more calmly. He wanted to create an advertisement. He needed Hong Kong's best fighters for his defense, and as soon as possible. The girl who took the call confirmed the order with an impassive voice. She entered the data into the system and wrote out a form, and she stamped it all on the paper. Sang walked into the empty bar and smiled at the bartender behind the counter. "A martini, please." But the man didn't even look up. They were closed for the time being. Then the guy regretfully broached the fact that there was no salt in the martini. It was a secret code that stood for the phrase, "I'm a new customer." The bartender looked it up. That's how much honey he wanted. That meant what services he was interested in. And Sang answered 50 to 53 parts, which meant 3 false passports. The man behind the bar took out a box and opened it. It contained a phone and a key. He held them out to Sang. He had to get the money and pictures ready. Within 3 days, he must put it in the mailbox at the address given. He will pick up the items himself after 1 week. Sang nodded happily. Once outside, he was relieved at his good fortune. How lucky he was that the supplier's address on the hacker's chip was still the same. 82 chips had been tested on him. He was one of the few who were against using them as test subjects. But that time when he played the violin with the chip, it was such pure music. After all, Mr. Akato, whose skills were the prototype, lived the instrument. At that moment, he realized that the value of the chip was not in how much knowledge it could provide to the user about the experience, but about the feelings and emotions of the original owner. And 4 days later, he found himself in a test of survival, along with 3 cars that had been through dozens of battles in the arena. He didn't have time to prepare. He took a few deep breaths and exhaled, trying to see if the chip had any useful skills that would help him. And just like the first time, many fragments of memory burst into his brain. The lives of individuals, their feelings, emotions. He knew everything about these strangers. He especially remembered the memories and thoughts of a fellow named John Chris. They consumed the young man with their depth. That guy was a high-class mercenary, but only this time he felt only endless sadness and loneliness. They consumed him as if they were pulling him down into some abyss. He could not resist. Sang then watched from afar as the others slaughtered each other and realized how close he was to them. They were distinguished by their animal behavior, their strength, and their lack of regret. That's why he didn't feel the least bit sorry when a sharpened screwdriver fell out of his sleeve and into his palm. They don't deserve to live. And when he destroyed them, he realized that he himself had become the person from the chip. His reaction speed as well as his other stats increased several times over in an instant. The other test subjects from the prison have vowed never to use the chips. But Sang will look for them, and he will have to gradually merge all the identities into his body. They were all one. They were all parts of the same system. Individually, they increased the overall strength as well. When he entered his room, he found Harley and Kay-Wen waiting for him. The doctor raised his eyebrows questioningly. "How'd it go?" And the boy reached into his pocket. He took out the phone and key he had received and tossed them into Kai-Wen's hands. Have her put the money and photos in the mailbox. They would have new documents in a week. When Harley heard that, she clapped her hands in delight. Then she would definitely think of a new name for herself, like Wang Kuihua. It suited her so well. But Sang was not in the mood for jokes. He began to ask if they had gotten the money for the box, and the doctor pointed to a backpack full of bills. The boy whistled happily. He just needed a small amount of money. Kai-Wen was worried about whether the guy still had some other things to do. He confirmed it. He needed to visit a place tonight, and turning to Harley, he asked for a fighter chip. The girl shook her head disapprovingly. He's used the chips too many times. He should have waited a couple days. But since he decided to self-destruct, she's not going to stop him. And without any persuasion, she took out the chip and threw it to the guy. Sang tried to explain that he couldn't do without it tonight, but then he gave up. The important thing is he got what he wanted. With this enhancement, he's sure to remain unharmed. And asking not to wait for him and to go to bed, he left the hotel. Sang calmly and leisurely wandered through the evening streets of the city. He still had time. The doctor looked after him, his eyebrows furrowed in concern. Looking at Harvey, he noticed that Sang was strongly encouraging the growth of his personality's ties to the chip's personality, but she just shrugged. Trouble in the head. The warrior was already waiting for him at the agreed place, and while his partner was away, he decided to order almond tea. It was going to be a long and fun night. I need to be refreshed. With his hunter's instincts, he sensed Sang's presence just before the boy approached him, so he didn't chicken out and came after all. However, they shouldn't have shown together. So the warrior walked past, pretending not to recognize Sang. He followed him silently at a distance. Once in the car, they finally spoke. Recently, the warrior had learned that the boss had heard from someone that he was going to be eliminated. He took some steps. For his defense, he had invited several first-class mercenaries. His gaze was meaningful, and Sang decided to elaborate. He suspected him of leaking information, but the man only grinned. Not at all. He just wanted to ask the guy a question, if he was afraid, and Sang assured him that it was nothing to do with him, causing him to laugh. It was a dark night, and the car with its headlights off stopped far away from the target villa. The house was lit with lights, and it was clear that it was full of people. The warrior's boss, meanwhile, sat in his office, and despite a dozen guards, he couldn't stop his fingers from trembling. He felt like he hadn't done enough. Finally, the man couldn't stand it any longer and turned to his bodyguard. Maybe he should have added another guard post. After all, he was being hunted by a first-class assassin. However, Gabriel, the 7th number in Europe, shook his head negatively. Too many people would only be stressful. It wouldn't. He addressed his question to number 4 of Asia, Mr. X, but he made no reply. He stared out of the window unceasingly, and some little things alarmed him. At this time, the warrior and Sang had already entered the territory and were standing near the house. The warrior and Sang had already made their way to the house and were standing outside. A man walked leisurely down the corridor of the hotel. He had a good sense of direction, as if he lived here. But his face was safely hidden by the hood of his sweatshirt. Going to one of the doors, he pulled out the lockpicks, and in just a minute the door opened silently. It was dark and quiet inside the room. Its occupants were clearly asleep. He pulled out a silenced pistol and stepped inside quietly like a cat. The plan was simple and should have taken no more than a minute, but Harley was already standing in the doorway. The man crept over to the beds and seeing the bumps on them from the blankets took a few shots. That's it, quick and painless. He was already turning around to leave, but then A bright light flashed in the hotel room, and from the sudden transition from darkness, the uninvited guest was blinded from surprise for a second and covered his eyes with his palms. The first thing he saw when his vision returned to him was a girl who was rapidly approaching him, and then her small fist near his face, and the light flickered. He woke up tied up on the floor. The doctor watched him and then turned to Harley. That's the second one, and she confirmed it. Sang was the reason they were in trouble. The first two guards of the boss mansion were quickly and quietly eliminated. It was time to go inside. Communicating with the help of signs, these guys understood each other perfectly. Gabriel jumped to his feet in the office. One of his men was supposed to send him a message every 5 minutes with a brief explanation of the situation, but 10 minutes had passed and his phone was not answered. When the boss heard that, he bared his teeth. What did he mean? A shiver of terror ran down his spine. Mr. X also did not take his eyes off the window and quietly said, "They are already here." And there was an oppressive silence in the office like before a huge storm. The boss sobbed. Sang and Warrior entered the house and moved silently and stopped in the hallway. The mansion was huge, and they had to decide how to proceed, together or alone. Sang chose the tactics each by himself. It was closer for him to work alone. The Warrior nodded briefly and headed for the other wing of the building. They agreed to see each other later. Gabrielle and Mr. X headed for the door. The boss jumped up from behind his desk and tried to stop them. What were they going to do? His voice trailed off into a squeak. However, the bodyguards did not stop. Let him stay here until they find and eliminate the named guests. With these words, they left the office. The boss banged his fist on the table after them. He was their employer and ordered them to stay here and protect him. They stopped in the hallway just as Sang and the driver had just a short time ago. Gabriel offered to work together, but Mr. X firmly refused. Sang, meanwhile, stood in the middle of the dark and silent huddle. He listened to every rustle, trying to choose the right direction. There was another participant in the performance. A man climbed a tree and watched every move of the inhabitants of the mansion. Then he radioed back what he saw. The Warrior carefully made his way up the stairs to the second floor. All his instincts were working at maximum. Suddenly, he stopped and stared ahead. And indeed, there was someone waiting for him on the landing of the next flight of stairs. It was Gabriel, who had his arms crossed over his chest. He was surprised that there was only one opponent. The boy tensed when he saw him, but his enemy was alone too. So it was time to get on with what he'd come here for. Gabriel watched quietly as well. The Warrior grabbed the assault rifle and gripped it tighter, pointing the muzzle at his opponent. But he did something unexpected, throwing something in his direction. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a small round object, and when he shifted his gaze, he saw that the killer had an iron ring on his finger. It was a grenade pin. The next moment, he drew his pistol with terrifying speed and fired at first strike, hitting the projectile. It exploded at once, stunning the Warrior. The mansion shuddered with the force of the explosion. A piece of the wall shattered into tiny shards, littering the front lawn with rocks. Everything was silent for a moment. At that time, Sang was making his way through the corridors and froze in place. He realized the action had begun. His partner had met the enemies, so it would soon be his turn. A moment later, his suspicions were confirmed. A tall man was walking toward him at a leisurely pace. He kept his hands in his pants pockets as if he were strolling through a park. The Warrior managed to crawl around the corner. He clung to his head, which was writhing in pain. The boy was wounded and his eye was flooding with red liquid. Gabriel approached slowly but steadily, following the footsteps, and the Warrior clenched his teeth in anger at himself. How could he lose without even starting the fight? His breathing became more and more frequent, like that of a cornered wild animal. The blast wave had knocked the assault rifle out of his hands, and now he was unarmed against the best assassin. Sang saw his opponent and clenched his gun tighter in his hands. However, before attacking, he decided to talk. Maybe they could just talk it over and X would let him pass. Gabriel chased the Warrior through the wide corridors of the mansion and enjoyed the process. The guy was running away, but bullets were hitting the floor and walls all around him. Mr. X was silent, but his posture and look said that he was in no mood to negotiate with the order. Well, Sang wouldn't beg. It was just a suggestion. After assessing the situation, he realized it was going to be a lot harder than he expected. Well, if that's the case. And he raised his gun, pointing it at the enemy, but it was as if he'd been waiting for it. His reaction was lightning fast. Shooting with one hand, he clutched another pistol in the other. The shots followed one after the other like a machine gun burst. One of the first bullets flew straight into the center of the young man's forehead, and it had almost reached its target when Sang darted to the side. His movements were barely visible to the eye. Mr. X did not waste time and did not stop firing bullets at him while watching this strange young man running on the wall against all the laws of physics. But it was all in vain. Through a method based on an ancient martial art, Sang reduced the frequency of bullets hitting him. It was a method of utilizing visual errors. He had already calculated all the actions of his enemy in his mind, and as soon as he finished, Sang would immediately make the next move. There were fewer bullets left in the chamber. Finally, the last shot was fired. The magazine was empty. At that very second, Sang turned around and put his gun forward. His plan worked as always. And the second he heard the deafening gunshot, he felt a searing pain in his shoulder. The recoil was so strong that he fell back and rolled on the floor. With difficulty, he rose to his knees and looked at his enemy with discouragement. It was impossible he had calculated everything. There couldn't have been another bullet in the gun. But Mr. X smiled for the first time since their meeting. His eyes lit up victoriously. Who said both guns had the same capacity? Sang had lost, and he had to admit it, although he surprised him with his skill. At the same second, another shot rang out. This time the gun was aimed at the guy's forehead. The man fell to the ground with a thud, and Mr. X holstered his gun with a satisfied smirk. He turned his back and was about to leave when the unexpected happened. Someone shot him in the back. He leaned over and saw a red, spreading stain on his shirt. There was no pain yet, but he knew it was the end. Gabriel enjoyed the hunt until finally the warrior stopped. He was tired of being a target. The thug stepped closer to him. Why did he stop running? And he turned around and clenched his fists with force. Run. He should be the one to run. Let him throw away his weapons if he thought he was so brave and strong. And he'll do it in a private fight. The warrior offered boxing, and Gabriel gladly accepted. For him, it was just another game he was sure he would win. He continued to mock. Anyway, no matter what the warrior does, trash is just trash and he'll never win. But the boy only clenched his teeth tighter. It was easier for him to die in a fair fight than to be shot in the back while running away. So he was the first to attack. After a while, Sang held his head and sat up. He tried to remember everything that had happened, but it was difficult. His end was too near. A little more and he would have thrown off the ends. If he hadn't reacted in that split second, he would have been destroyed. He literally escaped the clutches of oblivion. He should have tilted his head back, and at the moment the bullet entered the skull, find a position to better distribute the energy throughout the body. Chang Tzu was furious. He had spent a fortune on guards to protect him, instead of leaving him alone. Could it be that some big man was onto him? His rampage was monitored by a hitman with a telescopic sight. He was in constant communication with the customer. The warrior and the guide distracted all the mercenaries whether to shoot him now, and when he heard the confirmation, he immediately took aim. His finger slid smoothly onto the trigger and he fired. The bullet traveled the distance in seconds and hit the target. While wandering around the mansion looking for the boss, Sang accidentally passed by the study and peeked through the ajar door. It was quiet inside and the boss was lying dead on the floor. In the meantime, Killer reported on the completed task and said that he would expect further payment. They said goodbye to the customer. See you soon. With his hand on the wound, Sang slowly walked down the steps to the first floor. His head was still buzzing, and he was afraid of losing his balance and rolling down the stairs. On the landing in front of the stairs, a fight was going on between the warrior and Gabriel, and Sang saw the frenzy with which they fought, and even wrinkled his nose. Why all the fuss? Gabriel just dodged the guy with a hard blow that took his breath away and darkened his eyes. His opponent was strong, but he wasn't going to give up either. With a little breath and clenched fists, he lunged at his opponent again. Gabriel calmly awaited his attack. The fight began with renewed vigor. The movements became faster and the blows more powerful, when suddenly there was a loud shout from Sang. Stop. There was no need to fight anymore. And those who heard this unexpected statement froze for a moment, forgetting each other and the hatred that united them. The boss had been destroyed, but he didn't know who had done it. Gabriel, meanwhile, was examining him closely. There were bullet marks on him. Mr. X was also destroyed. Sang, trying to relieve his headache, turned to him. His employer was gone. How about they all stop right here and now? And he made his decision after a moment's silence. This time they won. So be it. He turned and went his way, feeling the warrior's implacable gaze in his back. With her arms and legs tied tightly around her overnight guest, Harley pulled out her phone and smiled, sending Sung a text message. When he heard the notification, he reached out to read it. To his horror, selfies of a girl in front of a bound criminal appeared on the screen. The caption was just as interesting. Harley was having an interesting day too. Now that they had nothing else to hide, the car, illuminated by the headlights, was speeding down the highway. They were rushing to help Sang's comrades. The boy looked at the warrior with a sidelong glance. He didn't look so good. Was he sure he didn't need to get to the hospital as soon as possible? But he shrugged. The eye was intact, and the rest will heal. Too bad he wasn't the one who destroyed the boss. But he didn't have an answer, and he didn't know what was going on. The only thing he saw was his body. Someone had clearly taken advantage of their moment of intrusion to lure the guards out of the room and do their job. The warrior remained thoughtfully silent. Sang couldn't help but ask, what about him? Who was that man? But the boss had many enemies to suspect any one person. It wasn't long before they reached the hotel, and Sang heard Harley's joyous cry. Honey was back. But immediately her joy was cut short. Who was that with him? Sang scrutinized the bound criminal without even looking back. He pointed his finger at the warrior and introduced him as his new friend. He was more interested in the man who had attacked him, but the warrior was also surprised to see him. It was an acquaintance of his from Shan's ranks. How did they even catch him? Sang stepped closer to him and asked him to elaborate, and the warrior spoke. This Korean was quite famous in the narrow circle of professionals. He suddenly cut himself short. A hunch flashed through his mind. Wait a minute, that means he's failed in his task too. I wonder how the client will react. But suddenly their musings were interrupted. The one who had been caught and had been unconscious until that moment moaned weakly. He was clearly coming to his senses. They were in for a disappointment. Harley's blows were so hard that after a minute, he passed out again without answering a single question. But Sung knew who could help them. That night, they stayed in the room to recover a little from what happened. The next day, they sneak into the parking lot and wait for their victim. It was the actuary, calmly getting into the car. Suddenly there was a rustle behind him that sent a chill through his body, and he looked back without turning around. And then Sang's fearsome face appeared in front of his face, the one he had seen so many times in the photos he had given to the killers. Good morning, Mr. Adu. In a few minutes, many people in Hong Kong, minding their own business, began to receive messages. These strange people had one phone number in common. One of the callers was having lunch with his assistant. After reading the message thoughtfully, he continued to chew leisurely. What about Shanju Tang? But that was something no one knew. A moment before, Warrior had ordered Actuary to hand over his phone. He quickly found a group chat room and made a texted dispatch. Case completed, payment is cancelled. That seemed to be the end of it. But Sang asked for one more minute of Adu's attention. He couldn't let this man go now. He had one more request. Later, they stood in the lair of Shanju Tan's gang. The wounded boss was lying at their feet. His minutes were numbered, and he knew it, looking at the traitor Adu with hatred. Then a short shot rang out and it was all over. Sang kept his cool and walked over to the defeated enemy and took a couple of pictures from different angles. Even the actuary marveled at his actions. Why did he need to do that? But Sang smiled. He wanted to preserve the evidence. Not only that, the boy approached Mr. Adu. He put his arm around his shoulders and took a couple of selfies. But after looking them over, he shook his head unhappily. The actuary's expression was too tense. In the future, it will be Adu who will be the master of Shanzhu, and his facial expression shouldn't be so stern. He obediently smiled at what he had left to do, but according to the rules, the CFO had no right to be the master of the clan. However, Sang didn't even want to hear that if he said he had it, he had it. They were set by the older generation of the Shan clan, and no one had ever dared to break them. The boy grinned and walked close to him. Even so. But Adu knew how to do it without him, and his expression lost its good-natured and cheerful expression in an instant. Now his eyes were glowing with article. And even the actuary who was used to dealing with such people in his life swallowed convulsively. Yes, he did have a way of changing the rules. Sang is cheered up. That's fine, then let him handle it and contact them in 3 days to report back. The guy was sure Adu could handle it, and they and the warrior left the clan's lair. The actuary stayed behind and listened to the two boys argue about where to have lunch. When their voices fell silent, Mr. Adu shifted his gaze to his now former boss. Not for a moment did he feel sorry for him. There was only one thing troubling him. It seemed to be time for a change. To cover his tracks, he called in a task force. They not only bagged the body, but they cleaned it up. These guys were professionals and had helped Ada out many times before. Saying goodbye to them, the actuary made a call. At 8 o'clock tonight, he was inviting all the elders for tea at the store on Shifan Street. He had urgent news. After such busy days, Sang and Warrior were finally able to have a quiet lunch and enjoyed their meal in silence at a small, homey restaurant. Finally, Xiang dared to ask, what will his comrade do next? And he thought about it and answered, perhaps now he would just become a freelancer, and explained. There were a lot of wild demons in Hong Kong who lacked agencies. It was people who had either been fired or lost their bosses. So most of them only occupied some public listings, which was pretty pathetic. Sang couldn't stand it. This was just ridiculous. But the warrior was also curious about something. Why he had gone to such lengths to confront the Shanju hole. Why he had to get rid of that pig in secret. The former assassin's gaze became wary. So what was Sang up to? What was the true purpose of his coming to Hong Kong? Just don't let him make up any nonsense. The boy realized that the conversation had taken a serious turn, and he was thoughtfully silent. Minute after minute passed, but he seemed in no hurry to answer. Finally, the warrior sighed. Well, if he didn't want to talk about it, let him forget about the question. He wouldn't force him to answer. But just at that moment, Sang spoke softly. Someone stronger than him once said, wealth, power, and violence. That's all that's needed. Without the violence of power, being rich is like being a tree without roots. But it can be cut down at any time. But with power and wealth, violence is an easier means to build from scratch. Hong Kong, which stood in the east, was a perfect starting point for this. Sang smiled and his eyes sparkled. What did the warrior himself think about it? But he was slow to respond, so Sang set his sights on Shanju Hall. But the guy used them as a test to see if he could control Hong Kong's violence. The warrior even laughed with delight, and the other visitors looked at them with interest. So it was the enemy who had brought Sang to this city. But the guy wasn't ready to give away all the details of his life, so he just remarked that he didn't deny it, and the warrior continued, so he's going to be a lot of fun. And that's something Sang could guarantee. If everything went according to plan, he could see the entire Hong Kong underworld that day. That was really crazy. That was what attracted the warrior to Sangha. And he laughed again. He wanted to see how far he could go before his companion threw off his skates. Harley and the doctor were looking for the box. They were interested in number 332nd and soon found it. The key fit, and opening the door, they put a package inside. They were followed. The stranger said everything went as expected. They put the documents in a public locker for safekeeping. His boss nodded, satisfied. That was enough for now. Later, he'd check to see who was getting them out of there. In the meantime, he had things to do, and he hung up the phone and continued to study the news. A news site with events from a month ago was open in front of him. They mentioned that the head of core funds was missing. Journalists were linking it to drugs. The Wan Chai police, led by Mr. Chen, were in charge of the mansion of the destroyed Chang Tzu. He scrutinized the place of entry, thoughtfully smoking a cigarette. Suddenly, quickly approaching footsteps were heard in the corridor. It was the assistant commissioner. He came running to say that Mr. X had been found. Mr. Chen seemed not to hear what was said. But when his discouraged assistant was about to repeat himself, he suddenly headed into the hallway. Have him show him. When Harley and the doctor entered the room, they saw a strange scene. All three of the Sang warrior and the captured assassin were sitting on the bed playing poker. They were so caught up in the game that they didn't even notice who had entered. The warrior was furious. He had lost almost all of his money to Sang. His luck was amazing. But suddenly a hunch flashed through his mind. His comrade was definitely cheating, and Sang roared with resentment even though he had actually used the cheat chip himself. Mr. Chen carefully examined Mr. X's body. A bullet in the back. It was a surprise attack. He ordered the assistant to check which barrel had been used. All the elders were gathered around a round table in the restaurant. The actuary was leading this gathering, and everyone was waiting with interest for an explanation why he had gathered them here. Mr. Adu began his speech by thanking everyone for coming. However, he was immediately cut short. Let him drop the formalities, that's not why he called them. And he got to the point. Everyone had already heard that a few days ago, a certain Jian Long had infiltrated Shan Zhu's base and raised the alarm. It was after Master's order. Mr. Ada sent out a list of suspects, and they accepted the offer and sent 6 experienced professionals. This statement was met with complete silence. But the actuary did not stray. Today, the unexpected happened. The mountain pig had been destroyed by someone. Adu had no right to participate in matters, much less lead them. But now he could suggest that the elders consider these 2 questions. First, who would be the next master? Second, to decide what to do about the conflict. Finally, Zhao, one of the elders, raised his voice. He believed that the master was destroyed for a reason, but Adu shrugged his shoulders. Zhang Long crushed several subordinates. This was not news to anyone, but the other elder interrupted him by pounding his fist on the table so that the dishes clinked and hit the floor. How dare he speak like that? However, their conversation was rudely interrupted. The door to the office opened abruptly, and a group of stout men appeared on the threshold. For the time being, they stopped on the threshold, but it was clear from their facial expressions that they were ready to move to more decisive action. It was Pier Hongmeng. Zhao looked at the actuary carefully. Was he really willing to go that far? And he gestured that he would do anything, even extreme measures, especially since Elder Qian had behaved rudely. He didn't understand the reason for the hysteria about the mountain pig. What was needed now was to sit down quietly and discuss the next master, without emotion and without getting personal. And since they were wondering how he would appreciate it if the elders voted for him in a week. Once again, Qian couldn't stand such insolence. He jumped up, promising it would not happen. Adu's bodyguards were ready to subdue him, but the actuary stopped them with a slight movement of his hand. Of course he remembered the rules, but they were finally obsolete. The rules were rigid, but people changed all the time. If the elders had chosen him, he would have made a few exceptions too. Zhao clarified. So he invited them over for tea to change their minds. And Adu mumbled, as long as the elders agree, everyone's income will be arranged. Harvey and Sang were sitting in the room. The girl boredly remarked. So by gathering 2 second-rate mercenaries, the guy forced the deputy to become the ringleader. That was the beginning of his revenge plan, and he confirmed it by looking closely at the girl. But she didn't seem surprised. The main thing was that he was having fun. Qian was seething with anger on the way home. How dare this lowly actuary? His assistant tried to calm his boss down, but he responded with curses. This event caused a lot of discussion. Zhao pondered. Qian and Xuan might very well have agreed to Adu's proposal, and his interlocutor was in agreement. But what a coincidence. They had a young man who wanted to move up in the ranks. He was willing to do anything to get there, but Zhao stopped him. Right now, the priority was to get rid of the actuary, and then everyone would make the best of the situation, and Li gladly agreed. After waiting for Zhao to come out, He immediately grabbed the phone and ordered his men to urgently find out who exactly was the mountain pig's latest victim. Mr. Adu sat at the table and tried to make a prediction. Elders Qian and Sun stepped aside for a while, convincing them to agree would be easy. As for Zhao and Li, Actuary could bet that they had already discussed how to get rid of him. These elders were known for their conservative views. He wasn't sure of the odds of 1 against 2, despite all the measures he had taken. Not knowing what to do, he needed to consult his boss. He dialed Sang and waited. It was night and the guy was obviously asleep. Finally, the receiver clicked and a sleepy voice was heard. "Who is it?" Adu gave his name. He got straight to the point. He managed to convince half the elders to support him, but the others had probably conspired to work against him. Adu was silent for a moment. As much as he wanted to avoid disturbing Sang, he couldn't manage without his help. So the boy yawned and reassured him. Don't let the actuary worry. Instead, he should gather the information and send it to Sang's post. The rest would be taken care of by himself. With those words, the guy disconnected. After his order, Li quickly obtained the information he was interested in. The identity of the person who killed Jiang Long was revealed. It was a foreigner. Li looked at his assistant Red Cudgel and said thoughtfully, he was almost certain that Shanju's line of business did not involve working with foreigners. And he confirmed it. All right, the master's conflict with the foreigner must have been just an accident, but Li didn't believe in coincidences. This weak Adu certainly didn't have the courage to challenge the elders. He could bet that someone strong and powerful was helping him. Meanwhile, Sang looked through his mail and dialed Warrior. He had some business to attend to in Shanzhou and needed the help of a comrade. They arranged a meeting. Zhao didn't waste any time either. He met with his nephew Fei Yuzhou, but he liked eating more than doing business. This guy was too peaceful. If Adu wanted to take the master's place so badly, why stop him? But his uncle lost his temper. If they let that shrimp become the boss, their clan will suffer. Fei, trying to delve into the behind-the-scenes games, reminded. There was also Uncle Li. Why don't he take the master's place? This time, Zhao couldn't help himself. This option was even worse. He was so nervous that he even coughed. No matter what happened during the master's selection, they couldn't let those two dogs do anything. Seeing how his uncle was reacting and not fully understanding the reasons, his nephew still promised to do what Zhao told him. He gradually calmed down. The place Sang and Warrior chose to meet was trendy. It had cute waitresses serving sweet coffee, and the guy was having fun at the place. The Warrior, on the contrary, was angry. He didn't want to waste time on nonsense and already wanted to talk about serious matters. So Sang raised his hands. I'm sorry. This time, their target was this man, and he held out a picture of him with Elder Li. The Warrior recognized him immediately. He was pretty well known in this area of the business, and he had a stubborn temper. Anyone who ever wronged him disappeared without a trace. He was mean. Sang sipped his drink contentedly. The Warrior seemed to know him well. He confirmed it. He had an order for him in the past, but he couldn't complete it. People were walking along the street, not paying attention to the row of parked cars. None of them realized that the doctor was sitting in one of them, watching them closely. Then he dialed the phone and hiding reported. The target brought a group of over 10 people with him. They simply walked out of the garage and into the elevator. Harley accepted the information and hung up the phone. She turned around and said that at least 10 people were expected. The actuary hung his head with a loss of confidence. Noticing this, the girl tried to calm him down. Don't let him worry. They're just a couple of thugs. She'll take care of them on her own. Ordering everyone to stay in their seats, she stepped boldly out into the hallway. Before the elevator, Harley put on her mask and clutched the canister tightly in her hands. The big guys were already in the elevator. They were counting down the floors in preparation for battle, even though they knew a bunch of unprofessionals would be waiting for them. Finally, the elevator indicated the 13th floor. The first of them had already taken a step, but was immediately hit by a jet of some stinking liquid. He couldn't breathe. He fell to the ground, catching one of his comrades. In a few seconds, the deed was done. Harley scrutinized the attackers. They were all unconscious, and they would not regain consciousness in the next few hours. Meanwhile, Li Mingsheng watched the elevator and radioed orders. Someone went down, have the 6th floor go in. 10th floor, let them go up and get Ada. The elevator opened on the 6th floor, and Harley, ready to fight, met the big guys with another gas jet. They didn't have time to bounce back from the surprise. The stinking slurry splashed into their faces, covering their faces, noses, and mouths. They immediately lost consciousness and fell to the floor with a thud. The girl giggled contentedly. After giving them time and realizing that they were out, Harley grabbed one of them by the legs and dragged him into the elevator. The second man was the same way. Li Jr. suspected something was wrong. Over the radio, he sent people from the 4th and 5th floors to the 6th floor. The 7th and 9th floors had to rush to the rescue. The girl pressed the elevator button and pulled out her phone. She took care of the tanks as promised, and the guy nodded briefly. She could safely leave the rest to him. Another group was just coming up to their door and using a lockpick to open the doors. The lock clicked. Guy ordered the actuary to stay put while he dealt with the guests. The girl heard the stomping of approaching people on the stairs and quietly took off her mask. When everyone was gathered, she turned around and smiled seductively at them. The boys stared at her with interest. They expected to see anyone but a fragile girl. But orders are orders. They must deal with her. Two thugs clutching bats waited for the elevator. It rang briefly and the doors opened. A strange picture opened in front of them. Inside were unconscious people. One of them rushed to his comrades and started to check their breathing. He realized that they were alive, but in a deep sleep. He immediately contacted his boss. The one raised his eyebrows in surprise. So many people suddenly unconscious, that the enemy had used a gun, but he explained that it looked more like gas. Meanwhile, Harley stood surrounded by the big men. The team leader reported to the boss. The attacker had been caught. It was a girl, alone. She took them all down. And the man ordered her to be led to him. Lee Jr. was eagerly awaiting this heroine. He wanted to see who could knock out his boys so easily. The team leader nodded briefly and turned to Harley. She should follow them. And the girl nodded wearily. Everything was so predictable it wasn't even interesting. Everyone had already realized how fast she could be. So they handcuffed her first so she wouldn't think of anything else. Harley dutifully let them do it. But out of the jowl, she kept peering at them. That's how, in addition to the elevators on each floor, they also placed people near the stairs. How meticulous. Finally, they went down to the first floor, and Lee came right up to her. Who helped Hell take the master's place if the girl confessed? He would let her go. But she only smiled wryly, let him try to guess for himself. And then she received a powerful blow to the stomach, from which she cried out and fell to her knees on the floor. Lee repeated his question. Perhaps now she would be more cooperative, but she bent as if in pain, and with her teeth unfastened the rope that bound her arms. In the next instant, she jumped to her feet and lunged at her assailant. Her eyes burned with the flames of hell. Lee's boys rushed to their boss's aid. However, before they could make a couple of steps, the girl deftly jumped behind Lee's back and wrapped the rope not only around his body but also around his neck. Don't let them come any closer or she'll destroy their leader. And they stopped in confusion. Her threats were no idle sound. They had witnessed her deeds. Sang and the warrior were on their way to pick up their victim. Lee Minsheng. Was he that strong? And his comrade confirmed it. There were 5 people in the underworld capable of defeating him. Is that why the old one was still alive? Thanks to his adopted son, no one dared to target him or the business. Everyone knew there would be retaliation. Harley held Lee Jr. tightly in her arms, and the man wheezed angrily looking into her eyes. It seems she won't be obedient and plans to cooperate. Well, he pulled the ropes with all his might and tore them with a strong jerk. The girl flew sideways in surprise, but held on and fell to her feet. Lee looked at her disdainfully, then nodded to his men. Grab her. As if expecting that command, they rushed at the girl with a snarl. Harley didn't plan to surrender to them so easily. Despite her superior numbers, she deftly fought off the thugs' blows from a distance. Lee Jr. knew her fate was sealed, so he turned around and headed for the elevator. He wouldn't waste time watching another girl get destroyed. Behind him, shouts and thuds could be heard. Suddenly there was a shriek from Harley. Someone had managed to let-go her. This finally pissed the girl off. Lee Jr. stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 13th floor. Adu remained his target. He needed to see how things were going down there and see if they could tie him up. When he arrived at the desired floor, he stepped out and stopped as if stumped. No way. His guys were lying on the floor, and a guy vaguely familiar to Lee was standing over them. He searched his memory and finally remembered. They had once hired him for their business. He was a Korean man nicknamed Old Man. Lee Jr. knew his abilities, so he decided to start by negotiating. Lee explained that the Korean was not his enemy. Let him pass, and he pretended he had never seen him. He was adamant he couldn't let that happen. If his boss found out that he let the enemy go instead of stopping him, he'd be destroyed, and the kid got into a stance. Rolling up his sleeves, Lee Jr. gritted his teeth. Interesting how loyal he was, but he didn't seriously think he could overpower him. Water must have gotten into his brain. Harley almost took out an entire group of thugs. Moans and screams filled the parking lot where the fight was taking place. The girl seemed to have lost touch with reality. Her cruelty had gone beyond all limits. And Kai Wen, who had unwittingly witnessed her rampage, was stunned with horror. This test subject, had she always been so strong? At that time, Harley turned around and the doctor screamed in horror. He thought that he would be the fate of her enemies, but she only asked tiredly for an ambulance. Lee Jr. effortlessly tackled the Korean and laid him on the floor and clasped his hands. Let him confess who his boss is and who he works for. But the man remained stubbornly silent. Suddenly, the elevator dinged and Harley stepped out into the hallway. Her shabby appearance caused even a fierce man like Lee to shiver. The girl smiled affectionately. Sang and the warrior were on their way to find Lee Sr. If their information was accurate, it was that every Wednesday morning he stopped at the park for a couple of hours. The warrior didn't know the exact reasons for it, but rumor had it that the habit had only occurred to Lee a few years ago. That was enough for Sang. Walking leisurely through the park with a glass of coffee, he finally saw his target from afar. Lee was sitting quietly on a bench reading a newspaper. Sang came closer and politely asked if he could sit down. and the man invited him without looking at him. He didn't take his eyes off his newspaper for a second. Silent for a moment, Lee finally spoke. Just seeing Song, he remembered how the Huashan people came to Hong Kong a few years ago. He was referring to the historical migration. The boy listened intently. If the members of the society are perceived as wolves, then these people were hyenas, greedy wild with no lack of fear. For them, hierarchy didn't matter. The lion didn't scare them. They were blind and would do anything to get their piece of meat in front of them. Sang was silent. Lee finally asked the question he was so interested in. Sang was the unknown person who had destroyed the mountain pig, but the man only smiled in response. He didn't know what he was talking about, and the man went on asking. Adu was under his leadership. Sang nodded his head affirmatively. You could have said that. Then Lee asked his main question. Did the guy really want to take control of the Shanju? And Sang philosophically remarked that yes, if possible. Lee's gazels glistened, but he wouldn't let him. But Sang was no longer a novice either. Then he would just take him himself. Hearing this, the man laughed, so he was already prepared to lose right. But Sang only grinned. Let it not bother him, he would always be on the winning side. Lee stood up. That's what all the players were saying as they approached the table. Suddenly, he started clapping his hands. Sang was alarmed. He was expecting a trap from this man every second, and he was right. People wandering around the park enjoying their lunch break suddenly stopped and stared at them. Suddenly, it all made sense to the boy. All of the men-girls were Lee's men, and here they were, not walking around, but waiting to attack a stubborn foreigner if he did not agree with Lee. But he was generous today. After giving the boy a mental count of his enemies, he said, he was ready to give the boy one more chance. Let him think it over. Sang was angry with himself. How could he have fallen into a trap? But Lee persisted. Let him choose whether he would fight or negotiate. There was only one option for him, and Sang chose to fight without a second thought. Even though he knew the advantage was not on his side, Lee shrugged unhappily. What a shame. But the choice had been made. And turning to his army, he ordered it destroyed. The men rushed to carry out the order. Several dozen men rushed at Sang at once. At that time, at the other end of the park, a young woman approached the warrior, tapping her heels. He recognized her immediately, so she was working for Lee Sr. It was the leader of the Mercenary Association, Madame Ko, and it was just a part-time job for her, nothing personal. But she heard about what happened. Didn't the warrior want to join? However, the guy moved his eyebrows menacingly. She was late, he already had another job to do, and Madame Ko shook her head puzzled. Was he really here because he accepted the contract on Lee's life? And the guy nodded something like that, but he's only here to keep his friend company. Something flashed in the girl's eyes. Was he sure? Because she'd personally attached over 20 men to Lee. Every one of them was a professional, but the warrior only grinned. He wasn't worried about his order or his new friend. He had seen him get out of much more dangerous situations. If it was only 20 people, it probably wouldn't be enough. After all, his friend was incredibly strong. And Madame Ko raised her eyebrows in surprise. The Korean old man crawled back to the wall with his last strength, giving Harley a chance to deal with Lee Jr. He was amazed at her abilities. Lee himself, who had seen a lot of things in his life, was not ready for such an obsession. The girl received powerful blows and easily got up and attacked again. It seemed like the fight was a foregone conclusion, but then it whizzed past Lee one more time. He didn't even feel anything at first, but he suddenly collapsed to the floor and wheezed. The old man looked at Harley in horror. She stood as if nothing had happened over the body of her enemy, who was still twitching, but the life had already left him. After scattering the most active attackers, Sang stopped to catch his breath. Shit, he really needed to find a gym and start working out. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw two people enter the alley. It was the warrior and Madame Ko. The boy smiled contentedly when he saw what had happened to Sang's enemies. He'd said a few people wouldn't do anything to his friend. The girl looked around carefully as well. Sang really did have extraordinary abilities. Still breathing heavily, Shang got up from the ground and stared at the girl. He had not seen her before and was very suspicious of her appearance. The warrior introduced her as an old acquaintance. He could call her Madame Ko, the leader of the association and the mercenary background actors. The girl stepped closer to him and held out her hand. She was glad to meet him. And Sang named himself and responded with a handshake. His friend's friends could not be his enemies, but he was still wary. The warrior continued. She was very impressed with his ambition. She and the rest of the FA would remain neutral in the fight between him and Lee. Where is he himself, by the way? And Sang had to admit that he had escaped. His comrade wrinkled his nose. Then he would probably be hiding in one of his hideouts in the near future. They were all over the city, and everyone in Hong Kong knew they feared for themselves more than anyone else. But Sang reassured him he had a backup plan. At this time, Lee Sr. leisurely walked to the road and saw a cab approaching and raised his hand. Luckily for him, the car was empty and stopped. He made himself comfortable and ordered the chauffeur to follow him to Chiffon Street. And he hid his face under his cap, glared at his passenger and nodded briefly. Good. At the hotel, Adu heard the sound of a message and grabbed the phone. His face lit up with a smile. The text read that he had been picked up. A sigh of relief escaped from the man's chest. Seeing how his mood had changed in an instant, Harley asked what had happened, and the actuary explained he'd gotten caught. At the same time, he wrote back that he would wire the money. At the same time, one of the mercenary bosses was standing near the board on the wall. It was obvious that he had done a tremendous job. There were pictures of all the main participants, and in the center of these events was a photograph of Song from his days as Corfuns. From it, intertwining ribbons led to other participants in the events of these days. Zhao's phone rang when he was talking to his nephew. As soon as he picked up the phone, his face turned pale. Elder Shanju Li Sr. was found breathless. He bowed his head. Li Mingsheng had also been destroyed, and now Adu was calling to give time until noon. That was when he wanted to hear Zhao's final answer. Fei Yuzhou spread his hands. After all, they didn't have a direct conflict with them. However, his uncle didn't let him finish. He couldn't just take off like that. But his nephew reminded him that the Lis thought the same way, and what had become of them now. Zhao was silent for a while, and finally gave an order. Have Fei dial Ada. Meanwhile, the actuary was negotiating with the others, and it had to be said they were successful. Sung was helping Harley with her wounds, and she was writhing in pain. The Korean old man standing in the hallway listened to her moans and complaints as the warrior approached him, bringing a drink for his new comrade. He had had a rough time of it today. He heard that Li Mingsheng had brought a couple dozen thugs to find him. How did he manage to fight off so many professional fighters? But the man shook his head. He didn't do anything, and he didn't even have time to help. Harley had handled the whole horde alone. The stranger it was to hear her complaining about her wounds. The warrior sighed. It was the same situation he had this morning when he and Sang-go had gone to the park to meet Li Sr. He, too, had done it alone. He became more and more intrigued. He wondered what mysterious force had brought them together and drawn them here to Hong Kong. Adu turned to his boss. He had good news. He had just gotten a call from Fei from Zhou and promised to campaign on their behalf by supporting them. Now if you counted Sunscans and Qian, who almost immediately went to their side and expressed their position out loud, the position of the head of Shanzhu was in their pocket. Sang smiled. Great news indeed. Now he was giving the actuary only 1 month to suppress all dissenting voices in the organization. Adu was then to prepare documents detailing Shanzhu Hall's main sources of income and submit them to the Sang. With the pleasure of stretching his body after the fight, the boy heard Adu promise to follow orders. He thought it was the least brutal power grab he'd ever had. An evil expression flashed in his eyes. Donnie and Rod could only wait. As soon as he had enough power to overthrow them, he would take it all back. Adu was not fooled, and the guy got access to the information exactly 1 month later. Besides racketeering, his new business was based on high-interest loans and gambling houses. Lately, Shanzhu Hall loan rates have dropped significantly, but he had already given the order to the Fei. However, the man did not have time to finish his sentence before Sang interrupted him. Let him just ignore it. Instead, all the liquid assets currently owned by Shanzhu Hall should have been transferred to his personal account. Adu cried out in surprise. That's it. The money is needed to sustain the activities inside the Shanzhu. Once again, Song interrupted him. It wasn't all essential. He wasn't going to take it all for himself, just a loan for a month at the most. He would pay back every penny within that time frame, and Adu had no choice but to agree. He made a couple calls right away. He needed access to all the accounts, which was a lot of money, but he trusted the guy despite the way he knew him. The warrior's car was traveling at breakneck speed when the phone rang. It was Sang, who asked if everything was ready and ordered him to wait for further instructions. The door to the room creaked open and Harley and the doctor appeared on the threshold. The girl smiled enthusiastically. Passports and ID cards were already ready. Great job. However, Sang now had another assignment for them to open an account on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. That tone made Harley mad. Why couldn't he do it himself? And Sang tried to explain that he had more important things to do. But the girl's face was getting angrier and angrier. She was boiling and could have done something stupid. A phone call saved the guy from doing something irreparable. It was Adu who had prepared everything and was ready to transfer the money. They had a meeting in the evening. The Korean specified who was to be eliminated this time, but Sang assured him that the operation had nothing to do with violence. He handed out the documents to everyone and told them to familiarize themselves with them. The actuary who worked in finance was the first to get the point. Sang wanted to speculate on the stock market. The guy corrected him. More precisely, he was going to sell shares in the San Quan Dairy Company. But the actuary, struck by the answer, did not stop to ask. If they were talking about buying up the shares of this company, then Shanzhu Hall's capital alone wouldn't be enough. But Sang just smiled and calmly explained. In a normal situation, just relying on the capital they have wouldn't be enough to create a buzz. But there were some exceptions. Everyone fell silent, waiting to hear what Sang had to say next. And he continued. Food and medicine are their areas of interest. Seeing the silent question, He invited everyone to the blackboard. He began to show what he meant by seeing the impatience of his new team. Drawing on the blackboard, he explained that food was the most important resource for the common man, but what they thought was the most dangerous thing for the food companies. And Harley hastily blurted out, "Of course, competitors with a new and popular product." But Sang shook his head negatively. Then Madame Ko took the floor and calmly said, "A security threat is what could shake the most powerful empire." The guy's eyes lit up. Exactly. Most of the time, it wasn't a competitor that brought down a company, it was a big scandal. Food poisoning, for example. Let them imagine that a contaminated product was discovered that resulted in the hospitalization of consumers. Then what would happen next? Adu rubbed his chin thoughtfully. News that would cause the stock to plummet. At worst, it could even negatively impact subsidiaries, not to mention the empire itself. When the market loses its mind quickly, a huge panic sets in. Companies, retailers, all other market participants will try to stay unscathed, even if the news was fake. Kaiwen cried out. But the medics could easily disprove these rumors with a few tests. However, that didn't faze Sang. Let them imagine that there are two products in front of them, one infected and one not. Which one would they choose? The doctor thought about it, but only for a moment. He quickly realized how it worked and even whistled in amazement, how easy it was to control the human masses. The Korean old man decided to summarize. So Sang was planning to make up a rumor and ruin Song Kwan's company, and the man nodded victoriously. That's right. Hong Kong was unique with the help of social media. In just half a day's work, they can tell residents how dangerous Sang Kwan milk is and make them believe in the danger. The shares of the holding company will be as unstable as building blocks. All managers will be shaken, and they will do anything to keep their position. Then all it will take is one move to destroy this monster or let it live, and it will be Mr. Sang who decides their fate. After making sure that every member of the team understood his task, the guy started his plan. The warrior dialed the store and informed him that he was already there. The old man took care of the news editors and Hell took over the news channels. Now food poisoning was all over the news, on television and on the news. It was said that there were widespread cases of food poisoning from San Quan milk. Many victims ended up in hospitals with sharp pains. More than 15 people were currently hospitalized, and this number was constantly increasing. As Sang had expected, the news had the effect of a bomb going off. Everyone has been talking about the dangers of this company's products. I was outraged that the food safety department wasn't doing its job, apparently because of corruption. After all that had happened, Sun's stock had fallen below 10%. For a holding like that, that meant a real crash. The guy's plan worked, especially the doctor, who recently had been too far away from such machinations, rejoiced at this victory. To think that he was involved in such big games. Harley was interested in something else. Hadn't Sung's knowledge been turned into a chip for someone else to use? Why he still knew all these things? But the boy only shrugged his shoulders. He didn't know, he just understood a little more about the value of their stock. But the girl didn't give up and her gaze was wary. What else did it mean? And he explained that most of their investors didn't invest to slowly watch the value of their product rise, which means to get a grip on the secondary market, investors usually bought stocks based on the news. And Harley sighed. Was it really that simple? And Sang shrugged his shoulders. There really wasn't anything difficult to understand if you knew the mechanism of the Mahin from the beginning. It had been a few days since the launch of their plan, but the amount of cash was already staggering. The guy's team couldn't believe they had managed to make so much money. However, Sang modestly lowered his eyes. He hadn't done it for a long time, so he had lost a bit of skill. If not for that, he would have been able to earn a lot more. The warrior walked over to the table and touched the stacks of bills. If he'd known investing was so lucrative, he never would have become a killer. Harley turned her nose up at the money. Sang smiled. They could still pull this off 3 or 4 times before the financial regulators would find out and block their transactions. The day after tomorrow, he will give his team information about the goal and action plans the guys were interested in. Everyone will be able to invest some money too. Of course, he couldn't promise to make them all billionaires, but he could guarantee basic necessities of life like a mansion. In the news, information about poisonings continued to be at the top of the agenda. There were discussions about the recent safety scandals of the big dairy companies. They've destroyed the entire food and medical industries. The program was being closely watched by 2 people eating their lunch in a restaurant. The younger man looked at his partner and wondered why he was suddenly interested in the economy, but he shook his head negatively. Something was just happening in the market as he had predicted earlier. Suddenly, a strange question came out of his mouth. Was it possible to bring a dead man back to life? His companion chuckled. Probably not. After all, there is only one life. But if he had discovered that a public figure thought dead was alive, he'd have to go to the hospital. Not only that, but she lived right next door, just hiding under a different name. What would he do then? His interlocutor thought for a moment. If he had been a witness, he would have pretended that nothing had happened and taken the information with him. But his comrade wouldn't calm down. Why not? Toth explained how usually public figures don't just pretend to be missing to resign something must have happened. Rather, they're probably avoiding someone, and if someone can get them to defend themselves in this way, they must be very powerful. So the average person is better off not messing with them. Of course, the first thing to do was to avoid them in order to avoid problems. The older man grinned, so he was the kind of man who protected himself. Announcer. On the news continued. Because of the workers' protest, construction work on the railroad in Hong Kong has now been suspended indefinitely. As a result, the stocks of many companies plummeted. Hearing this, Kai Wen and Warrior clenched their fists. Bingo! Their plan was working, and the corporations were collapsing like houses of cards. Clinging to each other, they collapsed before our eyes. And the main secret was that behind this game was a man who had nothing to do with them. Sang and his team were getting richer day by day. Now they had to rent a separate room in the bank for cash. With all this money, they could get a ticket. Another case for Kai Wen. He asked to make an appointment with a psychiatrist for tomorrow. He didn't ask any questions, but there was a look of concern in his eyes. Sang explained lately he had been hearing a voice in his head saying some strange things, just to make sure it was a side effect of the chip. The next day during practice, Sang's phone rang. Although he tried not to be interrupted when he was practicing sports, he picked up the phone now. Kai Wen said he's contacted a psychiatrist. The guy would be expected on Thursday, and after he found out the time and place of the appointment, he hung up. Then he heard a question behind him. Why did he need a psychiatrist? He didn't fight for possession of his body at all. But Sang only clenched his teeth tighter. He turned around and mockingly replied, he just wanted to see if this vision was really part of him or just a play of imagination, that's all. But there was fear in his eyes. There was a doctor and two thugs in the office. There was a man kneeling in front of him. The doctor was finishing up a phone call. So Thursday at 1 p.m. Then he finally turned his attention to his victim. The man on the floor groaned. Please, he no longer had a penny of money. Let them believe him. But the doctor approaching his face grinned. And his heart, liver, kidney, coronary artery, skull and teeth, even his blood every square centimeter of skin. His eyes, for example, cost $500, not to mention other parts of his body. He had no right to say he had no money. His body was very valuable, and he himself had a debt. He didn't think he could get away with it. The doctor turned away from his victim and turned to the thugs. Have them bring him to the black market alive and unharmed. This is very important because the freshness of the organs determines their value, and the man on the floor screamed in terror. As they dragged him to the door, he begged for mercy. Give him one chance, just 1 month, and he would pay. He would pay. But no one stopped. The doctor remained in the office listening to the distant screams. Suddenly, he was called again. Boss. And he turned around slowly. His eyes burned with rage. How many times had he told me not to call him that? And seeing that the man was shaking with terror, he continued calmly. Well, what happened this time? Let him tell it. The elite association wanted them to stop business loans in the Sai Kung neighborhood. The gangs also criticized them. They all said they were breaking the rules and making people angry. The doctor sat down at the table. He wanted the reward but wasn't prepared to make the sacrifice, seeing others do what they dared not. What do you call people like that? The man who worked for the doctor was shockingly silent. He didn't want to look like a coward in this man's eyes. Then his fate would be sealed. In the office, Shan Lau, director and speaker of the elite association of the fourth largest company in Hong Kong, convened an emergency meeting. He had something to say today. He addressed the audience. He had gathered everyone today to talk. Recently, 2 outsiders had appeared in the Chinese market and caused quite a stir. Turning to his assistant, he ordered the papers to be handed out to everyone. The speakers of the Righteous Club of the Port Association and Liang Jianggong read the papers carefully. Lau continued, everyone here had already heard about them, but now he could confirm that the Hong Long Association and the Shanzhou Association were under their control. They haven't heard any news for a long time from the Shanzhou Association, but the short-term loan of the Hong Long Association has greatly affected their business. Ma Tuwei took the floor. So the current Hong Long leader was someone famous. I'm surprised they disbanded since none of the underground rules were followed. Ah Wong interrupted him. Let him not think he didn't know what he was trying to say. If he had a personal grudge, they could deal with it one-on-one. But Lau didn't let the fight break out. Every time they met, they were ready to tear each other's throats out. Jen Kun supported him. Ah Wong had broken many rules, it was true, but now he was one of them. And his men had contributed a lot to the association's cause. That had to be accepted. He turned to Ma Tuwei. He had treated his men badly. Next time he had to deal with outsiders, don't complain if they didn't come to his aid. Thoth smiled disarmingly. He did talk too much sometimes. He turned to Van and apologized, promising to be more careful next time. The man only clucked in response and turned to the general manager. Lau called the meeting early. It had to do with Hong Long. But the man shook his head negatively. He could take care of it himself. After all, the money loan was nothing to him. It was something else. The Mercenary Association had wiped out Fujisaki in Kobe and Tahasaki in Tokyo. It was now Japan's largest and only gang. Everyone frowned as they waited for the continuation. This association was ambitious, and as soon as it finished with Fujisaki and Takahashi, it would start new turf wars that directly threatened them. Sang sat comfortably on the couch and tried to answer the doctor's questions as honestly as possible, and the doctor wrote down every word he said. So he said he heard a man's voice calling himself the killer, and the last dialogue they had was just recently. The guy confirmed every word. Did Sang try to talk to him? And he nodded his head in the affirmative. Did he hear anything back? Not at first, but then he did. The doctor thought for a moment. Finally, he looks at the patient. Does he see the owner of that voice? And Sang got up from the couch. Did the doctor think it was just a figment of his imagination? But he talked him out of it. He didn't doubt his symptoms. Well, he had to determine whether they were the result of a split personality or a wild imagination. This disorder was often linked to childhood trauma, a kind of defense mechanism that creates a safe space to cope with a difficult reality. For example, a positive personality is created to deal with problems in a calm manner, although not everyone who suffers from this disorder experiences it in the same way. But these were traits the doctor didn't see in Sang. So, to diagnose and prescribe treatment, he needed as much information as possible. And the boy sighed. As soon as the session was over, the doctor went to the window and dialed someone on the phone. He ordered me to tell them that action against the Big Four would begin soon. He grinned as he looked at Sang's retreating back, and they would start with the weakest link in the Port Association. Meanwhile, the boy heard the voice again. There was something wrong with this psychiatrist. During the interview, he kept asking questions about him. Clearly, his interest went beyond just the job. Perhaps it was just habit after all. This was the first time he had ever encountered such a case. Still, it didn't seem that simple. Fei Yuzhou had lunch together with Mr. Adu. He found the reason for the decline in Shanju's loan income. It was the work of the Hong Long Association. The actuary did not show much interest. He thought that their territory was in the new northern territories of Hong Kong. The Fei nodded affirmatively. That's right. This association also stole most of the triad's business. That's besides the fact that they no longer showed respect to the Qing Ying Association. Adu looked up. Daredevils. Fei continued. The long-term loan they provided was suspicious. At first glance, it seemed designed for hired laborers. But in reality, it was no different from usury, with fees for services and interest. There were hardly any ordinary people involved in this business. This time, Adu was interested. Were they not afraid of attracting the attention of the police? But Fei chuckled. That one didn't have time to deal with such things. Meanwhile, there was an emergency meeting at the police station. Deputy Commissioner of Police Leiho was broadcasting in front of his subordinates. There was a black market supply chain involved in the harvesting and smuggling of organova. It came to light by accident when the goods are discovered by customs. 2 days ago, the commissioner told us to use any means necessary to solve the problem and respond to the world within 6 months. His assistants were each responsible for their own territory. They became the heads of the districts under whose jurisdiction the operation would take place. In the north, Wang Ya. The Saikun district was under the command of Yishqiang Ren Feng, and the assistant commissioner, on behalf of his supervisor, urged everyone to listen and precisely carry out their every word. And the Kwantong district went to Wu Wansheng. Everyone present from that moment on had to put aside all their current work and concentrate on this case. For 6 months, he wanted them all to give him a chance to answer questions from the Hong Kong and world media who would be watching his every move closely. His voice became thunderous. If they were ready to handle the case, and the policeman let out a battle cry. But Leiho was not enough. He could not hear them, so they repeated it even louder. Now he saw that every one of his subordinates had a fire in their hearts. That was important in a case like this. They must become bloodhounds and track down everyone involved. Dr. Kai Wen and Harley were racing when Sang returned from his session with the psychiatrist. The two of them got along well together, which was surprising. When they heard he was here, they jumped up and down. What did the doctor say? But the guy just waved it off. He said it still needed further observation. Seeing that Sang didn't want to discuss his condition, Kai Wen turned the conversation over. The warrior was calling him. This was more interesting, and the guy called back immediately. He just got the information. Hong Long's short-term loans violated the agreement of the 6 districts and tore down the headquarters of the Port Association. Her head was severely wounded. The elder of the elite association was furious and announced a reward of $8 million for the head of the leader of the Hong Long Association. Now all the triads had awakened. Everyone wanted first-hand information. Not only that, Thailand, Vietnam, Korea, Japan, and Asian mercenaries rushed to Hong Kong. Sang was confused and silent. What was the point of such extremes? And the warrior explained to the guy who was really far from the world of killers. Such a big reward had not appeared in Asia for many years. All capable professionals were considering the opportunity, and the warrior himself was no exception. They discussed everything with the Korean and decided to join forces. But what will Sang say? He would join them in this hunt, and he fell silent as he pondered the proposal. He saw no reason to get involved in the conflict. He had things to do that required his full focus. But the chip personality was there. It was urging him to say yes. Having professionals in his arsenal will help him execute his revenge plan. Let him believe he'll find them useful. The warrior heard him talking to someone, and Sang sighed. No, he muttered to himself. And yes, he would agree to join them. If he still had time to register, let them take him with them. Zawang and his guards were walking down the hospital corridor. When he saw Chen, he came closer. How was Wei's condition? Anything was known. What's the prognosis? But he wasn't optimistic. Not really. The doctor said that there was a good chance he would be crippled. When Wang heard that, he gave an irritated cluck of his tongue. At the same time, in the hospital parking lot in a small bus, the man who was being sent for organs was again on his knees. But his tormentors were adamant. He owes and he must pay. Let him remember his wife and daughter and what will become of them. If he can't work, they will pay the debt for him. The man fell silent in fear for his family. He was unable to get a word out of himself. He only stared at his tormentors, praying that they would take the debt from him. Finally, the doctor, realizing that his victim had been conditioned, leaned over and looked into his eyes. He wanted the man to deliver something for him, and the man, mesmerized like a rabbit in front of a boa constrictor, only nodded briefly. Yes, he would do anything the doctor told him. Even his life was in his cruel hands. Wang turned around to the guard. Did he manage to contact Elder Shan? He lowered his head and began to report what he had unearthed. Just like in last year's destruction of the Yushinari Association, he disappeared after the issues were resolved. He was probably hiding somewhere safe now. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted. Wang turned around when he heard the noise and the guards shouting. Quickly, stop him! The young man froze in terror. In front of them in the corridor stood a man covered in wires. He was wearing a bomb with his finger on the trigger. The doctor wanted him to deliver something to them. The next moment, an explosion was heard, and half the hospital building was blown away by the shockwave. There were screams of terror and groans from the wounded. It was a terrorist attack. This is breaking news. From the Hong Kong harbor bombing, a hospital has once again been targeted by terrorists using a suicide bomber for their own purposes. Sang and his team stared at the television screen. The announcer continued as the number of casualties were still being counted. The first to regain consciousness was the warrior. The people at the Hong Long Association are out of their minds. This wasn't just an internal conflict between the triads, but a real terrorist attack on what's wrong with their boss. The Korean remained calm as usual and summarized. The big four triads had been destroyed. Sang gritted his teeth in anger. Then he turned to Adu. Have him take a good look at the Hong Long Association, immediately, and give him a full report. He was particularly interested in their commander, and he left to carry out his orders. Leo was also sitting in front of the TV listening to the news. He felt a small tremor in his fingers, which did not go away even after a lot of drinking. So far, no terrorist group has claimed responsibility for the incident. What's in store for his association now? They'll be the next target. There was a big fuss in the Hong Kong Police Department. The captain had no time to give orders. We had to get the CCTV footage from the hospital. Meanwhile, the doctor was pensively contemplating the view from the window in his office. There was a knock and one of his gang entered. He looked alarmed. In a trembling voice, he said the bounty on the doctor's head on the darknet had already risen to 12 million. But the doctor just shrugged his shoulders, which was to be expected. However, many members of the association were shocked by today's incident. Now they wanted to sever all ties with the doctor. But that news didn't impress him either. Let them do what they want. They'll always be afraid of those who are stronger, yet willing to do anything for profit. In the end, they were just a pack of wild dogs who foraged together for food to survive. He wouldn't even try to keep people like that down. The doctor had an assignment for him. Taking out Sang's photograph, he ordered him to find out what he could about him, especially what he had been doing in Hong Kong this month. Sang stayed under the onslaught of his new comrades. 12 lam. Since the warrior had started working in this field, he had never seen such a huge reward. What they've been waiting for. Right now, they need to go out and destroy this random psycho and then just split the money between them. But Sang thoughtfully remained silent. They had no information about the head of the Hong Long Association. He would only make a final decision after he had all the data. The warrior would not rest. If they hesitate, someone else will steal the reward. Besides, no one's stopping the guy from interrogating the members of the Hong Long Association. But Sang was worried about the association. There was something wrong with her. If they intervened without first checking them, something would definitely go wrong. Everyone should calm down. Then his phone rang. It was the actuary. He had already gotten all the information and his voice was concerned. Sang ordered him to speak right away. He pulled out the recent news from the association. All the illegal events had started on the 5th of this month after the leader had voluntarily resigned. Besides, he went to turn himself into the police. But the strangest thing is that all the members of the association agreed to make the new and mysterious guy their boss. Harley intervened in the conversation. Now she understood what was going on. It was a complete hypnosis. And seeing that Sang didn't know what she was talking about, she explained. It was a technique that only a few experts in the world possessed. They could input orders into an object's subconscious through eye contact. The author was Hemingway. Sang couldn't believe it. Really, she didn't mean it. But the girl clearly wasn't kidding. The first work began at the Personnel Experimental Laboratory. They got a similar chip codenamed Psychologist. It had been tested on subject number 8 in the past. Sang rubbed his forehead thoughtfully. Why didn't he see him when he was collecting the chips? And he couldn't remember a test subject like that among the prisoners. Where'd he go? Harley looked at him. The chip was destroyed by Dr. Hemingway before Sang showed up because of the threat. It failed safety tests, and that's why the decision was made. The doctor got the first information about the Sangha. The person in the picture was pretty close to the hell out of Shanju Hall. That was interesting. Well, let them dig further. While the doctor was on the phone, he didn't notice some man quietly descending to his floor on a rope and scrutinizing his every move. On the line with his partner, he reported. The target was on the 4th floor, 3rd room on the left. He was about to begin his mission. Thanks to his equipment, everything he saw was transmitted to the monitors the girl was watching closely. Yes, that was him. The man who attended the triad meeting with the previous head of the Hong Long Association on the 5th of this month. The target has been found, and now he must be destroyed. With a short nod, the mercenary grouped himself to break the window. However, at that time, their gazes with the doctor met, and he froze with a clenched hand. He had been discovered. The doctor calmly hung up the phone. His eyes lit up red, and he ordered the mercenary to get out, and he nodded, unable to move. The next moment, he threw himself headlong. A girl's voice screamed in his ear. What was he doing? But the man could no longer hear it. All he could hear in his head was the order to get out. The mercenary's partner wasn't the only one watching. There were other men watching through binoculars. The man reported to his boss. The arsonist will throw himself from the 4th floor. It was like his own decision, and he thought hard that the mission was off. The girl stared at the screen in horror, realizing that something irreparable had happened. And then her anger took over, and she couldn't cope and began to smash everything around her. Finally, her strength waned, and she laid her head on her chest, only an occasional sob. But calm and sober thought had already returned to her. She would not let it go. Her name was Closezard, and she knew what to do. She texted, and the text spread among the mercenaries. For 400,000, she was willing to sell information about Hong Long. Watching the video from the camera sang, and the warrior couldn't hold back a scream of horror. How could this have happened? He had just jumped off the building headfirst. The boy froze in horror, remembering the face of his psychiatrist. This couldn't be a coincidence. Suddenly, Harley was on top of him, demanding to see the video too. The boys moved over, and the girl smiled and then looked more and more seriously at what had happened to the mercenary. Her eyebrows moved to the bridge of her nose. Suddenly, she ordered the Sang to go back a little. It made sense to her now. The warrior moved closer. What did she see there? And the girl explained. Exactly what she was talking about before. Total hypnosis. This man in the video, when he met the arsonist's eyes, he put the order into his subconscious. They saw the result. On the video, the mercenary did not hesitate to follow orders, but that wasn't the worst of it. The time for full hypnosis was too short. Sang looked at her what that meant, and Harley wrinkled her nose. If he had more than 25 eye contacts, he risked being hypnotized. The warrior screamed. Didn't that mean they could only destroy him with a sniper? But Harley only sighed. This guy was too hot. The problem was that if the doctor was careful enough, they wouldn't have a chance to shoot him. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a phone call. It was the Korean guy's cell phone. The manager had gotten a bad call. He couldn't help but pick up the phone, but to avoid offending the guys, he put it on speakerphone. He'd been looking for him for some time. He had to return urgently because a new order had come in, and the old man agreed, promising that he would be there soon. The warrior leaned into the Sang. He was still communicating with the manager, but only because it wasn't easy to act alone in a job like this, as he had explained before. It was normal in their profession to take on extra work, and in general, they didn't have the option of just firing their manager. He ran up to the Korean and playfully started shushing him. The guy wanted to remind him that he wasn't allowed to share any information with his manager, but he should share with them whatever his manager tells him. As they joked, Harley watched the video uninterruptedly. All the evidence indicated that the organizer of last night's bombings was the Hong Long Association, and he grumbled grudgingly about why they were involved with terrorists. His subordinate explained that in fact the 2 explosions were due to internal triad conflicts. However, this answer did not satisfy the chief. Internal conflicts. He wasn't stupid enough to mistake them for acts of terrorism, so let him go and mess with someone else's head. Even if he believed Lee Ren, did he really think the reporters who had been hanging around the station since morning would back him up? No, they needed a bigger story. That one smiled thinly, but it was true just yesterday. 3 of the 4 triad leaders died in the hospital. The only one left alive was a senior member of the elite association. Yes, and their recent actions were unusual. Even underworld members other than the 4 triads had problems with Hong Long, and he described the situation in detail. At this time, the doctor summoned his subordinates and ordered them to inform the others that they were all to guard this building for the next 5 days and destroy anyone who comes inside. And the thugs whose eyes burned the same red light as their bosses obeyed without complaint. Such was the power of hypnosis. Letting them all go, he ordered one to stay behind. It was Aid, one of his most loyal men. The doctor had a special assignment for him, and he clutched his face. The next moment, he tore off his scalp as if he were removing a mask. He wanted Ada's face, and the man did not even think of refusing, whatever his master commands. Sang and the boys thought about it. If their goal could take control of a person in just a few seconds, then there was nothing to even think about destroying him alone. They had to consider the fact that he probably had people under his control ready to be his human shield, which means infiltration was also futile. Given these facts, there were only 2 ways left. The warrior was ready to continue as the phone in his pocket suddenly rang. The number was unknown. Sang ordered to pick up the phone, and the guy heard an unfamiliar female voice. However, he had no intention of talking to someone he didn't know, and the girl introduced herself. She was the arsonist's assistant. Her name was Klossazard. She'd heard he'd gotten an order from the Elite Association, the way he looked at it. The warrior confirmed it. There was nothing secret about this information. But why did she show up? Did she really want to give advice? And the one chuckled briefly. Exactly. She had just hacked into the security tapes of Hong Long's building and thought it might help him. But why did she choose the warrior? Because he was the same as a lone arsonist. And she only worked with single professionals. That explanation suited the guy just fine. How he could get in touch with her. And she promised to give him a hard drive with the blueprints of the building and the route inside. Her services are free to him. She wasn't fooled, and it wasn't long before Sang and his team had all the information. Blizzard herself got in touch with them. 20 hours had passed since the arsonist had died. The target still hadn't left the building. It basically confirmed that she already knew the amount of the bounty on the darknet. So the doctor decided to be careful. So he decided to stay in the building and wait for them to attack first. There was no other explanation, given the big reward and the underworld's attitude toward the doctor. Blizzard was sure that many Hong Long members were planning to betray the boss. But Harley disagreed. The doctor's ability to hypnotize was great. She believed that among the building guards, 90% were his slaves. The warrior shrieked with indignation. Now the target was unlikely to give them a chance to shoot. Other than the sniper, there was only one option left. But his men were everywhere, and unfamiliar faces would immediately reveal themselves from the 1st to the 4th floor. Suddenly, Blizzard shrieked she had bad news. The government had determined that the organizer of the Hong Kong hospital bombing was the Hong Long Association. Now they were forming a special team and mobilizing special forces within the next 24 hours. If Sang's team shows up there, he'll draw attention to himself. Suddenly, Kaiwen's voice came from behind. If that's the case, they can use it. Everyone turned around in surprise and stared at him, waiting for him to continue. First, they will need to blend in with the SWAT team after infiltrating the building, should find a way to relay information about the target to the police. They would be able to help them get rid of the doctor's slaves in the building. They would only have to figure out how to subdue the hypnosis expert himself. It was a great plan. A huge tinted jeep stopped outside the building. It contained a group of mercenaries known in the underworld under the code name of the Three Musketeers. They all wore masks and checked once more that everything was ready before they left. The bolts of their weapons clicked in their hands. They could begin their mission. All 3 of them got out of the car and walked with firm steps toward the building. There was no sign of trouble. The most ordinary people inside went about their business. The 3 musketeers stood in the middle of the huge hall and fired a few warning shots into the air. Cries of terror were heard. People scattered. They planned to clear the room and inspect the building floor by floor to force the target out. One of the group approached the men and ordered them to sit quietly. Kaiwen was no longer happy that he had proposed the plan. Sang and the warrior, appreciating his cleverness, gave him a friendly hug that made his bones crunch and made him want to scream in pain. Once again, Blizzard's worried voice distracted them. Someone had broken into the building and attacked the men. It was the 3 musketeers. She transmitted the video image to Sang's screen. One of the group, seeing how easily and cleanly half the operation had already gone, stood relaxed in front of a bunch of frightened people. His brothers were going to clean up the floors. Everything was going according to plan. It was worth finding a rope to tie people up. But while they were talking, he didn't notice that the eyes of those present had turned red. The people jumped up and roared wildly at their attackers. They froze in bewilderment, and they froze in surprise, bewildered. What was going on? They had never seen such rage in the eyes of people. The first musketeer was torn apart by the crowd. The others clutched their pistols in terror. We had to shoot. But it was too late for them, too. The men in the front ranks fell wounded, and were immediately replaced by the next. They acted like madmen. Sang and Warrior watched the men tear apart the 3 musketeers like wild beasts with their teeth. They had never seen such brutality before. A chill ran down their spine. The warrior turned around in his eyes. There was no more courage in his eyes. It was better to just forget about this case. He had changed his mind about something. These people were too creepy even for him. Sang turned to Harley. Was the previous test subject number 8 as skillful? But the girl didn't know that. Although she understood why had that chip been destroyed. Meanwhile, not all the crowd was hypnotized. One girl remained hiding on the sidelines. It was the Black Widow from the Queen's Peak Association. The mercenary Pompey Roma approached her. He immediately understood why she had come here and offered to work together, but she had already seen enough and decided to give up. The man shrugged calmly. Well, okay. He himself wasn't planning on backing out just yet. The reward was too tempting and he didn't want to give it up. As soon as he left, she immediately picked up her phone and dialed a number she knew. She was calling the manager of the Queen Peak mercenaries. The boss immediately asked if she was finished. However, the girl only sighed. No, the difficulty was beyond her expectations. She couldn't handle it alone, and her manager ordered her to get out of there. She shifted her gaze to a woman standing nearby. It was Madame Ko herself. Shrugging her shoulders, she said she was right. As always, this order was impossible to fulfill. Sang and his team were discussing the next plan of action. The warrior was to contact the Korean and tell him that they were planning to infiltrate the capture group. Toth nodded briefly and moved on to the next item. Kai Wen would be in charge of liaison with Blizzard and keep them informed of the police and what was happening in the building. Now he turned his gaze to Harley, and the girl's eyes lit up with joy. She would help him see if there were chips that could suppress the doctor's abilities. Harley even shrieked with pleasure. She was finally being taken to the real thing, and she had been sitting around watching everyone else get into arguments but her. Lu Ruyi stood in the phone booth and talked to his uncle. How many times had he asked him not to do people favors? His uncle Li, the owner of the antique store, tried to explain the situation. It was a request from the Liangjiang gang itself. He could not refuse them. When he and his father moved here, these people helped a lot. Now that they were in trouble, they couldn't help but help them, and the nephew realized it was useless to argue. He hung up the phone and headed out on a new assignment. Looking at the hospital building, he thought, if so, he would finish it quickly so that his uncle could repay these people. While there was turmoil around, Ram snuck up to the 3rd floor and clutched his weapon tightly, quietly creeping toward the office where he knew his target was located. His informant was not deceived. Peeking through the open door, Ram saw that the doctor was sitting with his back to him and not moving. Perfect target and perfect timing. He stepped over the threshold and opened fire. Bullets came one after another. This doctor, no matter how strong he was, didn't stand a chance. Ram will get his money. When there were no more bullets left in the chamber, he went quiet and looked at his victim carefully. He didn't move. That would be strange after so many hits. Ram approached the table and saw that it was not his target, but a completely different person. And then he noticed a speaker on the table, from which he heard an unfamiliar voice. I want you to destroy every intruder who enters this building. And Ram's eyes lit up with red fire. He no longer remembered himself. Yes, sir. Lu Ruwai entered the hospital building, but right at the threshold, he stopped like a stumbling block. It was so strange that he didn't immediately realize it was real. There were people with empty eyes walking everywhere. Their clothes and their entire appearance was badly shabby. Lu Ru even smiled. Wasn't it a horror movie set that he had accidentally gotten into? But the zombies, having noticed the named guest, rushed at him with a snarl, and he realized that it was not a prank. He easily fought off the attack and stopped to catch his breath. Harley froze in front of the chip case. She wasn't sure if the target they were trying to destroy was stronger than number 8, but they might have the same weaknesses. Sang without getting out of bed clarified what it meant, and the girl explained that first of all, full hypnosis only worked on primates and warm-blooded animals. Insects and cold-blooded people did not succumb to full hypnosis. In the second place, people with outstanding willpower also successfully resisted it. She'd had time to look at all the chips Sang had taken from the lab, and there were 2 suitable for their case. The boy looked up interestedly. Which ones? And Harley smiled enigmatically and showed him the entomologist and sadhu chips. They could definitely help them in their operation against the doctor. Lu Ru, meanwhile, went to the counter and picked up the phone. The receiver clicked, and he asked to be connected to customer service. A woman's voice answered immediately. Mr. Lee Asia Oz was at his service. It was a special support service for mercenaries. Turning around to make sure all the zombies were destroyed, Lu spoke. He needed help with the Hong Long Association, specifically all their data for the last 3 months. The girl asked for a few minutes. It wasn't long before she reported that the necessary information had been gathered, and Lu asked to sound it out. He didn't have time to check his email. On the 5th of this month, the head of the Hong Long Association suddenly announced his resignation. The girl went on to tell what Sang already knew. Harley, meanwhile, tried to explain to Sang. The Sadhu chip could greatly increase the user's concentration and sixth sense. This chip was necessary for him. With his help, the guy will last a couple seconds longer than the average person before being hypnotized. He's already learned the basics of chip, and he's gonna make it here. Sang glanced at her incredulously. It sounded like one of those duels in Wild West westerns. I mean, he should have just shown whose gun was faster. But what about the other type? What was so special about him? And Harley lost all her cheerfulness and began to tell the story. The entomologist was different from the sadhu. It appeared to be completely harmless, but in fact it was of infinite use. The previous test subject had developed it to the point where he could communicate with insects. So Dr. Hemingway upgraded this chip from level S, completely harmless, to level A, extremely dangerous. Until today, it's been sealed. Sang reached out to take a closer look at the chip. It looked like he was much stronger than the sadhu, and Harley confirmed it. But there was another feature. The ethnologist was much harder to use than the sadhu, especially since they didn't have any insects to practice with beforehand. Sang grinned stubbornly. Let him not worry about that. He already had a plan, and Harley believed him. The guy had never once let her down. Loop Rue stayed on the line. The girl gave him all the information he needed, whether he needed additional fire support or not. She could provide that too. But the mercenary shrugged nonchalantly. No need. He was used to working alone, not with a bunch of dumb thugs. He hung up the phone. The man rubbed his forehead tiredly. He hated dealing with terrorists. These subhumans didn't even understand human language and were clearly of low intelligence. At that time, another group broke into the building. They rappelled down from the roof and smashed the windows to get inside. It was the North Vietnamese Wolf mercenaries. The captain gave a short order. Starting on the second floor, they would prioritize eliminating hidden threats and then gradually work their way up. The entire group split into several subgroups with their leaders and rushed to carry out the order. Their commander looked at them with satisfaction. Meanwhile, Gabriel sat in the restroom, keeping his eyes on the magazine. He'd heard some movement downstairs and calculated. It was already the fourth wave. He wondered if the two mercenaries he'd met in mid-levels had participated in this hunt. He'd been looking forward to seeing them since the day they'd parted ways. In a secret restaurant that remained closed all the time, the bartender was leisurely wiping glasses when his phone rang. He picked up the phone and introduced himself. Sang got straight to the point. He needed one shipment of goods. Today, was it possible? And he thought about it and replied that it depended on what was ordered. The guy explained he needed them to find some common insects, including poisonous ones. The bartender surprisingly didn't ask any questions and nodded understandingly. Harley made herself comfortable on the bed and inserted the chip. It had been a long time since she'd used it, and now she realized that her hands were used to it. But then the stubborn chip was finally plugged in, and her pupils narrowed. It was like a current ran through her body and large drops of sweat appeared on her forehead, a feeling long forgotten. When her breathing recovered and she was able to speak again, Harley turned to Sang. So did he manage to place the order? He nodded affirmatively. The chip broker had good connections with the suppliers. Such an unexpected request could indeed be fulfilled within 2 hours. Harley bowed, as if in pain. Sang noticed her not feeling well and asked if she was sure she was okay. Maybe it was better for her to stay here, and he would go with the warrior. But she didn't even want to hear it. Don't worry, Harley will be fine soon. It was an echo of her old illness, and a twitch of pain ran down her face. At that time, the North Vietnamese wolves were rushing down the corridor. Zone A was cleared just like B. The commander was pleased. Let them keep it up. Luru listened to what was happening upstairs. The gunfire on the second floor had stopped, so there must be a winner between the defense and offense groups. Sang's team also watched everything that was going on in the mission. Blizzard was kind enough to give them access to the video, and they appreciated the strength of the Vietnamese. Sang moved closer to get the news and the warrior explained. The triads hired experts in the building was a mess. He could hardly distinguish who was shooting with whom. The guy stared at the screens. What about their target? And Kai Wen explained that she never made it into any of the cameras. The doctor must have been hiding somewhere. A crowd of journalists had gathered in front of the building. The entrance was already restricted, and they were reporting live outside the hospital, and there was a lot to report to the audience. This was a new terrorist attack in the last 3 hours. People remained in the building. The motive was unknown at this time, but gunfire and explosions were still being heard. The chief inspector of police was on the spot and attempted to negotiate, but got no response. And at that moment, there was a deafening explosion. Windows all over the second floor blew out and shards of glass rained down on the people. Everyone scattered around screaming and moaning from the wounded. Rum was quietly observing the whole thing. Then he took out his phone and calmly reported to someone. Target 2 had been eliminated. Now he waited for the next orders. Sang and his companions watched in horror. What was happening in the hospital building noticed that the situation was getting more complicated by the minute. What will they do? He turned to the Kai Wen. Had special forces taken any action? And he replied that Blizzard said they hadn't, but the girl interrupted him. They were taking action. And indeed, the Special Forces group was quickly boarding the helicopter waiting for them. In just a few seconds, the vehicle soared into the sky. Sang also decided not to hesitate and ordered everyone to move out. Harley happily cheered up at last. They were damn tired of sitting around and just waiting. The commissioner of the Northern Territories has not stabilized the situation. How was she supposed to do that with these resources? Sending people to their doom. Suddenly, she heard the sound of approaching helicopters and lifted her head to get a better look at him. Journalists were whispering around. It was the special forces. She exhaled with relief at last. The men descended the ropes one by one, and within a minute, the whole group was in place. They were really pros. The commander immediately approached the commissar. What was the situation? And the latter did not hide anything. Quite badly, the shots in the building did not stop for a second. Not only that, but there were a few other people who wanted to break in too. She supposed that in all the commotion, even the people inside didn't know how many there were. The commander was thoughtfully silent. It seems the current head of the Hong Long Association had offended more people than they realized, so how many civilians were trapped inside? And the commissioner replied with a sigh. At least 100. The commander even whistled. With so many hostages, terrorists were especially difficult to deal with. At that time, a tinted car silently pulled up to the hospital building. Inside were Sung and his team, dressed in an exact replica of the Special Forces outfit. Sang scrutinized the situation in the side mirror and decisively ordered. The SWAT commander and the commissioner were almost done chatting. Come out. And hiding their faces behind masks and helmets, they jumped out of the car and one by one moved towards the group of special forces, trying not to attract attention. At that very second, the commander ordered everyone to move into the building. Sang and his companions easily joined his squad. However, everyone stopped at the threshold. Inside, there were many casualties. One of the fighters went to see if anyone was alive. Walking past the entrance, Sang involuntarily noticed the camera. It was blinking. His intuition had given him a sign for a reason. Following them closely was Dr. Head of Hong Long. His eyes filled with joy. Number 82 had indeed come. Then he was called out. It was Rom, who was dragging the Vietnamese commander behind him. He was unconscious. It was the man the doctor had ordered to be brought in. When he saw him, he smiled. Good job, now have him send 2 groups of zombies to the first floor and surprise the named guests. Rom gave a short nod. Once inside, the commander began receiving strange information from his subordinates. Armed bandits seemed to have been bitten by unarmed civilians. He wondered if, besides the terrorists in the building, there were also rabid dogs pretending to be civilians to be feared. There was no other way to explain it. The warrior stepped closer to the Sang. How he planned to relay the information to the special forces, and he answered that he wanted to do it as soon as the situation became more chaotic. Suddenly, the elevator started. Counting down the floors, it was approaching the first floor. Not knowing what to expect, the Special Forces soldiers clutched their weapons tighter and waited for what would happen. Finally, the elevator dinged and the doors opened. And to the surprise and horror of the special group, a crowd of people flew out. With howling and snarling, it rushed at the uniformed men. The commander reacted instantly, ordering them to aim at their torsos and leave at least 2 alive. Shots rang out, and people started to fall to the ground screaming. When all was quiet, the commander pulled off his helmet with irritation. It was the first time he'd ever had to deal with something like this. He'd never had to shoot a civilian before. However, his attention was immediately drawn to one of the fighters. There was another civilian in the elevator. He was tied to a chair and obviously badly wounded. He needed help. Although the unknown man was conscious, he had no strength to raise his head. The commander immediately sent 2 of his men to see what was wrong with him. They rushed to carry out the order. As they made their way to the elevator, they failed to notice another man. He stayed in the shadows and watched their every move. It was Rom. After assessing the wounded man's serious condition, one of the soldiers said, he wouldn't last long, so we had to get him outside and call an ambulance. Back in the elevator, he and his companion began to untie the hostage. They were so engrossed that they didn't notice the huge bomb glued to the inside of the car. It was too late anyway. Rom pressed the red button, and immediately a huge blast wave swept up the elevator and pushed it outward. Everyone backed up. When the smoke and dust cleared a little, the commander rushed closer, but he saw only 3 breathless bodies. There was no one to help. He gritted his teeth. Once again, the nearby elevator came to life and opened its doors a moment later. Another group of zombified people stepped out into the corridor and idly headed toward the SWAT team. But this time, they could expect no mercy. The commander who had lost his men dreamed only of revenge. He turned to his group and ordered them all to be destroyed. Warrior and Sang have joined the firing squad. They no longer need to warn the extraction team to be careful of the tools hidden among the hostages. Once again, the battle group opened fire. Rom, meanwhile, kept his gaze fixed on what was happening. Did they really intend to destroy them all? We'll have to change tactics. He turned to the 3 men, who were obediently awaiting orders. Their bodies were wrapped in bombs and their eyes glowing with red fire. They too were under hypnosis. Their goal was to pretend to be hostages and ask the cops for help, and then blow themselves up at the right moment. And the cops nodded their heads and stepped forward. When the fighters saw them, they raised their weapons threateningly and ordered them to stop, and the men trembled and asked not to shoot down. They needed help. Despite commands to stop, they silently approached the squad. Their eyes were filled with terror and tears. In trembling voices, they begged to be saved. The soldiers froze uncertainly, and suddenly, amidst the silence, A single shot was heard, and the hostage collapsed to the floor with his head shot through. Everyone turned in horror at the shooter. It was Song who ignored the effect he was having and kept his gaze on the other hostages. Let them take at least one step as well. But they were no longer afraid. Their eyes blazed with rage and vengeance, and they rushed forward with vigor. But the next minute, 2 shots calmed them down. The captain, as if awake, jumped up to Sang and started shaking him. How dare he shoot the hostages? And he obediently gave him a chance to blow off steam. Finally, seeing that he had calmed down a little, he explained. They were not hostages. But the commander wasn't listening. He looked and realized that there was more than one of his group in front of him. He had never seen him before, and Sang, realizing that there was no point in hiding, took off his helmet and mask. Everyone stared at him in surprise. But don't pay any attention to him. Harley, the warrior and the Korean, told his comrades to take off their masks as well, and they obeyed his order without hesitation. Seeing the SWAT team losing patience and their fingers gripping the triggers of their assault rifles, Sang smiled. Let him not worry, so he had just saved their lives. They've probably all seen the articles about the terrorist attacks at the hospital before coming here. Fake hostage was a human bomb because of the Hong Long Association. However, the commander was no longer willing to listen to his excuses. They sounded like nonsense. Let him say who they were or none of them would get out of here alive. And Sang introduced himself as a mercenary, hired by an organization that suffered heavy damage from terrorist attacks on a Hong Kong port and a Hong Kong hospital. Their mission was to find and eliminate the current head of the Hong Long Association. Therefore, their goals were the same. However, the commander did not share his confidence. Unlike the underworld, he had orders to capture the target alive and bring him to court for a legitimate trial. These guys had other plans. Sang only shrugged his shoulders. That was because they didn't realize how dangerous the target was yet. He carefully took the phone out of his pocket so as not to provoke the fighters. To start their cooperation, he would share information about the target. The only condition was that they had to consider his proposal after reading it. The commander hesitated but made up his mind and held out his hand. He took the phone and plunged into reading, while Sang waited calmly and patiently for his decision. Finally studying everything, the commander turned to the boy. Were they 100% sure that the target's abilities were that strong? It was hard to believe. Yi Sang smiled. He guaranteed the accuracy of all the information, otherwise they wouldn't have tried to team up with the government under any circumstances. But the commander had a hard time believing what was going on. The guy was so sure his information was right, but he pointed to the victims. They were proof of that. He did not deny the existence of extremist organizations in the world, but the target had brainwashed the association in a short time. Nothing but hypnosis came to mind, so the commander made a final decision and turned to Sang what they wanted them to do. And the man smiled enigmatically. Just one thing. Ram, seeing that the group was not going to move on, called the doctor again. The intruders didn't seem to want to take over the building. They had other plans. The bartender was looking at the envelope to be sent when he heard one of his phones vibrate. The number was familiar to him. He picked up the phone and heard Sang's voice. He called to see if his order had already been sent to the address. The bartender checked the information and assured him that he would be there in 30 minutes. The delay was because they were short of one insect ingredient. Then Sang wanted to add another ingredient, that is, make a new request. He asked for additional provisions and a 15-pack of night vision devices equipped with infrared imaging to be delivered to the same address. The order was accepted without question, and Sang hung up the phone and turned to the commander. He had done his job as promised. He nodded briefly. Journalists were closely following what was happening. 2 hours had passed since the special forces had entered the building, but still nothing was known. Sang kept a close eye on the time. Soon his order would arrive. And indeed, the rumble of approaching quadricopters could be heard outside. A moment later, several packages fell to the hospital entrance, and Sang's team went out to retrieve the suitcases. The SWAT team watched their actions with interest. Once inside, they had smoke bombs, military-grade thermal imaging cameras, insect grenades, and tear gas in their hands. The special forces were shocked by the service. The commander sighed. Mercenaries of their time could even obtain Class A items. That scared him as a crime fighter. He himself didn't have such an opportunity. Sang put his helmet back on and calmed him down. He was exaggerating because the guy just knew one capable supplier. The others were not capable of such a thing. The fighters began to distribute the new equipment. Ram kept an eye on them. He dialed the doctor and told him that their plan had failed. He didn't know what to do next, but the man grinned. No big deal. Confronting his opponent's actions was particularly interesting to him. It was like playing a computer game. Then he turned around and addressed the sergeant of the Vietnamese fighters. He was standing next to him and his eyes betrayed hypnosis. He was ready to do whatever the doctor ordered, and he said he was giving him control of the zombie bombs and shooters. He had to protect the third floor at all costs, keep them from getting here. At the same time, Sang and his team made their way to the second floor. He immediately spotted the ambush and gestured to the warrior where to expect it. He nodded his head. Together with the Korean, they approached one of the offices with 2 men hiding behind the door. They had pistols in their hands. Suddenly, the door was shot open. Then they saw a smoke bomb thrown into the hole. Their eyes and noses were immediately covered with gas and they screamed in pain. The warrior and the Korean were just waiting for it. After disarming the enemies, they ran up to the door and kicked it down with one blow. Then they rushed inside. Sang watched their actions, counting to himself. 1, 2. On the count of 3, 2 bodies were thrown out of the office, and they literally slammed into the wall with all their might. The guys showed up behind them and reported back. All clear. Sang smiled contentedly. Great. Then have them bring these 2 to their senses. He had a few questions he planned to ask. Soon the injured groaned and opened their eyes. Sang looked at them disdainfully and turned to the team. Interrogation was not his forte. Maybe someone wanted to replace him. Harley volunteered to help him. She considered herself a pro at this. Sang gestured for her to begin, and she stood for a moment assessing her victims. Her eyes darkened. Stop pretending. She knew they were already awake. If no one got up, she'd take that as an invitation to mutilate them. Hearing this threat, the men screamed in terror. Then Harley sealed her promise with a couple of blows. They begged for mercy, promising to tell all. The girl grinned. How gentle everyone had become these days. They couldn't even be patient for a little while and gave up right away. She was just beginning to get the hang of it. Sang sat down across from them. Now he would ask them questions and they would answer. He advised them not to try to hide or deceive. Otherwise, he could not guarantee their lives. After waiting for them to stop assuring him of their honesty, the guy asked question number 1. What assignments they'd been given since the doctor took over. They looked at each other incredulously. The boss always gave everyone individual assignments. No one knew what anyone else was doing. Well, Sang could well believe that. Then let them each tell us about themselves, what they've accomplished this month. And those, drenched in sweat from fear and interrupting each other, began to talk in an attempt to please. One assured me he had accomplished almost nothing. On orders from his boss, he promoted short-term loans by luring uneducated clients who did not understand the details of the contract. Sang looked at the other man and he trembled. He didn't even do that. His main job was guarding the warehouse. This was of particular interest to the group. What warehouse? And the man explained. It was a place where the harvested organs of those who couldn't pay their debts were kept. Listening to him, Sang felt sad. In the beginning, the warehouse was in the port of Hong Kong, but then for some reason the port gang jumped on their deal with an overseas organization, and everything went down the drain. They ordered them to stop smuggling organs, but the boss ignored their request. That's when everything went wrong. As we listened to him, we all wondered. The warrior muttered to himself. No wonder the Hong Long Association had decided to go to war with the Port Association first. With each word, Sang's eyes grew darker and darker with restrained rage. He marveled and despised such cruelty, not just the doctor, but everyone involved. The man continued. After the warehouse became useless, he was given a new job. Among other things, he sought out clients and persuaded them to work for him. The Korean gritted his teeth. It's all clear. The bomb man who was in the Hong Kong hospital was most likely a poor guy who couldn't pay back his debts. Sang had one more question, and he asked it to a man who was literally on the verge of going insane with fear. Where was their boss now? The man shuddered. He really didn't know that. Usually he did, but he couldn't finish. Sang pulled out his gun and shot him in the forehead. He sighed and fell to the floor. Ignoring the screams of the second man, Sang lowered his gun. Since he didn't know there was no need for it, and he didn't want to leave him alive, he shifted his gaze to the second victim and fired again. A few seconds later, everything went quiet. Both of them remained on the floor breathless, and Sang felt a sense of satisfaction. Against the backdrop of the events in the Hong Kong police force, an extraordinary meeting was being held among the top officers of the department. Lei Ho's face was as gloomy as a cloud. New information has just come in from the scene. Progress on the Hong Kong harbor organ smuggling case has surfaced. He turned to the deputies. The Hong Long Association was behind the case. They were also the ones who launched the short-term loan and the terrorist attack on the Hong Kong hospital. The short-term loan scam took tons of money from many citizens, and if the clients could not repay the debt, their organs were forcibly removed from their bodies. If their organs were useless, the client was told to become a live bomb for the operation. Hong Long could be considered a threat to the government and the entire legal system of the country. That's why their superiors have authorized them all to act as they see fit in each situation. No reservations, no boundaries. There was only one condition: arrest all members of the malicious association as soon as possible and rid the country of the cancerous tumor without letting it spread. The Vietnamese and the doctor sat in front of the monitors and watched everything that happened in the hospital. It was like watching a bug swarm, the sergeant clarified. These were the people they had to watch out for, the doctor confirmed. He advised to get rid of the most dangerous special forces. Meanwhile, the fighters were making their way up the dark staircases. With the help of the thermal imager, they knew in advance that another group of zombified people was moving towards them. The commander only had time to order them to prepare for battle before the zombies came rushing at them from the third floor. Their eyes were red and their mouths were roaring like the previous ones. A group of fighters put out the muzzles of their automatic rifles and started shooting. However, one of the attackers jumped up and tore his shirt on his chest. Underneath was a bomb. No one had time to take a step, but it wouldn't have saved them. There was a deafening explosion, and the whole floor was engulfed in flames. The roar of the fire drowned out the moans of the wounded. Sang was in the other wing of the building when he heard a pop and felt the building shake. He guessed what had happened and moved his eyebrows irritably. Spackle sprinkled from the ceiling. Just in case, he decided to check his deduction and dialed Kai Wen. What happened? Why the hospital building was shaking? His hunch was confirmed. Kai Wen was just reviewing the security footage and saw what had happened. Another kamikaze had taken lives. Lu Rao walked to the stairwell and listened. The explosion seemed to come from the third floor this time, although the sound might have been different in an empty building. Black and White, hired by the Elite Association, decided to check out what had happened. He came here as a hunter for the doctor's head and didn't know what he was getting into either. Kai Wen had sent Sang a video of the explosion from the epicenter's cameras to his phone, and the boy and the others scrutinized it. When they saw the picture, they shuddered. Even a first-class mercenary warrior who had been in many troubles was astonished. They were even capable of such a thing. The Korean summarized, using the narrow terrain in the building to line up the zombies created the perfect opportunity to detonate the bomb. Would they be able to overcome their tactics with what they had? But Sang had other things on his mind. He contacted Kai Wen again and asked him to turn off all the cameras in the building. The request was unexpected, but he didn't argue. And in a couple of minutes, the mad doctor and his sergeant were sitting in front of a blank monitor. The cameras were off. The boss glanced at his slave. Use the landscape to overcome the difference in numbers. It was a plan only a Vietnamese could come up with, but what he would do in their place. The sergeant explained he would have destroyed the terrain, reducing the enemy's geographic advantage, and focused on manpower. Blizzard told Kai Wen that they've hacked into the building's cameras, but now she can't detect the target's movement either. Are they sure of their decision? Sang confirmed this and bent down to one of the boxes. Without a second thought, he flipped open the lid and let the colorful, large butterflies loose. By disabling video surveillance, they no longer have to worry about enemies using the camera to pinpoint their location. Now at least they won't get killed by sending zombies and bombs, and it will temporarily allow them to lower the target's priorities. After that, they can grab the doctor. The warrior turned to his comrade. But how do they pull this off? And the boy explained. With their style of play, sacrifices would have to be made. They couldn't use it to win. If that's the case, we should have changed this style to win. Now we had to check the whole building. He wanted to know the location of every living person. Hearing this, the butterflies flew down the corridor and soon disappeared from sight. The doctor and the Vietnamese man continued to stare thoughtfully at the blank screen. Finally, the doctor said quietly, he had an idea, and he looked at the sergeant with a smile, ready once again to rush to do his bidding. There were still pillars of dust on the stairs. Lu Ru came down to see what had happened and coughed. His eyes were blurry. Suddenly, footsteps were heard. He turned around sharply, ready to defend himself, but to his surprise, he saw Black and White. What was he doing here? His amazement was unparalleled. They were old acquaintances. Black and White was also surprised to see an old rival here. He'd heard Loop Ru had given up the business. Why is he on the order? But the man just shrugged. He just needed to return an old favor. The two of them were already staring at the picture of destruction. Who had done this to them? Lu Ru immediately denied such cruelty. He didn't even have a weapon with him. Black and White thought for a moment. So this is the work of the people from the Hong Long Association. On the flight of stairs below, someone was coming again. The mercenaries froze until suddenly they saw another colleague walking up the stairs. It was Gabriel. Black and White recognized him immediately. This mercenary was a true pro, and in Europe, his rank reached 7. Gabriel heard the last words and was honored. He didn't expect me to take his reputation to Asia. They explained to him that this time the mission was dangerous. They suggested we team up just in case. Gabriel didn't mind, but the question remained. Who would be in charge of them? So Lu Ru and Black and White offered their candidacy. The situation was desperate, especially since Gabriel wasn't planning on giving up that spot to someone else either, which meant it was time to fight for it. The winner would call the shots, the losers would obey. This invitation sounded like a command, and all three of them rushed to the attack. Each tried to do the most damage to two opponents at once. A fierce fight ensued. While Gabriel bounced off with a kick to Cherno's eye, White grabbed his trademark wires and threw them over Loop Ru. The man's body throbbed with tension. Suddenly, at the height of the fun, Lu Ru stopped and ordered them to follow suit. He clearly heard someone, and it was confirmed a second later. Rom came up the stairs and stared at them with interest. What were they doing here? They were all from the same profession. What internal conflicts there could be? The mercenaries went off in different directions. Black and White smiled at Rom like an old friend. Had Pompey sent him here alone? He shrugged. He could handle it himself, and he pulled out his cell phone and said he'd just gotten an update on the target. He could share it with them if they agreed to cooperate with him. The mercenaries froze in thought. No one trusted each other completely. Each knew the value of such camaraderie, but they didn't realize the butterflies were watching them. However, Rom took their silence in his own way and hiding the phone in his jacket summarized. So now they were all colleagues. No one disagreed with him, but the eyes of the mercenaries remained wary. The sum for the doctor's head was too great, and everyone realized that no one would share it. Harley was the first to see the butterflies begin to return and waved enthusiastically. The insects almost filled the entire hallway. But after flying around their group, they only approached Sang. He held out his hand and let them sit on him. He closed his eyes as if listening to something. The Korean watched in amazement. He had never seen anything like this before. Those butterflies, what they were doing. And Harley was happy to explain it to him. Simply put, the butterflies used abstract graphics to transmit to the Sang the location and information about each person inside the building. The Korean whistled. Butterflies were capable of this. For an ordinary person, it was impossible for insect specialists to communicate with ordinary insects. However, the number of people in the world who understood them as skillfully as Sang did not exceed 20 people. Harley finally approached the young man. What was the situation? He began to tell. Too many people remained under hypnosis. In their situation, even a simple purge of ordinary soldiers would take hours. Harley reminded. Hadn't he ordered a batch of Japanese giant hornets? They might have allowed them to clear the area much faster. But Sang shook his head in denial. For their poison to work, they needed time again. They didn't have it. They had to finish the doctor as soon as possible. Suddenly, the speaker on the ceiling buzzed. The sound was so unpleasant that everyone covered their ears. It seemed to dig right into their brains. What kind of sonic attack is this? The doctor moved closer to the microphone and spoke. It was a communications test, whether they could hear him. The girl was stunned by that voice from the first few seconds. It was familiar to her. Hong Long's boss continued. He claimed responsibility for the Hong Kong hospital and Chanwei port bombings. He was also a target with a reward of 12 million. No one understood what he said next as Harley screamed in terror. Hurry up! Get everyone to cover their ears. Let no one listen to him or they'll be hypnotized. Without knowing it, the doctor continued. Now the retribution of the main triads was directed at him after the explosion in the hospital. But he had been carefully preparing for this moment. But their game had frustrated him. Over the past few hours, he had not survived a single attempt to destroy it. Many of his precautions had gone to waste. Sang glanced at the girl. Would they really fall under hypnosis just because of the voice? And she screamed. Yes. After all, the one who spoke now was test subject number 8. The doctor sadly continued. In order to move on, he decided to make some sacrifices and reduce the complexity. What can you do? That's life. Meanwhile, Sang ordered everyone to plug their ears tightly, but the phone in his hand was still working. Everyone froze, waiting for him to speak. The doctor's eyes lit up with red fire. From now on, all living people will be involved in the battle. Whoever is left last will be able to find him in the broadcasting room. Sang's team didn't hear the doctor's announcement. He would remain in the building specifically for another 48 hours waiting to meet the winner. Finally, it got quiet and everyone looked around in surprise. What he finally said, and Sang used his phone to convert the audio into text. The warrior and the Korean read the text. They were puzzled by the doctor revealing his location. He was sick of living. He thought no one could destroy him. Harley was angry. I shouldn't have underestimated him. Hypnosis is based on the fact that the target needs physical contact, but subject number 8 didn't follow that rule. They were the only ones in this building who hadn't been hypnotized yet, Sang interjected. In other words, besides them, everyone else had started destroying each other. But it was illogical. A normal man wouldn't sacrifice his advantage to give the enemy a chance to destroy him. But Harley stood her ground. If it had been anyone else, she wouldn't have understood the intent either. But number 8 was different, and they had to take him seriously. Seeing the girl boiling over trying to convey the truth about the subject, Sang thought hard. It was the first time he had seen her in such a state. She obviously knew what she was talking about. Finally, he spoke. One could assume that the people who heard the broadcast would follow the order and start fighting in the building until there was only one survivor left. However, over the course of the game, when there are only a few people left, the likelihood of them running into each other will depend very much on luck. It may take 2 or even 3 hours then if the CCTV cameras are disabled, who can prove that the survivor is the winner. Everyone fell silent. Finally, the Korean confirmed. No one can. Then Sang continued. When the number of survivors has dwindled to the point where it will be difficult to meet them, the supposed winner is bound to head to the broadcast room to claim the prize. But how can number 8 be sure that the only survivor is on his way? This inference was so unexpected that everyone fell silent in confusion. The question was reasonable and required thought. Sang answered his own question. No way, because the target doesn't care if whoever goes into the broadcast room is the only survivor. He just wants to speed up the game and grab the strongest people. The warrior shrieked in rage. So this was all just part of his plan. And they were like pawns moving across the field at his behest. It made him angry. Sang sighed. Perhaps. He had started a war with the 4 major triads to force the underworld to set an exorbitant bounty on him. The Korean confirmed the reward of 12 million, attracted all first-class fighters, and the target could replenish his legion with mercenaries of high ability. Sang could not understand only one thing. With this ability, why is it necessary to build up combat power? This question was answered by Harley, because his enemy is the Jicheng family. They, like Cyber, were the organizers of the Persona project. Even subject number 8 with his outstanding talents couldn't stand up to them alone. So his goal was to build up his fighting power to get revenge on this family. That explained everything. But the boy still had some unanswered questions. Evening had fallen on the city. The windows of the building were dark and empty. It was as if no one else was there. The survivors lurked, waiting for the right opportunity. Sitting in front of the blank screens, number 8 reported. He had already caught several big fish. Everything was going according to plan. They would meet the day after tomorrow as planned. Suddenly, the door behind him opened with a creak, and without turning around, he said goodbye to his invisible interlocutor. He had guests to go to. He turned around and saw Song, and smiled as if he was waiting for him. The doctor introduced himself, but the guy interrupted him. It wasn't the first time he had met. But why did his face change so much? He looked completely different last time. He frowned and asked his enemy what he knew about him. Sang smiled at everything, including the fact that the doctor was a former test subject of Project Persona 8. The madman shuddered when he heard that. All the conversation between them was transmitted to Harley's phone and converted into text. The girl clenched her teeth in anger when she saw the guy's last sentence on the screen. She'd told him not to drag her into this. Crazy test subject number 8 was vindictive, and even Harley was scared to have him as a personal enemy. Meanwhile, Sang continued. There was one thing he didn't understand: why the doctor pretended to be a psychiatrist to get close to him. But the man grinned, and as he thought to himself, and the boy answered, because he decided to choose Hong Kong as a starting point and could ruin the plans against the Jicheng family. The man shook his head approvingly. He really wanted to get rid of the hidden threat as quickly as possible, but that was only part of the reason, not all of it. The organizers were part of an alliance of 12 major organizations that wielded considerable power and wealth. Cyber was a member of the alliance, just like the Jicheng family. Sang listened silently for fear of confusing the doctor with his questions. He didn't expect such eloquence from him and was seizing the moment. For them subjects of the project, eliminating one of the organizers was only realistic if they managed to strike first. But the worst part was different. The organizers could endlessly change their power. As long as half of the 12 members of the alliance were still alive, their activities continued successfully. There was a problem. Even if the doctor destroyed the Jicheng family and Sang destroyed Cyber, the organizers could still easily find replacements for both of them. It didn't make sense, and they would have to face the rage of the organizers more than once in the future. Sang clarified, so there was no way to break through. There was, but the doctor couldn't tell him because it concerned him and the plans of his allies in Hong Kong. That's the reason he pretended to be a psychiatrist. First, he needed to make sure that the plans of the guy using his chip didn't concern them personally. And second, he needed to find out the path he was going to take. Sang asked what he meant, and the doctor smiled. Number 41 would be able to answer, and it was time for him to go back. The doctor had a surprise for him in the lobby. He turned over his shoulder and flashed his eyes. Sang felt as if he had been pushed in the chest, and his eyes flashed with red light. He nodded briefly. Then, as if marching with a firm step, he left the office and went to his team. The doctor sipped his tea and looked at his back with interest. A fascinating specimen. Footsteps sounded behind the doctor, and a guy came into the light repeating everything he heard and writing it all down in a book. It was another test project of the Persona historian. Number 24. The boy's pupils were dilated. He repeated, Jicheng as a target was not due to the fact that number 8 disliked them. Number 82 could interfere with 24's plans against the family. To ensure successful implementation, number 8 decided to secretly make contact with him. Yes, a sign that the subjects are prone to developing severe mental illnesses due to chip abuse helped me quickly find number 82. Under the disguise of Mr. Chen, the famous psychologist number 8 waited patiently for his target, and because he had changed his appearance, he didn't recognize him, and the game began. Using the chip, psychologist number 8 instilled an order to the Song to postpone his own plans to destroy Cyber and to cooperate with the doctor against the Jicheng family. The historian continued. Up until the 21st of August, everything was going well. The doctor and the allies had completed the first phase of the plan by reducing the influence of the Hong Kong triads. After tonight, the doctor and allies will be in hiding again to wait for the family to start a territorial war against the main triads. The doctor smiled. Given that subject number 82 would continue his journey to Macau to accumulate wealth, power, and strength, the historian folded his palms prayerfully. In the presence of a witness, he confirmed that there were no omissions or interventions in the story. The doctor endorsed this strange ritual. He also repeated that with the historian's permission, he was confirming that there were no omissions or interventions in the story. This strange oath was taken 3 times. Then, number 24 exhaled heavily and began to put the record book into his backpack. He felt incredibly tired, but there was nothing he could do about it. The process of learning the historian's chip was too tedious. They used it, but had to go through this cumbersome and ancient rite. The doctor reassured him there was nothing to be done about it. The chips had frightening potential but were also dangerous to the hosts. They had to be careful. He wondered if it was a good idea to just let Sang disappear like that. As a chip-carrying fighter, he could be quite useful to their cause. The psychologist shook his head. Not necessarily. If they tie him up too soon, they will limit his development. In addition, he was just toy number 41. Sang returned to his team without noticing the wary looks the guys and the girl were giving him. He walked past them toward the lobby. It was necessary to take their prize, but Harley insistently grabbed his arm and ordered him to stop. No one was going anywhere before they found out if the guy was okay. Pulling out her chip, she held it out to Sang. Have him swap his for Harley's. And he raised his eyebrows. What was that all about? Did she really think he was hypnotized? But the girl stood her ground. It was just a procedure. All the more reason for Sang to refuse, and he furrowed his eyebrows stubbornly. For a second, they froze, staring at each other. Finally, Sang angrily snatched the chip from Harley. He would prove that he could withstand the hypnosis. With a sharp movement, the boy inserted the chip into the socket at the back of his head and felt the current run through his body. His face was covered with sweat, and his jowls were running down his face. From surprise, he lost his balance and fell to the floor. The girl looked at him fearfully. How did he feel everything was all right? And he nodded with difficulty. When he came to, he could read the conversation that had taken place between him and the doctor, and Harley handed him a phone with a text message on it. Sang hesitantly picked up the gadget and began to read. There was no limit to his surprise. He really couldn't remember much of anything. Could it be that the hypnosis had worked on him too? Finally finished reading, he grinned. So that's how it went? Well, that didn't change his plans now. They would go to the first floor to collect their prize. That statement shocked everyone. What? Did he really believe the words of that madman? But this was a real trap for them. But the boy only smiled. Let them not worry, they would not be touched by any more trouble. At least not today. It wasn't a trap, just the promised reward. He turned and walked toward the stairs. His team froze. The warrior even checked with Harley to see if she was sure he was okay. Maybe he needed a doctor. Hearing his last sentence, Sang turned around and irritably ordered him to shut up. No more chatter from his team or he would go on alone. When they went downstairs, they saw that the former commander of the Vietnamese wolf mercenaries was waiting for them in the lobby, who was now the sergeant of test subject number 8. Everyone carefully peeked around the corner. Not daring to come out at once, they saw a dead body with the appearance of a doctor sitting at the table next to the sergeant. Sang walked around them and calmly approached the Vietnamese. He heard the guys hissing in his direction, but he was sure he had nothing to fear here. He approached the mercenaries saying he had come for his prize. The doctor sent him here, and he clutched the bomb button just in case and pointed at the body with his eyes. The doctor told him that Sang could take this guy to pass him off as number 8 and demand the promised reward for him. As interest in the operation inside the building did not subside, the news was on in the restaurant. All the diners listened to the live broadcast with interest. At this point, the SWAT team had been inside for 12 hours. One of the visitors turned to his comrade, who had recently said that Hong Long was not so simple, but what he meant, and he explained. In his opinion, the leader of the association had no intention of developing the triad's business, and although he was a member, he worked against it. His companion stared at him with interest, waiting for him to continue, and he did not fail. It seemed he had chosen the triad only to achieve a certain goal. First a war with them, then a terrorist attack. Logically, it was clear that he wouldn't walk away unscathed after his deeds. But how he'd managed to do it so far. Suddenly, the voice of the announcer on the screen became tense. Breaking news. The special forces finally found and neutralized the organizers of the terrorist attack who were hiding in the building. The Black Widow of Queen's Peak was also following the news. Turning to her interlocutor, she pointed out the new information. Could it be that the boss of the Hong Long Association has been destroyed? Madame Ko furrowed her eyebrows. She double-checked. All the bounties previously posted on the darknet for his head had been removed, so the amount had been paid. Shang Lao, the leader of the Elite Association, breathed a sigh of relief when he heard the phone receiver say that his order had been completed. Now he had to send the money to the account. The call caught the wife of the leader of the Port Association, Madame Shan, at the board games. She was annoyed. You don't need to call for nothing, just have them transfer the money. At the tea party, Liangjiang gang leader, Zhili and director of the largest holding company in Hong Kong, gang leader Cheng Jian gathered. They were talking quietly. Who could have done this? Could Lu Ru be on the hunt again? But no. It was a previously unknown foreign guy. Nothing was known about him yet. In the middle of the hall, the new leader of the righteous Zhen Dui Club was sitting in the lotus posture. He was meditating when he was distracted by a phone call. When he heard the news, he ordered the money to be transferred. In light of recent events, the ranking of darknet mercenaries has changed. The Korean was now ranked 9th in Asia. He was surprised and shocked. On his way home, Sang ordered him to explain everything to his manager after he returned. He smiled and promised to fulfill the request. At this time, the doctor and the historian were walking through the dark Vankai port of the warehouses. Number 42 was again with his chip ready to go, and his eyes were dilated. The doctor tore the scalp off his face as he walked and sighed in relief. How tired he was of wearing the masks of these stupid and ugly people. At last, they entered one of the containers. Although it was completely dark, there were some people waiting for them. Their shadows flickered, and a thick bass immediately asked how it went. The historian began. All went well. Number 82 accepted their prize. He traded the funeral director's fake body for the reward and went on his way. An obese man stepped into the light. This was test subject project persona number 47 making a decision. How many mercenaries had been captured? Doctor's report. 5 in all. 3 of them were on the leaderboard, while 2 had high potential to make the list. Number 47 thoughtfully lit a cigar and was silent. At last he said, if 5 against 1, they would finally be able to hold back the Ukubo Shoya of the Ji Cheng family. When he finally got home, Sang stretched out on the bed with pleasure. Harley looked at him anxiously. The warrior and the Korean were gone, like himself. The guy smiled reassuringly. He just couldn't understand some things and he needed to gather his thoughts and be alone. He shouldn't have worried about him. The girl stretched with relief. She was also terribly tired, and since Sang was fine, she went to bed. After saying goodbye, the boy was alone in the room. Immediately, he heard the voice of the second personality. He had been fooled. It was their trick. But what can you do? They were careless. It ended well, and they got the information. The next time they crossed paths, the doctor wouldn't be able to manipulate. The personality grinned. What's the plan? Stay in town and watch battle number 8, Sang thoughtfully said. He will continue to follow the original plan to head to Macau and infiltrate Corfins. But what to do with Shanju Hall? Was it okay to just leave things as they are? As a member of the Hong Kong triad, they will definitely be dragged into the internecine war between number 8 and the family. But Sang thought otherwise. With the Koreans' defense, they should have been fine. In the near future, under the defense of number 9 in Asia, no one would dare to attack them. The personality grinned again. So that was why the guy had given most of the cash reward and ranking points to the mercenary Korean. The next morning, immediately after breakfast, Sang gathered everyone in the large hall and placed the familiar drawing board in front of them. A new meeting was beginning. However, everyone was tired and couldn't focus their attention, which annoyed Sang. His anger was directed at Harley, who was closest to him and was playing on her phone. One more time he'd notice it and take him away, and the girl, after getting such a beating, decided to keep quiet. This always so calm guy was clearly on a rampage now. Sang turned to the team. Did anyone know about the group of gamblers? If so, raise your hand. Harley's hand flew up, but the guy pretended not to notice it. So no one heard, and the girl lost her patience and screamed as loud as she could. Tell him to stop ignoring her right now, otherwise he'll be in trouble. Blizzard, who had attended the meeting remotely, intervened in the conversation. The name reminded her of something. Was there a connection to what had happened in Monaco? Sang nodded contentedly. It was not a myth that a group of gamblers existed, but seeing that no one else understood what they were talking about, he decided to explain. Every one of them knew Las Vegas well, and there were only 2 places in this world that had the same reputation. One was Monte Carlo in Monaco. The second one's in Macau. The group of gamblers he mentioned are from Monaco. In the 19th century, the principality's government didn't have enough revenue and the king to build a casino in Monte Carlo. The executor was his close friend Maurice from Hamburg. He gained great influence and considerable power. To ensure that the casino and players adhered to the rules, Maurice created a parliament of the most famous gamblers and asked them to control the casino. They could also punish violators. Because of this, the casino quickly expanded to become the largest and most reputable in Europe. The rest of the world looked up to it. The actuary raised his voice. So the group of card players that Sang mentioned earlier was the original gambling parliament, and the boy nodded. Yes, after hundreds of years of development, the influence of a group of card players spread to the whole world and was no longer limited to the countries of Europe. Currently, the casinos in Las Vegas and Macau were also no exception and were under the watch of a group of card players. Madame Ko spoke up. If this group was indeed capable of much, it was worth assuming that they were content to stay away from the gaming table as referees. Sang nodded again. In addition to supervising the casino and the players, they also began to organize special games that only members of the group could participate in. The stakes were not limited to money. Resources and promises were also accepted. For example, political changes in the trend of world oil prices and so on. The warrior raised his eyebrows in amazement. What Sang meant to say was that the people in this group of gamblers were all either wealthy or powerful. Exactly. These were the billionaires and the political elite. Only the big shots had the right to become an official member of the gambling group. The Korean asked a question. So Sang's goal was to blend in and get resources or promises into the game of these bigwigs. And the guy grinned. Right on. But he himself had just said that these special games were only available to members of the group. How was he planning on joining the group? There was a hitch. It was impossible. Only people who were recognized by the gambling group could become official members, and there were simply no other ways. The warrior shrieked. If so, his plan wouldn't work. But Sang reassured him. In addition to the official participants, there was one more way for gamblers. There were many ways to cheat, and even a group could not collect them all. Access to special games was open to experienced cheats who always won. When a group of card players determined that a person had gambling skills beyond the ability of the average person, they offered to participate in the game. The warrior clarified. But such people couldn't offer anything as bets. Besides, normal people wouldn't want to play with such devious crooks. Madame Ko disagreed. On the contrary, for these bigwigs, these crooks were the ones who carried true value, and Sang supported her. No matter how much they practiced, no one was able to break the 80-point barrier. Those who caught their attention had at least 90. By paying a small sum, they could invite an expert gambler to replace them on the gambling table. Only a fool would refuse such a deal. The Korean summarized. So, in the special games held by a group of card players, players with high victory rates could be very popular. Sang nodded. If you show your cheating skills, you will definitely get an invitation. The Korean will stay to help Adu manage Shanju during his absence. Warrior and Harley were going with him, while Madame Ko trained him 7 actors with skills, and within a day they were on their way. The girl was thrilled. Arriving at the place, the Sang ordered them to go to the hotel first. The actuary had already booked rooms for them. After checking in, everyone could go about their business. They approached the posh hotel, the most expensive possible in this city, and breathlessly stepped over the threshold. The beauty and wealth around them was breathtaking. Approaching the front desk, Sang held out the fake documents and the receptionist smiled kindly. He would help them through the check-in procedure. After that, they headed to floor K and quickly found their room. Once again, everyone was surprised. It was a whole apartment, luxurious and spacious. Sang immediately outlined a plan of action. Now they could go enjoy their free time, and in the evening, he needed them to go to the casino with him. The boys left but returned at exactly the appointed hour. The casino was also magnificent. It was a huge building made of 1,000,000 lamps. It was spacious but crowded inside. The warrior's head whirled around the place for the first time. It was Jay's public area, open to tourists. With his mouth open, Warrior listened. There were also restricted areas for billionaires and celebrities. These too were noisy and partying. There were quieter offices as well. Nearby, they saw Harley. She was excitedly looking at the plush tiger behind the glass of the toy machine. It was the one she needed most urgently, Sang explained. He had seen something similar in other casinos in Las Vegas. It was believed that whoever caught it in 10 tries could win a lot of money in the casino. When Harley heard that, she decided to get him at any cost, and the boy, knowing from experience that it would take a while, slipped away. The warrior followed him. They walked with interest, looking at the tables and players. Suddenly, Sang was staring at someone. The warrior turned around. "What's the matter?" Sang kept his gaze on the gambling table and grinned. He noticed something interesting. He took a quick step to get a closer look at the game. A girl caught his eye. Like many poker players, her face was hidden by a mask and her eyes by glasses, so her opponents could not see her reaction. The warrior was interested as well. Did Sang know her, or did she seem special to him? So the guy decided to get rid of his comrade, so he turned the conversation. He held out a card to him. It had 100,000 on it. Let him go and play for a while. And his companion, without suspecting anything, gladly seized the opportunity. Sang, meanwhile, squeezed through the crowd that had gathered near this gambling table and began to study all the opponents of his longtime acquaintance. One of them looked at his cards and happily pushed all the chips to the very center of the table. Wah bank. He was clearly confident of his victory. The other trembled with anger. Pass. The guy quietly got behind him and looked at his cards. The guy had a full house, but he folded. Probably thought the Japanese had a flush royale against him. The girl continued to sit motionless and silently crossed her arms over her chest. The first player finally couldn't take it anymore. She was going to answer something or let him waste no time. At last, she apparently made a final decision and spoke loudly and clearly. Wah bank. Her words had the effect of a bomb going off. Everyone started talking at once. The Japanese man flashed a glare but then laughed harshly and revealed 2 aces. He couldn't believe she had a jack and a king in her hand. She was bluffing, for sure. Ta was silent again. And then, to whispers behind her back, she revealed her cards. They were the king and jack combination, a flush royal that beat 4 aces. Pretty soon, both the crowd and the infuriated Japanese man dispersed, and the girl also calmly remained sitting at the table and counting her chips. Sung came closer and she looked up and froze. You couldn't see her eyes from behind her glasses, but the guy knew she recognized him. The pause dragged on. Overcoming the awkwardness, Sang pointed to the bar. "Let's chat." She nodded and obediently stood up and followed him. There, sitting behind the bar, they were quiet for a while the bartender prepared their drinks. The girl, meanwhile, took off her hood and glasses. It was Barbara, Sang's familiar. Finally, the guy decided to break the silence. What made her come to Macau and become a cleaner? He looked at her closely. She hadn't changed a bit in the months they hadn't seen each other. Only now she was a professional gambler who worked with the casino against cheaters. But Barbara only smiled. Her friend had changed a lot since the last time they had seen each other. There was no longer that unfriendly atmosphere. Sang replied with a smile. If someone survived the betrayal of being kidnapped and forced to give up his own empire in a month, he would also change a lot. Barbara looked at him with a sidelong glance. He had indeed suffered too much for an ordinary man. But he was no ordinary man. Who had done this to him? Rod. But Sang only asked me not to tell anyone about his appearance in Macau. At least not before his odds were good enough to go to the bank. The girl nodded understandingly. He wanted Rod not to know he was alive before he knew it, so he'd come to Macau to ask the MPs for help. He nodded. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by Harley's scream. She had gotten the tiger after all, and she was happy. Sang said goodbye to Barbara. He had to go. The girl nodded and looked back at him with a smile. They used to play poker together a lot. But since then, Sang hadn't just changed, he had become a different person. It was time to find the warrior. Walking through the casino, they quickly saw him at a table. He looked dejected. Harley jumped up to him to see how much he'd won. He turned on her and grinned. He'd lost every last dime. His eyes sparkled with excitement and reluctance to stop. But the money on the card had run out. It was time to go back to the hotel. But even in the room, the warrior could not calm down. Had he known that today he would be so unlucky, he was one card away from victory. Sang decided to back him up and clarify what he was playing, usually Texas Hold'em or 6+ Hold'em. But the guy looked at him in confusion. And Sang suddenly realized that his comrade had no idea how to play casino games. This discovery made him furious. How could he bet without even clarifying the rules? Later, he calmed down a bit and pulled out the cards. They flashed in his professional hands. The guy started telling the basics and made sure the warrior listened. But at some point, Harley and the warrior got distracted and started arguing. Sang exploded again. A little more and he'd stop teaching them if they didn't get smart. It took him a while to calm down again. He had no patience for that kind of attitude. Then everyone sat down at the table and went over the ground rules again. However, the warrior was still unsure of his abilities. He understood roughly how to play, but he needed practice to learn the card combinations. Sang held out the map to them. These two had half a month to figure out all the games. During that time, he would give them 100,000 chips every day. They were still discussing the details when Sang's phone rang and he picked it up. He had been waiting for this call from Madame Ko. She had gathered the people he had ordered and could have sent them to the site by now. Sang had ordered them to be brought in groups, not all at once, so they wouldn't attract too much attention. The girl nodded understandingly, then she would send the guy their resume. And turning to her guys, she said, "In 3 days, they're going to Macau with her." In front of her stood a group of people with nothing in common. Different ages, lifestyles, clothing styles, professions. That was the level of professional actors. The casino shimmered with all the lights of the rainbow and attracted attention from every corner of the city. The inside of the J-Zone was full of people. All the machines and tables were busy. Harley and the warrior were more confident in the game this time. Sang and Barbara watched them from afar. The girl was interested in her acquaintance's new friends. If it was him from the past, she would never have thought he would befriend the likes of them. But it was said without reproach, more like respect. The guy shrugged his shoulders that, well, people change. But Barbara didn't go on about it. At the Macau tournament, there would be 2 competitors to watch out for. She handed him 2 tightly folded sheets of player information. They were Dan Zucker, a professional poker player, and Wang Bar. He is a straight master. Barbara continued if he wanted to address the MPs as a player, then these people would be his main opponents at the tournament in Macau. Sang thanked the girl, but the girl shrugged her shoulders and said, "No thanks. Isn't it a law of nature to lend a helping hand to a friend when he's in trouble?" Harley and Warrior had just finished playing and were waving at him from afar. The boy turned around. It was time for him to go now, but they would see each other again. And Barbara nodded her head at him and stayed at the bar and looked after him. She could hear them asking Sang about her as a mysterious stranger. In the room, Sang took a little poll on who had won how much. Harley took a modest pose and lowered her eyes. 300,000. And the guy gave her an approving nod. He looked at the warrior, but he stared at the floor as if he hadn't heard the question. Finally, he pulled himself together. He had lost half of it, and Sang lost control again. 3 days later, the whole company headed to Parque Luis de Camoes. They were to meet a group of professional actors from Madame Ko for their extras. After examining them, all were satisfied. Madame Ko was not considered a professional for nothing. It was impossible to recognize these people as mercenaries. Sang decided to explain his plan of action right away. His goal was to win the tournament and get unlimited participation. Before that, There were qualifying matches. They consisted of 5 rounds. At each round, he would give each member of the group $3,000 for Bane Yin. The warrior clenched his fist joyfully. The guy continued. A reward system was envisioned. In addition to a set reward, the prize money would be divided according to individual contributions. Harley pretended to cover her mouth with her hand in horror and turned to the warrior. Tom had better not participate in the qualifying matches. And the boy bellowed angrily at her. Madame Ko decided to summarize. In other words, the more of their people win, the more money they can divide among themselves, right? And Sang nodded affirmatively. There were other questions. If there is only one person left who can qualify for the finals, and he refuses to participate, thereby helping a comrade to qualify for the finals, how the money would be divided in that case. And Sang explained that his share would then depend on the number of chips. This answer completely satisfied the actor. No one had any further questions, so they drew up a contract based on what he had said earlier. The meeting was over, and they left. Soon, the first qualifying round of the tournament took place. The hall with gaming tables was full of 4,500 participants. Sang and his team were also there, and the guy was sitting at the 78th table. He'd started with 3,000, but by now his stakes were up to 8. At table 93 sat Madame Ko. She played carefully and took her time. She passed a lot. That's why her bets only increased from 3,000 to 4,000. Time passed, and the sun was steadily rolling towards sunset. Finally, it was announced that player Sang at the 78th table had advanced to the second round. The guy smiled. It's been a few hours now, so the others must be almost done. His bets had risen from $3,000 to $42,000. Suddenly, he heard the warrior's furious shout. He had lost his patience and was yelling at the whole room. He wanted to play again, and he needed 3,000 more chips. The first day of preliminaries, everyone but the warrior made it to the second round. The guy was out of his mind. Even at dinner, he was still trying to explain his failure. The big blind player who sat at his table guessed his cards every time, but he couldn't be right all the time. Something was wrong with him. That's when Sang got a text from Barbara. She wrote that she had found out that Dan Zucker would participate in the tournament and that he could read cards and bluff. 7 days later, the second qualifying round of the tournament was held, and this time, there were already 1,200 participants. Sang, sitting at his desk, couldn't contain his irritation. It was such bad luck to face the best player in the second round. Dan Zucker was sitting in front of him as his opponent, and he was acting confident. Throwing the chips into the middle of the table, he announced that he was raising the bets. And the dealer responded a second later. He won, but Dan didn't even raise an eyebrow. Now his chip count had almost doubled, from 70,000 to 120, and he had 2 nines in front of him, a good chance for another win. Sang was also a professional gambler, but when he faced such an opponent, he lost. His chips were already halved and he thought hard. It was as clear as day that he couldn't defeat such a strong player. All he had to do was to use cheating. But suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted. He saw something interesting. A bee flew up to Dan Zucker, and he turned to it. Let it tell his cards. Behind him again were 2 individuals. Already well acquainted with him, John Chris met a comrade. The new personality was entomologist Jean Arnie, who helped Sang communicate with insects. John Chris smiled mockingly. The guy used the chip again. If this continues in the future, he might turn into a psychological monster. But Jean Arnie was okay with that. Then they could be reborn in other ways. The thought hadn't left him since his personality had been transferred to the chip. Sang had the information. His winnings had risen to 96%, and he decided to raise the stakes. One of the players immediately folded, but not Dan Zucker. He had only 2 ladies and the probability of winning was only 4%. Sang followed his musings closely. Even though he wanted to be fair and honest with him, he just didn't give him a choice. His ability to read maps was too strong. Zucker, meanwhile, made a decision, and with a calm voice accepted the bet by throwing the chips in the middle of the table. Sang won, and a triumphant smile touched his lips. A few hours later at table number 47, the dealer announced, both Sang and Dan Zucker had become third-round picks. The boy frowned. This was already a problem he had failed to fix in the last few games, even though it made him lose almost all the chips he had won earlier. When the tournament was over, Sang went to the bar where Barbara had already ratted him out. She'd heard rumors that he'd beaten Dan Zucker. The whole casino was abuzz with the news, but the guy only smiled enigmatically, just lucky. He didn't really have to explain to her about the chip and the ability to communicate with insects, and the way things were with her. The girl sighed. Not really. Ghost Hand was also participating in the tournament, and she had no way of understanding his style of play. Some even claimed that he was cheating. Sang should also be careful if he plays against him in the future. Using normal card reading techniques on him will have the opposite effect. Having received such valuable advice, the boy said goodbye and went to his room. Harley greeted him enthusiastically as usual, but he pushed her aside and turned to the warrior. Were there any dropouts today? And he smiled happily. No. All 10 made it to the next round. However, 2 of them were almost out of chips. But that wasn't the problem. He'd replenish the chips for anyone who was missing them. The more of them that made it to the main event, the better their chances of winning. There were only 400 contestants left in the third qualifying round. The round was narrowing down. This time, Sang was lucky. He was sitting at the same table as one of the actors. Ah Feng, as he was called, silently moved his lips. But Sang understood him perfectly. He was suggesting to first eliminate the opponents and then divide the chips amongst themselves. The boy shook his head slightly in agreement, and both of them smiled faintly. Their plan was working, and everyone had a win-win, which meant they were happy. At this time in Nagoya, a dozen cars were gathered near a huge mansion marked by a tall stone fence. It was the home of the Yoshinari clan. While everyone was waiting at the table, a leisurely conversation was going on. The main news was the recent events in Hong Kong. The clan elder decided to discuss it for now. The second elder clarified. He was talking about a showdown within the triad. The one confirmed yes. The four main triads had been destroyed by a small group of unknowns. He was amused by the circumstance. The others, however, remained serious and thoughtful. In recent years, the strength of the triads in Gangkong, Macau, and Taiwan has declined significantly. As far as they all knew, the head had gathered them this time to discuss the second turf war with the Hong Kong triads. At last, there were footsteps approaching from behind the door. The door swung open and a tall, stately man entered the meeting room. It was the head. He walked over to his seat and sat down tiredly. This was the most important member of the secret organization, the real zodiac of the underworld, the head of the Yoshinari clan. In his time, Yoshinari Zaren had united the Japanese Yakuza. He gave everyone present a hard look and finally spoke. Everyone had already guessed what he wanted to say. One of the elders, whose character gave away his anger and desire for power, smiled thinly. The clan was planning something big. It was to his liking. Meanwhile, the tournament continued. The croupier announced the contestants. Sang and Ah Feng had passed the fourth qualifying round. They shook hands as they said goodbye. He was about to get up from the table thinking that Harley must have finished too, but suddenly, his eyes locked on Dan Zucker's gaze. He folded his arms across his chest and stared at his opponent with a fearful gaze. Right now, he was only interested in one question. Was Sang cheating in the last round? But the man only furrowed his brow. He should watch his words and not make accusations without proof. Otherwise, he would be sued for slander. But Zucker stood his ground. He had just confirmed his theory by watching a few rounds of Sang. He had mastered the technique to quickly identify his opponent's cards. The boy smiled, showing that he didn't understand, but Dan continued to be serious. There were 3 more rounds to go before the finals and he would expose his cheating. And before he left, he claimed to know Sang's future. It's Dan who will cause his defeat and reveal his trump cards. Cheaters must be punished. When he had moved a decent distance away, Sang's smile slipped from his lips. Well, if that was the case, he would wait for it. Their fight was now a personal matter. There was a warrior waiting in the guy's room, and they sat down to have a heart-to-heart talk. So this Dan Zucker wanted to solve Sang's trick in the next qualifying matches. I did, although unlikely. Either way, it was going to be a tough battle, especially if he found out the guy was using insects to cheat. Meanwhile, Zucker had not given up hope of finding even a single clue. He scrutinized all of their game footage. He scrutinized every detail. Finally, his hand froze with the coffee glass before it reached his mouth. He stopped the tape abruptly and stared at the frozen picture. There was a B on it. The fourth qualifying round began a few days later. There were less than 200 participants left. Sang's initial chip count had reached 500,000. He was thinking, if he stalled, history would probably repeat itself again, and Dan Zucker would finish before him and come to see him play. Apparently, his plan was to watch his games closely and try to figure out his ploy in the next 3 elimination rounds. He wasn't going to let him get his way. But 1 hour later, at table 23, the 5th qualifier was announced. It was Dan Zucker. As Sang expected, as soon as the game was over, he immediately got up from the table and went to look for his main opponent. But suddenly, he ran into a guy. This time, Sang was ahead of him and faster. Dan clenched his teeth in annoyance but didn't show it. No problem. They still had 2 rounds left. An hour later, the guy met up with his fellow warrior and Harley for lunch. So he was now in a full-scale confrontation with the Zucker in question. That's right. Although Sang had no idea why he was so angry and nagging him all the time, maybe he had a bad experience with crooks. At that time, the girl pointed her phone at them and took a picture, and then sent it in a text message. The man they were looking for was here. She was promised a money transfer. The conversation at the table broke off abruptly, and Warrior, munching on his burger, couldn't understand what had happened, why everyone was so abruptly silent and tense. Sang turned around carefully. Someone had secretly and surreptitiously photographed them, and Harley followed his gaze with a wicked smile. It was that girl sitting in the corner of the cafe. Sang also quietly asked, "Who will take care of her?" And Harley smiled even wider, and her eyes lit up. "Let the guys go back to the hotel without her. She will come later." On the other end of the wire, Project Subject's persona number 70 detective sent the executor money. So this group of people were in Macau. Behind him stood two thugs. One of them was the subject of Project Persona number 71, Yokozuna, which meant the highest rank in sumo. The second subject of Project number 72, Wrestler. Both of them, though they didn't show it, were pleased with their commander's work. He'd finally found them. Meanwhile, the girl photographer, having fulfilled the order, was walking calmly through the streets of Macau. She had an impressive sum on her card. Harley followed her relentlessly. Sang reached Blizzard in the room. She was telling him the latest news. Yoshinari Zarin was clearly running out of patience over the past 2 weeks. The actuary was also present in this conversation, albeit remotely. Next month, Yoshinari would surely start a turf war with the Hong Kong triads. Adu also had the same information. Sang thought hard. The war between the clans would start in the very near future. What then did he have a plan? Let the actuary try to delay the unification of Shangju Hall and the 4 main triads. Adu nodded his head in agreement. It was the right thing to do under the current circumstances. Then have Blizzard continue to monitor the actions of the Yoshinari clan and inform him immediately when hostilities begin. The girl accepted the order. Just then, the door to the room opened and Harley flew in. She'd made it so fast, and that self-satisfied twitch of her shoulders. Spying was her real job. Sang smiled. And why was that girl taking pictures of them? The girl only managed to find out that someone had created a wanted ad on the darknet. They must have been sought out by one of Persona's former test subjects. After all, the organizers would have done things differently if they wanted to get to Sang and his team. 7 days later, the 5th qualifying round began with less than 100 contestants remaining. The chances of facing Dan Zucker were now greatly increased. Madame Ko was sitting at the next table. This time she was lucky among her opponents were not particularly strong players, so it will not be difficult to qualify for the main tournament. All the actors of Madame Ko were gathered at the next table, a strange coincidence or a trick of the organizers, but now they had to play against each other. Harley was announced as the next contestant in the main tournament. She looked around. Sang had to be somewhere nearby. He had to be finished too. That's when the guy ran into KGB subject number 41, John Zucker. The look on his face was serious. He'd figured out the trick. It was all about the bees. The guy pretended to cover his mouth with his hands as if he'd heard something incredible. Yeah, he's crazy because he's been playing a lot of poker. Bees. Seriously. And who would buy such a ridiculous story? But Dan Zucker continued to look angry and confident that he was right. Now they both knew the truth. Meanwhile, in Macau Harbor, a yacht docked at the pier, from which came down the test detective and his assistants, Yokozuna and Wrestler. They've come for the sawing. If the chips they were looking for were really in the hands of number 82, how would they negotiate? He's not going to give them back that easily. The detective took the tube out of his mouth. Only an equal exchange. They could be useful to Sang since he's a smart guy to make enemies of them. Wrestler looked at his boss with a sigh. What if the 82nd or 41st really did have their ID chips? Meanwhile, the guys' team gathered in the lobby to discuss some things. 4 of them made it to the main tournament, but the warrior didn't fully understand. Their reason for coming to Macau was to show off their gambling skills and get an invitation to a gambling group. Why don't Sangha then bet on the card reading technique using bees and create a buzz in the casino to get the attention of this group? Why go to so much trouble? The boy sighed. Such actions could indeed quickly attract the attention of the card players. They could even get an offer from a few important people. But other things were at stake. Becoming the center of attention had a price. Every move was on display. The audience watched them. Body language, character, favorite phrases, and so on. All of this will be repeatedly analyzed by enemies in the shadows to hit the sick at the right moment. In time, they would begin to understand the actor even better than he did. It gave them more power in their hands. The warrior shrieked in surprise. Wasn't that a bit much? However, Sang clarified not to underestimate their determination to stay in this world. They had already paid a price ordinary people wouldn't pay for. The players who strove for victory could no longer be called mere men. They were slaves. Victory apostles who set aside their humanity. Compared to them, Zucker was a regular poker player. So before you can get an invitation from a group of card players, you have to become the topic of conversation in town. Harley was busy on her phone the whole time, so engrossed in her texting that she didn't hear a word. In the message, she gave the address of their hotel and the room number. A couple of minutes later, a cab pulled up to the hotel and the detective and his assistants got out. They looked around uncertainly and saw a girl nearby. Harley had slipped out of the room in time to meet her guests, and now she watched them approach her at a leisurely pace. Instead of a greeting, the detective got straight to the point. Where was room 82? And she pointed to the hotel. The guy hadn't left the room yet today. Sang continued to ponder. There will be 6 poker tables at the tournament. A total of 48 players would participate, and 8 would make it to the finals. In addition, the number of tables at the tournament will be less than the number of people who will make it to the finals, so you can take advantage of this rule. Allies at the same table will be able to work together to eliminate their opponents. Once the winners are determined, they need to slow down to wait for the finals. As long as they took half the spots, there was bound to be someone in the tournament finals. It was simple math. Hearing this, the actors grinned happily. They sat down in the lobby to discuss the details beforehand. The detective approached Harley's real name was Maria Butina. He was interested in the level A chips. The girl grinned. How was that possible? She didn't keep them to herself. The side effects of the chips were very serious, and she tried to stay away from them, the wrestler clarified. But number 82 didn't know about the side effects. Obsessed with revenge, he must be interested in them. But the girl was more suspicious of the coffin man. However, Yokozuna disagreed. When they left the cage, the A-level chips had already been taken by someone. The detective questioned everyone. Only Harley and Sang were left. The guy stretched with pleasure in the room. Only he was left finally. They finished all the discussions. Suddenly his phone rang, and he immediately picked it up. On the other end, he heard Harley yell. If he had already finished the meeting, have him go down to the first floor lobby now and get her out of here. A few days ago, they had an interesting conversation. Harley thought some kind of test subject was after them. And he wasn't after them personally, he was after the chips. But Sang couldn't believe it. Didn't the chips have strong side effects? Or they had found a solution to suppress the side effects? The girl nodded. Solutions were always available. The easiest one was to find their ID chips. But even that didn't eliminate the underlying problem. Split personalities were unavoidable, and seeing that the guy didn't know what she was talking about, Harley explained. Hemingway also made a chip out of their memories, and he suppresses other personalities with his own. But if they were so important, why didn't number 8 and the allies demand their ID chips from us? Harley sighed. They didn't use this method of suppression. Now everything's falling into place. Then Harley would have to get in touch with them and meet them in Macau. If necessary, she could give them their location. And now, going down to the lobby, he immediately noticed that the girl was sitting in the company of several test subjects. A couple of the faces were familiar to him. They'd met in prison. But there were only 3 of them. Strange. He was expecting a large group. Well, he was ready to talk. But before he could negotiate, he had to ask them questions. The detective calmly puffed on his pipe and gestured for him to start. And then the boy clarified whether they were more inclined to make a deal or a demand, and he hung up the phone and spoke in a serious tone. But if they couldn't come to an agreement, they were even prepared to commit robbery. The wrestler backed him up. Their chips didn't fit the Sangu. He himself wouldn't lose anything if he traded them. But the boy grinned. Which chips were theirs? Those listed. They wanted a struggling artist and an appraiser, and as a reward, they were willing to work for the guy for the next year. The guy thought hard. However, only for appearance's sake. Those test subjects were right. He didn't need their chips. But to have such helpers on the team was an invaluable gift. The day of the main poker tournament has finally arrived. This event was so interesting that there was live coverage, and the commentators did not stop talking for a second. This year, there were many experienced players. An example is the Finnish player Dan Zucker, who has previously earned about 10 million in many major competitions. There was even talk that some professional players chose to participate in another tournament just to avoid such a strong opponent. But this tournament was interesting with other students. A dark horse who debuted in the qualifying matches and won a huge amount of chips against Zucker. The camera got a close-up of Sang. He was playing without distraction and had over 6 million chips in front of him. The stakes were unprecedentedly high. The warrior, along with his test subjects, watched the broadcast carefully. Sang's behavior was not clear to them. He was clearly overbidding with weak cards. The boy, meanwhile, was thinking. The broadcast was live, and if he put the Bs behind the players, he might be exposed and he couldn't risk it. Therefore, Sang chose a different tactic. Losing a few hundred chips was inevitable for him, especially if there were 3 or 4 contestants. And he was right. Soon enough, one opponent was eliminated, and the last one was left. It was time to use his talent, and the B flashed over the player's shoulder. He was holding 2 jacks. Player Ben looked around the audience with a solemn look and announced, "Check." He decided to skip the current round of bidding. The others, including Sang, followed his lead. In the next round, Ben decided to raise the stakes to 60, but the guy calmly folded. This caused a real rage in his opponent. 2 hours later, the match was finally completed, and Sang was announced as one of the finalists. The guy was overjoyed and calm. No one could hold him off. The warrior, who had been watching all the vicissitudes of his comrade, roared triumphantly, unable to sit still. He listened proudly to the enthusiastic commentators. Yokozuna, who was also sitting in front of the TV with his partner, furrowed his brows. The guy recruited by the 82nd must have gone crazy. Meanwhile, Sang pondered. He was lucky that the only experienced opponents in this game were Ben and Liu Minsheng. Looks like he'll have more tricks to uncover. Absorbed in his thoughts, he didn't notice that another person had appeared behind him. He didn't know her. She was silent for now, but she wouldn't stay silent for long. The commentators announced the names of the 8 contestants who were to take part in the finals. 4 of them, including himself, belonged to Sang's team. Dan Zucker stared thoughtfully at the screen. He picked up his cell phone and dialed a number. He offered to meet someone at the bar in the J-Zone to discuss tomorrow's finals. An hour later, Leave, one of the finalists of the tournament, came to his table. He was wary, as he knew he could expect anything from his opponents. But Zucker seemed oblivious to his behavior. Could he have contacted Foy and Podgorski? Those names belonged to the other two professional players in the finals. Lev frowned. He too had watched the finals and appreciated the rookie's skill. But Sang still needed a lot of time to warm up. That was unacceptable for a professional. But Dan clarified. What if he said that Sang was a cheat, and the fluctuations in his game were caused by the increased difficulty of tricks under the attention of the audience? Lev knew Dan wouldn't mess with something like that. He'll contact the others. We should have worked together in the first half of the game to eliminate him. Meanwhile, in Sang's room, preparations for the tournament were also underway. Everyone had to memorize the secret gestures for use in the finals. And after much repetition, the whole team assured Sang that they had memorized everything. However, the guy remained serious and couldn't relax. Although they were half a place in the final, but they should not let their guard down. The opponents were professional players who would not miss an opportunity. Dan, meanwhile, was discussing the current situation with the rest of the players, what they thought of his proposal. However, not everyone gave him their support. Some people thought he was being overzealous because it was a rookie against a rookie. But Zucker quickly recalled what happened to Beg and Louis Min Sheng, and everyone stopped talking. Finally, one of the players asked how he could prove that Sang was a cheat, because they could get in trouble if it was revealed that they were cooperating with each other. Dan shook his head. He couldn't prove it, but he could argue that with more people the difficulty of using his trick increased, and therefore the chances of winning. Conversely, if there are only 2 or 3 players left at the table, it will be almost impossible to win. The second day of the final match started on schedule. Thanks to the live broadcast, it was watched by viewers from all over the world, and Warrior included. Sang scrutinized his opponents. Very soon he noticed something interesting. They were constantly looking at each other. And Sang realized very quickly what that meant. The 3 of them had joined together. He turned his gaze to Zucker and frowned. So that's what his plan was. Lue, to the amazement of the audience, immediately began to fulfill their plan and went to the bank. This caused a flurry of emotions as the tournament had just begun. Dan Zucker called a pass and dropped his cards. Only Sang was left, and all eyes were on him, whether he would go to the pot or fold 2. The guy thought it was clear as day. Lue did it so Sang would drop his cards and slowly spend his chips. If he answered, it would be a game of luck. It was impossible to predict the development of events if fortune was not on his side within 2 rounds. He would lose all his chips and be eliminated. Lue smiled smugly. As long as the 2 of them were getting good starting cards, they would go wah-bang dropping cards without giving a chance to even look into them. The guy had no choice but to wait, so he called a pass. In this round, the entire 800,000 pot went to Lue. Sang looked at Zucker. They understood each other without words. Dan recognized that his trick was indeed powerful. Even the expert during the match couldn't prove he was cheating. His only mistake was revealing his trick too soon. That gave Dan enough time to devise a plan to defeat him. The second game started the same way as the first. This time, Fuwa went to the pot. What will Sang do this time? Answer or hide behind the pass again? And the guy folded. Madame Ko, who was sitting at the same table with him, thought for a moment. She realized that Sang had become a target for them, but there was no way she could support him in this situation. They were true professionals and knew how to sink their enemy so that no one could accuse them of collusion. Sang sat gloomily. Although he had a lot more chips than his opponents, he couldn't afford to fail, but it was no use going up against 4 of them alone. Dan smiled. Exactly. The likelihood that their starting cards would be better is as high as the likelihood that he'd lose his chips betting the pot. Unless Sang's luck was as extraordinary as his stunts, he would definitely be eliminated. The boy couldn't wait any longer. Without fear of being discovered, he sent a bee to look at Lue's cards. It was the 8 and 6 of hearts. He turned to Harley. They hadn't spent the previous evening studying the secret gestures for nothing. Now he easily passed the information about his opponent's cards to the girl, and she nodded slightly. Alleyway did the same thing. He went all in, and his opponents went down. The man reached out to take his winnings, but Harley spoke up. She replied, "Wah bank." Her antics left all 4 of Zucker's crew stunned. Forgetting to keep a straight face, their eyebrows moved to the bridge of their nose. And Harley pretended like she didn't know what was going on. Why he was staring at her like that? Wasn't he the only one who could go all in? Couldn't she do the same? The warrior shouted triumphantly. Now Lue still had some chips left, but their number was negligible, and he was no longer a threat to the other contestants. Sang subtly smiled perfectly. Excellent. The opponents are only 3 left. We need to eliminate at least 1 more, and the game will be theirs. Lue, meanwhile, glanced at Harley. He was sure she'd set it all up. And the girl, realizing he was just mad, was adding fuel to the fire. He was so good to her. Thank you. Zucker glanced at the Podgorski. Let him continue to stick to the original plan. It was now 3 against 1. They would still win. But Fui was the first to realize that it was time to divert from the original course. Levy was practically out of the game. Anyone who helped Zucker would suffer the same fate. On the other hand, if he were to sit still and watch them fight, he would be guaranteed to be in the top 4 as soon as the leader is determined among them. Compared to working with Dan Zucker to get rid of Sang and then using their skills, his plan to get into the top 4 sounded much better. Sang watched his expression from afar and immediately realized what was going on. The first doubts arose in Zucker's team. He smiled gloatingly. Alliances based on interest were broken because of those same interests. Of course, by cooperating with Zucker, each of them could be forced to retreat because of failure. At the end of the day, when you have to watch someone much more insignificant than yourself getting more prize money, the choice is obvious. Sang's eyes lit up with confidence. When someone in Zucker's group lost all their chips because they went all in, the rest of the group realized, after all, they could quietly enter the top 4 without doing anything or risking anything. The famous Dan Zucker will be alone in his quest to destroy Sang. The championship in Macau was over. To the surprise of the public, the winner was neither Dan Zucker nor the Dark Horse Song. It was the inconspicuous and quiet player Madame Ko. At the exit of the hall, Sung was already waiting for his nemesis. He still had one unresolved question that interested him very much. The other 3 players were Sang's men, as many as he had helpers in this tournament, and he came close to his ear and whispered, including Ah Feng, who Zucker had seen at the qualifiers, there were 10 people on his team, and Den covered his eyes and confirmed his defeat. He turned around and promised Song to see him next time, but Song didn't think there would be no next time. He had already reached his goal a little sooner than he expected. Zucker immediately understood what he was talking about. So Sang had received an invitation from a group of gamblers. Now it was clear why he felt like an outsider. Despite everything that happened, he wanted to warn Sang, the rules he was playing by to ensure his victory. It would only work on this side, but it was different over there. Those who could survive on the other side were masters of the game system. If this guy keeps playing this way, he's gonna lose. Sang listened to this tirade carefully and promised to memorize his words. But even though his look was mocking, he was even grateful to this strange man at heart. Dan turned around and said goodbye to the con man with the unique trick, and the guy said goodbye to the stubborn poker player. There was a real celebration in the room. The table was littered with bills of the money they had won, and Sang's team couldn't wait to divide it up. Meanwhile, the boy himself looked thoughtful. He was considering an invitation from the gamblers to the mansion. The problem was that he could only take one of them with him, and he didn't know exactly who to pick from the team. Harley frowned. Maybe this was a trick. But the boy, though he looked worried, was quick to reassure her. How can I put it? Actually, many members of the gambling group enjoyed doing it. It was pretty commonplace for these people. And yet, usually these people would arrange a time to select agents, and then the candidates would compete against each other. The best would become an agent. The girl nodded thoughtfully. 3 days later, they went to the address specified in the invitation. A doorman with an intelligent and piercing gaze was waiting for them on the threshold of the huge mansion. Without a long introduction, he asked them to follow him and led them down long, ornate corridors whose walls were hung with expensive paintings. Sang didn't waste any time. How many people are invited this time? However, the doorman was silent. It had been a long time since any of the guests had asked him that question. Finally, he pushed open the tall door, and they stepped into a spacious room. Still, he decided to clarify. There were 3 more groups of guests after them, but not all of them had gathered yet. Now they could sit down and wait for the others. When everyone was assembled, he would report to the Lord and the meeting would begin, and Sang thanked him with a gesture. As soon as the doorman left, Sang looked around at the people present. Interestingly enough, Wang Bao Ghost Hand was also here. He didn't realize that he had received an invitation. Finally, an hour later, the door opened once more, and a stately man walked in with a firm step and apologized for the wait. It was the king of gambling himself. He assumed that everyone had gotten prior knowledge of the gambling group through their sources before coming over. He Yan Bin wanted to continue but was interrupted. A deafening snore came from the couch. One of the invitees dozed off on the sofa before he arrived, much to the king's surprise. He ordered the porter to wake him and then went on. In 10 days' time, a very important parry awaited him, in which he was to take part. It just so happened that his agent wasn't strong in this kind of competition, so he was looking for a new one to win. Sang immediately raised his hand to attract attention. What's the point of the bet? And Ben explained that we would have to find someone. The others were thoughtfully silent, waiting to see what would happen next. No one wanted to jump to conclusions. One of the invitees who was dozing 10 minutes earlier on the sofa asked for clarification. It was the real wizard of the gambling world, Wu Zuo Liang, Yibin continued. Within a set time, they had to find a person hiding somewhere in Macau City before their opponents. He didn't know that his every word was being transmitted through a microphone and listened to by the men in the dark car outside the mansion. It was a gang of big 4 crooks. When the driver heard that, he sighed. It was like information from the eye. Whose side they would choose this time. The girl called Executor was silent. Meanwhile, there was also a meeting at Reserve Gambling King He Renshi's residence. It was Bin's younger brother. He was hosting a gang of cheaters. It looked like they had already made their choice. And the gang representative nodded briefly. There was no reason for them to choose the other side. The Reserve King grinned. Bin finished discussing the details and scrutinized his invitees. Did anyone have any questions left? But everyone shook their heads negatively. No. Well then let the guests who are interested in this parry follow him. The doorman announced that the gentleman had prepared a little game to test them. Everyone looked at each other warily, making a final decision. Finally, Sang and a few others went out into the corridor. The others decided to stay. King Bin looked around at those who refused. Ghost Hand and 4 others gave up. Interesting. He smiled and went out to get his agents. The remaining ones were escorted to the door. Next, everyone gathered around a round table and the doorman explained the game. They had to choose one of the pictures on the table and find a person. There were 24 hours to complete the task. Victory was awarded to the one who succeeded first. Wuzuo shrugged his shoulders. But what would happen if they all failed? The doorman smiled thinly. Then they will be given another 24 hours. If no one finishes the game, even after the extension, it will be considered a draw. Mr. Sang also decided to ask a question. Were there any special rules about what you could do and what you couldn't do? But the doorman shook his head. There were no rules. Soon enough, they all left, having received their first assignment. The king and his assistant walked them to the door and looked at them thoughtfully. At last the king spoke. The doorman had a lot of experience with this kind of game, so who did he think would win this time? And he answered without a second thought. His opinion had changed. If he hadn't met the candidates, he would have had a higher opinion of Wu Zuoliang, but now he knows the winner for sure. It will be Mr. Sang. In the car, Harley scrutinized the photo. How the guy was going to find this man. But Sung already had a plan of action, as always. He was a strategist. He's decided to leave it to Clozard. She'll be fine. Macau has an extensive video surveillance system. Finding an ordinary person is not a difficult task for a professional. But Harley didn't give up. How could he guarantee that they would find the target before the other 2 teams? After all, they also knew how to find the stranger. A smile touched Sung's lips. It was very easy. He had already sent Wrestler and Yokozuna after the Joe brothers. They would remain under guard for the next 24 hours. At the same time, the warrior pursued another of his opponents. This way, they would ensure their freedom of action by capturing and immobilizing their opponents. The girl hummed. Sang had his own philosophy. If he couldn't make himself better, he just made his opponents worse. It was just efficient and practical. Suddenly, his phone rang. With a glance, he rose from the table. Harley followed him. Blizzard said they'd already found the man in the photo. 24 hours later, all the agent candidates gathered again in the Gambling King's mansion. Out of all of them, only Sang had found a person. Hearing this, Wang Baohe roared with anger. It was all thanks to his dirty deeds. He clenched his fists and cried out in pain. The warrior had cracked him hard when he met him, but Song was unfazed. He wasn't told not to interfere with the other teams, so silence was a sign of agreement. He wasn't breaking the law. Since they all lost to the guy because of their inability to realize the situation, what were they angry at him about then? The Zhao brothers frowned and prepared to attack. The king of gambling watched this scene with interest. No wonder the butler had a high opinion of the guy. A frightening intuition that hit the mark. Well, it was time to call it a day. Mr. Sang really did not break the rules and therefore won and was appointed for the next game. The boys smiled victoriously. A few days later, they met Bean again at the hotel. Stepping into the elevator, the concierge pressed the basement floor. Sang waited with interest for the continuation. Finally, the elevator stopped and they entered a huge amphitheater-style room, as if for the performances and the many spectators in the stands. Sang even whistled. So the VIP area was built in the style of the ancient Roman Colosseum. Interestingly, none of the players had even realized it. Bean turned to him. He wanted to ask him before they arrived. The guy's grasp of the inner workings of a group of card players was unusual. He'd been an agent before. Sang explained that he had just received an invitation from the group before, and the king tugged on his sleeve after thinking for a moment. It was time to meet their president. They walked down to the arena itself and stopped in front of a stately man whose face was decorated with a tattoo. He was one of the 3 Horus presidents. Horus shifted his gaze to the young man. What was his name? And the Sang called himself. There was not a hint of hesitation or shyness in his demeanor, posture, and gaze. The president continued. Was he aware of the risks of the parry between the members of the gambling parliament? The guy explained that a little bit. He knew that depending on the reward, agents who lost the game would be forced to remove a certain organ to prevent him from going against his employer. He also knew of the reward the agent would receive from the winner, 10% of the ante, or 1 promise from the employer, if he agreed. Horus was silent for a moment. Given the risks and rewards involved, he still wanted to be Bean's agent, and the man nodded without delay. Then it was time to sign the contract. Back in the room, Sang talked about the meeting of the gambling group and stumbled over the warrior's reaction. Losing an organ if he lost wasn't too high a bet, the guy explained. The betting between members of the group went like this. When the stakes were high enough, measures were taken to guarantee that both sides would strive to win. The players didn't have good reputations or professional ethics. Even so, there were people who deliberately wanted to lose at the cost of their organs. Suddenly, a mocking voice was heard behind Sang, especially if wager included the right to be the king of Macau gambling. The guy turned around in horror. The warrior and Harley noticed his movement. But unlike the first, the girl immediately realized what was happening. The personality took the initiative in re-establishing communication. Sang calmed down a bit and decided to clarify. What kind of person was in front of him? From the chip, he was a gambler. Recently, he had been using it a lot because of the tournament, and the new character smiled and nodded his head. Right. The guy could call him the god of gambling. Hearing his voice, the guy shuddered. Left alone in the bedroom, Sang saw the new personality again, and this time scrutinized her closely. They had a lot to talk about. The boy had questions. Did he mean to say that the bet and the wager that Bin had prepared for him was the title of the Macau gambling king? The man smiled. Wasn't it obvious? As acting king, he had no need for agents. There were only two kinds of parry where he had no choice but to accept the offer to search for people. The first option implied that the winnings at stake were so high that even the king could not refuse. And the second was a compulsory bet. Sang thought for a moment. He had never heard of such a thing before, though he thought he knew almost everything about the group of card players. The identity explained. There were many children and grandchildren in the family. By ancestral bequest, all the men of the family had one chance in their lives to challenge the eldest son of the main family under the supervision of the President of Parliament. If he wins, he'll be the king of gambling in Macau. And if he loses, he and all his descendants will forever lose the right to become the king of gambling. It all sounded so unbelievable that Sang even questioned the authenticity of this information. How could he know all this since he was not a member of the group? And personality explained. There was a time when he was at the top of the gambling world. At that point, many of the He family wanted to pull him over to their side. And yet there was one thing the guy couldn't explain to himself. Why, if the stakes were so high, the king of gambling had chosen him? Wouldn't it be better to get an agent with a higher chance of winning who would take responsibility for such an important wager? The personality had an answer. Since the victory of the king's fight was not decided in just one round, then perhaps He Yan Bin strategically conceded the round for which Sang was responsible.